A Knife in the Dark. Chapter 15, A Knife in the Dark. Shadesteel kept her eyes carefully trained on the forest below, searching for any sign of her approaching quarry. Her peripheral vision allowed her to keep on the alert for any signs of movement in the skies above as well, just in case Dawn Lightwing tried coming in by air. The clear day meant that there were no clouds in the sky that the foe colt could use as cover. One way or another, when he came, she would know it. She lay halfway out on the ledge that projected out from the cave. Her body completely filled the opening, which she had narrowed using small boulders packed into mud to serve as mortar. As constructs went, the walls closing off most of the cave opening weren't the sturdiest. The dried mud that held them together would probably wash away with the next snowmelt. But Shadesteel didn't need it to last for very long. Her ears twitched as she heard a faint sniffling sound from the back of the cave, where her bed was. Breaking her vigil over the forest, Shadesteel turned her gaze to check on her unwilling guest. Her bed was still there, but the sleeping bag had been shoved to one side, up against the cave wall. A metal stake had been driven down through the weave of tree branches and into the rock below. It had taken a lot of work for Shadesteel to get the stake in place, but it would be worth it once Dawn Lightwing arrived. In the gloom of the cave, her eyes were still able to pick out the form of a pale purple unicorn who sat with her back to the stake, bound against it by heavy wire wrapped around her barrel and forelimbs to keep her from wiggling free. The filly's amber eyes met Shadesteel's blue ones and quickly flinched away. Dinky Doo was scared and miserable. Shade didn't blame her. It was unfortunate for Dinky that she had gotten caught up in this and was now bound uncomfortably in the back of a cave in the depths of the Whitetail Woods. But still, Shadesteel needed her and needed her to be exactly where she was. But that didn't stop her heart from going out to the little filly. With a sigh, the former guardsmare decided to break her vigil and do what she could to offer some comfort to the softly sobbing filly. "Hey there," said Shadesteel in her softest, most friendly voice, "how are you doing?" I'm scared," said Dinky, tears running freely down her cheeks. "My back is sore, my skin hurts, wanna go home." "Shush," said Shade, gently reaching out with a forehoof to brush away a few of Dinky's tears. "It's all right. I know you're scared. I'm sorry, but I need your help." But why do you need to tie me up like this?" asked Dinky, her distress seeming to subside a little at the gentle tone of Shade's voice. "It's a bit hard to explain," said Shade, "but I promise that you'll be safe and when this is all over, you'll be back with your mom, safe and sound." From the look in her eyes, it was clear that Dinky didn't quite believe her. Shade figured she would have to find some other way to take the filly's mind off her situation. "Hey," she said, "I've got an idea. Would you like to hear how I got my cutie mark?" Okay. "I was just a little older than you when it happened," explained Shade. "When I was a little filly, I used to love hide and seek. It was my favorite game in the whole wide world. My favorite event was the yearly hide and seek tournament held during the summer sun celebration with all the foals in Hollow Shades. We would all hide throughout the town in the safe parts of the surrounding forest and the adults would come looking for us. Sometimes I would win, sometimes I would lose. But no matter what happened, I always loved that game. Then, one year, I figured out how to hide from every pony and not be found. The adults looked and looked and looked, but they couldn't find me. They actually started to get really worried. They called in every pony they could, including the other colts and fillies, to look for me. They even had the local guard do a grid search, but they couldn't find me. I was having so much fun, I didn't want to let them find me, so I never came out. Then, 6 hours later, the mayor realized that he had never actually ended the game and declared me the winner. When I finally came out of hiding, I was so happy and excited because I realized just how amazing it was. It was like I'd made myself invisible, even without some unicorn's magic. That's when I got this. She pointed to the swatch of camouflage on her flank. "But why are you doing this to me?" asked Dinky, who seemed to have calmed down somewhat. Shade sighed. "This may be hard for you to believe, but I was in the Royal Guard once. My entire purpose was to find the bad ponies and make sure that they got punished. I was very proud of the work I did there because I was making Equestria a safer, better, happier place. But then, something happened. I'm sure you know a lot about this. But one morning, on the day of the summer sun celebration a couple years ago, the sun didn't come up. Nightmare Moon had returned from her banishment and was trying to plunge Equestria into eternal night. I thought we were going to have to go and fight Nightmare Moon ourselves. But then, all of a sudden, it was over. Those mares found the elements of harmony and used them to defeat Nightmare Moon and free Princess Celestia." Said Dinky, nodding her head, "I know about that." Shade smiled sweetly at the little filly and brushed her mane gently. "Of course you do. After the sun finally came back up, I thought everything was going to be all right. But then," she let out a low growl that sent tremors up Dinky's spine. "Nightmare Moon showed up in Canterlot claiming to be Princess Celestia's younger sister. Our sweet and gentle princess actually welcomed that fiend with open arms, even as she lied through her teeth." "But it's true," said Dinky. "Princess Luna is Princess Celestia's little sister. She plays with us on Nightmare Night and..." "Lies." Dinky let out a small shriek of fear as Shade slammed a hoof into the stone floor of the cave. "Princess Celestia was, is, and always shall be the only true princess Equestria has. That monster is just a pretender trying to usurp our beloved princess. She is simply waiting for another chance to plunge us into unending night again." "But why would Princess Celestia let her back into Canterlot if that was true?" asked Dinky. Shade gave Dinky a sour smile. "Because she needs us to defeat Nightmare Moon. Princess Celestia wants us ordinary, mortal ponies to be the ones to bring about that monster's end so that we can earn our place in her paradise of eternal day." Shade turned to look towards the entrance again. "But I realized that, if Nightmare Moon was allowed to rule from Canterlot, then she, like Princess Celestia, could give orders to the Royal Guard. I refused to remain in the service of such a monster and resigned so that I could help those who knew the truth fight back against Nightmare Moon." "But what does that have to do with me?" asked Dinky. "You may not realize it," said Shade, "but Nightmare Moon has creatures who serve as an extension of her will, monsters who sow disorder and suffering at her order. Even when she was imprisoned on the moon, these creatures still tried to carry out her will in the world. These demons do not have any material form, but can infect the thoughts and feelings of regular ponies. Even worse, these demons have the ability to take possession of certain ponies. You see, every once in a while, when a foal is about to be born, something goes very wrong and the foal is born dead. It is unfortunate but true. These foals are known as stillborns. But those filthy demons can tell when such foals are about to be born. They inhabit what would otherwise be a lifeless corpse and restore it to some semblance of life. Shade looked at Dinky and noticed that the little filly was having some trouble following what she was saying. So these mean spirits make dead foals not dead, said Dinky, trying to see if she understood. Exactly, said Shade with a happy smile. So they're zombies, right? The pleased smile dropped off Shade's face. Well, not really. You mean they don't go around moaning brines and trying to eat ponies? No. Ah, moaned Dinky disappointedly. Shade Steel sighed. You see, these creatures try their hardest to act like regular ponies. They pretend to just be regular foals that will grow up into ordinary mares and stallions. But, in reality, they are monsters, secretly waiting for their orders from their mistress so that they can do their evil in her name. They are exceptionally good at hiding their true nature, but there is one thing that truly distinguishes them from regular ponies. When they are about to carry out their malicious acts, their eyes will change and take on the same form as nightmare moons, showing the truth about their ties to her. Oh, said Dinky, clearly thinking about something. Oh, you mean like Dawn's eyes? Well, yes. Shade was a bit shocked to see that Dinky made the connection. Wait, you think Dawn's one of these bad ponies? Yes, exclaimed Shade, that's exactly it. Then, to her utter shock and amazement, Dinky began to giggle. You're silly, she said between laughs, you're a silly pony. But, Shade's jaw dropped. Dinky carried on without noticing her captor's astonishment. Dawn's a good pony. He saved me from bullies once and he helped my mom to fly without crashing. There's no way he's one of those demon, not dead, full things. Dinky blinked. What are they called again? Beebit, stammered Shade Steel. Why, you've seen his eyes, haven't you? Yeah, exclaimed Dinky, they're so cool. This is worse than I thought, marveled Shade Steel. She'd realized that Dawn's hold over the town must be severe if he could walk about with his eyes undisguised. But this was more than she'd ever thought possible. Dinky pressed on. That whole eye thing sounds stupid anyway, she declared. Why is some pony evil just because their eyes are different? That's like the ponies who keep saying that my mom's stupid just because she can't see well and used to crash a lot. Besides, it's not like he can help it if he was born like that. Shade heaved a disappointed sigh. It isn't the same at all. It isn't that Dawn Lightwing was born with different eyes. Those eyes are a hint of the true form that inhabits the body of that colt. The pony named Dawn Lightwing never existed. The pony that he would have been died before he could even be born. Dinky fixed the mare with an impressively deadpan stare. I still think that's pretty stupid. Shade Steel opened her mouth to argue further, but stopped herself. There was little logic that would work on a foal. She would just have to let Dawn Lightwing show his true colors when he arrived. As if on cue, Shade's ears picked up the sound of flapping wings that unquestionably belonged to a Pegasus. Turning, she looked out the opening towards the sky. There, hovering in the open air outside the cave was none other than Dawn Lightwing. His turquoise eyes narrowed as they met Shade's. She glared back at him, meeting his draconic gaze without flinching. It's time. Dawn landed on the ledge outside the cave and folded his wings before walking inside. Once he was inside the cave, he came to a stop only a couple of meters away from Shade, his body relaxed as though he wasn't expecting a fight at all. He had already done away with the scarf and jacket he'd been wearing earlier and now stood before Shade unclothed. Well, he said simply, I'm here like you wanted. Dawn, shouted Dinky exultantly, like a pining filly being saved by her knight in shining armor. Dawn turned his attention to the filly and gave her a small smile before returning his gaze to Shade, his hardened expression slipping back into place. Shade frowned slightly. She had been expecting Ditzy to come with Dawn, but there was no sign of the gray mare with the blonde mane anywhere outside the cave. Was she waiting in the forest down below? Still, it didn't matter. Dawn was here and he had willingly come inside the cave. Now he was in her chosen battlefield, where the majority of his techniques could be sealed by her preparations. Now that I'm here, please untie Dinky Doo and let her go, said Dawn. I think not, said Shade harshly. I need the filly to stay right where she is and I'm certainly not about to release her into your custody. She will serve as my witness when you reveal your true nature. Dawn looked past her at Dinky once again, frowning darkly. An iron stake and steel wire. I get the feeling that you are keeping Dinky here for other reasons as well. Perhaps was all that Shade would say in response. Dawn's lips pressed into a thin line as he realized that conversation would serve no further purpose. Fine then, shall we get this over with? Shade Steel sank into a crouch as Dawn began to move closer. Just as he took another step, she exploded into motion, kicking off the ground and beating her wings to launch herself towards him. However, the angle to her launch carried her over Dawn's head and towards the ceiling, right where it met her crudely constructed wall. Shade twisted around so that her hind hooves slammed into the solid stone of the ceiling. In the same motion, her right foreleg slipped under her barrel to her left side. Shade was currently wearing a belt of dark gray fabric, a shade matching her coat so that it was nearly invisible. Attached to the belt so that it hung from the right side of her barrel was a sheathed knife, which hung so that the handle was angled slightly downwards. Now, her right fetlock curled around the handle of the knife, drawing it out from the sheath in a curving slash that came up and across her chest. Drawing and striking had occurred in a single smooth motion even as Shade's kick propelled her towards the back of Dawn's head, the slash aimed perfectly for the back of his neck so that the blade would slip between his vertebrae and sever his spinal cord. The motion, with its perfect precision, spoke of the breadth of Shade's experience. Without even looking, Dawn bent all four of his legs. An instant later, he kicked off the floor, launching himself straight forward. It had happened so quickly that, for an instant, it had looked as though Shade's knife had cut into his neck. However, the blade passed effortlessly through the afterimage. As he surged forward, Dawn planted one forehoof and twisted it, using it as a pivot to spin his body around, his eyes finding Shade as she landed on the floor where he had been standing, getting his first real look at her weapon. Shade wielded a straight-edged knife with a broad blade of black steel. The blade's center had 3 rectangular holes along its length, probably to reduce the weapon's weight and make it lighter in her hooves. Shade held the deadly weapon with an easy familiarity as she pushed off with her remaining 3 hooves and charged straight for Dawn, thrusting forward with the tip of the blade, aiming between his ribs for his heart and lungs. Dawn skipped sideways so that Shade's charge now carried her past him. Before she could switch from a thrust to a slash, he lashed out with his wing, compressing the air between them so that it would explode against her flank and slam her against the wall. Shade's 3 unoccupied hooves smacked against the cave floor, stopping her charge and launching her straight up so that the gust of air that resulted from Dawn's attack rushed under her and dissipated across the wall. As she jumped, Shade went into a roll that sent her over the top of Dawn's back and allowed her to swing her knife down at Dawn from above, once again aiming for his neck. Shade's blade only managed to clip a few silvery hairs from Dawn's mane as he quickly ducked beneath the line of her slash. Continuing her roll, Shade kicked off the wall, sending her hurtling across the cave to the other wall, which she turned and kicked off of at an angle, propelling herself down towards Dawn from the opposite side, just as he turned to meet her. The knife was a black blur as she went through a series of thrusting and slashing attacks coming at Dawn from a variety of directions. Some slashes aimed for Dawn's limbs, seeking to open a vein or artery and force the colt to bleed out. Other slashes targeted the tendons on those limbs as well, trying to lame the colt and cut down his maneuverability. She aimed her thrusts for his chest and neck, seeking to penetrate between his ribs and the soft organs they protected, or slash his throat open. Every strike faultlessly aimed for a vital point that would either incapacitate or kill. There wasn't the slightest bit of waste in Shade's movements, and she attacked with all the grace and efficiency of a professional. None of her blows found their mark. Dawn's form seemed to double, then triple, then multiply further as he danced between her strikes, which always seemed to sink into one of the illusory doubles created by the ebony colt's speed and acceleration. His wings remained tucked in close to his sides as Dawn relied almost entirely on his hooves to maneuver between Shade's relentless offense. A straight horizontal slash from Shade missed Dawn's throat by a paper's breadth as the colt pulled his head back just barely far enough to escape the strike. Shade abruptly reversed her grip on the knife and thrust back along the path of her slash, threatening to stab the blade through the side of Dawn's neck. Rearing up off his forelegs, Dawn avoided the strike by lifting his forward half up off the floor. Shade stopped her thrust rather than allowing the momentum to carry it all the way around to her side and switched the grip on her knife once again, this time stabbing straight up for Dawn's head from below in an attack that would drive the blade up between the mandibles of his jaw and up into his brain. Death would be nigh instantaneous. With a beat of his wings, Dawn turned his motion into a backwards flip, which carried him clear of the line of Shade's slash. Dawn's backflip carried him back to the cave wall, which he was preparing to kick off of. The air around his wings began to buzz as an electrical charge built up around his feathers. Rather than channel it into a lightning bolt, Dawn kept the lighting circulating across the surface of his wings, letting the flow concentrate down toward the tips of his feathers. When he came at Shade again, he would only have to barely brush his feathers against the mare to channel an electrical jolt into her that would stun her into submission, all while ensuring that Dinky wasn't put at risk thanks to her being tied to an improvised lightning rod. Just as he was about to kick off of the wall, Dawn felt Shade's wings beat erratically, a motion that was frighteningly familiar to him. It was sheer reflex that surpassed even his comprehension of the mare's action that saved him as he kicked off the air, instead of the wall, skipping to the side just as a thin, flat blade whistled through the space he had occupied and ricocheted off the stone with a loud ringing noise. For a moment, Dawn simply allowed himself to fall back to the floor, staring at Shade in astonishment. When she had first lunged at him, Dawn had thought he'd felt something off about her wings, but had quickly lost that train of thought while trying to evade the ferocious series of attacks from her combat knife. All that changed now that he realized that Shade was more heavily armed than she had first seemed. His eyes, more acute in the darkness of the cave than those of most ponies, found the blade that she had thrown at him. It was about as long as one of her primaries, thin and flat with an elongated triangular shape, like a long dagger, but lacking any kind of hilt or handle. Once again, Dawn was struck by the eerie sense of familiarity. The wired feathers wielded by Perlin Bluestreak. Dawn's mind immediately made the connection. While these blades were simpler and cruder in design than Perlin's artfully crafted feathers made from some sort of simple alloy instead of mithril, they appeared to operate on the same principle, a small, light blade, hidden amongst the feathers of the wielder's wing, which could be launched with almost no warning and impressive accuracy. Now Dawn was able to identify what was off about Shade Steel's wings. Several of her feathers had seemed too heavy and too rigid to be normal feathers. As he let his awareness wash over the mare with the flow of the wind, Dawn was unable to detect any kind of sheath or apparatus to hold the long knives. Rather, Shade seemed to pinch them flat between her feathers. In the darkness of the cave, they were virtually indistinguishable from the feathers themselves. Dawn was amazed she could use her wings to maneuver so well, even holding the blades between her feathers like that. Shade, for her part, appeared just as surprised to see that Dawn had dodged her attack, so much so that she failed to follow up on it and pressed on. Instead, she too paused to stare at the colt. For a moment, they simply stared at one another in mutual astonishment. "That weapon," said Dawn, "where did you learn how to use it?" Shade was surprised by the question. "It actually came from my time in the SES just right before I retired. I heard that the method actually originated as a riding technique in Guoxia before some Pegasus got the idea to use it as a way to use weapons." Dawn stared at her again, flummoxed by the sheer happenstance that his facing such a weapon represented. "I wonder what Stormfront would make of this." Sadly, he would have to wait until later to get an answer to that, as Shade Steel exploded into motion once more, leading with the heavier knife in her fetlock as she slashed straight down at him from above. Dawn sidestepped the attack, raising his wings to send a blast of air at the mare. However, he stopped himself as he realized that Dinky was in the line of his attack. Dawn was forced to abandon the offensive before he could even begin, while Shade turned to press her attack, leading with a flurry of slashes that forced Dawn back as he dodged from side to side and up to down, trying to slip into the spaces between her maneuvers. If he could slip around to the other side, then he could make a more active effort to disable Shade without having to worry about Dinky, as his attacks would be directed towards the cave entrance. Unfortunately, Shade Steel's skill with her knife was not to be underestimated. She refused to let Dawn break away from her so that he could get around. Frequently, after a slash, she switched the grip on her knife to make the return stroke come all the faster, continually keeping Dawn on the defensive as he looked for some hole in the barrier of razor-sharp steel that Shade weaved between them. Dawn decided to switch to a lighter attack in order to drive Shade back and give himself more room to work with. He swept one wing forward, compressing the air between them. It had enough force to shove her away and open the distance between them. However, it wasn't sufficiently powerful to inflict injury, which was just as well, since that meant it wouldn't pose any threat to Dinky, who was also in the line of attack. With more space available, Dawn sought to shift to an angle he could strike from without putting Dinky at risk. However, he felt that familiar motion from one of Shade's wings and he had to abort his sidestep to avoid catching another of her throwing blades in his chest. His dodge gave Shade the time she needed to close back in and put him back in the defensive with another flurry of attacks. Dawn frowned in irritation as he found himself back at square one. He had to admit that Shade was controlling the situation splendidly. By choosing the cave as her battleground, she limited his range of motion, preventing him from ever being able to get enough distance to attack with his full strength. Even if he could, one wrong blow could bring the walls of stone crashing down on top of them. Even if Dawn managed to get enough distance to shift to a position of greater advantage, Shade would disrupt his movements with one of the throwing knives she carried concealed within her wings, giving her enough of an opening to close in again. Dawn found himself quite grateful for all the extra training he had done with Red River, gaining additional experience with fighting in close. That training had already saved his life a dozen times over in this fight alone. Dawn also had another advantage. Unlike Perlin's wired feathers, which Perlin could retract at will, Shade possessed no such mechanism for retrieving her thrown knives. Each one that she launched reduced the total number she had at her disposal. Dawn supposed that, if he strung the battle along long enough, he could force her to use all of her projectiles. Then he would only have to worry about the weapon she gripped in her foreleg. Unfortunately, that one weapon seemed to be more than enough to serve her purposes as she continued to drive him back. Dawn tried another approach. Once again, he used his feathers to agitate the air around his wings, making it buzz as he built up an electric charge. Once again, he had no intention of launching a lightning bolt, especially when there was every chance it would miss Shade and strike the rod Dinky was tied to instead. Rather, he would move one of his feathers close to Shade so that it would jump to her knife with her next attack. Shade, possibly hearing the buzz of the electrical charges build up, fell back before Dawn could reach out with his wing. Frowning, Dawn let the electricity dissipate. However, he found a new target. Fully extending one wing, Dawn slashed it through the air, angling the feathers so that they moved like the blade of Shade's knife. In the dark of the cave, the hair-thin distortion created by the crescent-shaped vacuum that stretched from the floor to ceiling was all but invisible. The only warning that Shade had was the pair of lines carved across the stone above and below as the blade rushed straight for her. However, that warning was more than enough for the mare, who had already recognized the form of Dawn's attack. She threw herself to the side with room to spare. Regaining her footing, she fixed Dawn with an angry glare. "I guess you finally decided to kill me," she said darkly. This was what she had been waiting for. Now Dinky would see what Dawn was really like and would be able to share the truth with the rest of Ponyville, regardless of whether Shade managed to kill him or not. However, Dawn simply smiled wryly. "I have no intention of killing you," he said, "but every action has its purpose. I'm rather pleased to say that I've been working to be more precise with that technique than I was before." "I'll bet you are," growled Shade, tensing for another lunge. Dawn flicked his ears back and forth. The cave's shape and the fact that Shade Steel had closed off part of the opening made it difficult for him to tell what was going on outside of it. However, he was comforted by a faint, familiar feeling from outside. "I think this has gone on long enough." Dawn's smile widened. "Dinky," he said, looking past Shade Steel, "do you trust me?" "Yeah," said the little filly without the slightest hesitation. "When I tell you to, you need to run for the entrance as quickly as possible. No matter what happens, don't look back. Can you do that?" "K." Shade Steel blinked in confusion, wondering what was going on. Dinky wouldn't run for the cave entrance. She couldn't run. She was bound to an iron post with steel wire. She wouldn't be able to move at all unless Shade or some pony else untied her, unless. Suddenly, Shade remembered the vacuum blade that Dawn had launched, the one she thought she had dodged, and she realized that she had never been Dawn's target. Shade twisted her head around to look over her shoulder and confirm her suspicions. That was a mistake. Dawn had been waiting exactly for that moment of distraction. The moment Shade's head turned, Dawn closed the gap between them. His left wing lashed out, compressing the air between their bodies and forcing it up against Shade's side. The mare cried out as she was launched away from Dawn and smacked hard against the unyielding stone wall of the cave. "Now!" shouted Dawn. Dinky didn't need any further prompting. With a sharp pull, the wires that Dawn's blade had cut through bent and fell away, allowing her to pull herself away from the post and rush toward the entrance to the cave. "No!" shouted Shade. Her body moved on reflex, her only thought being to keep Dinky, whose presence was so critical to her plans, from escaping. Before she realized what she was doing, she had already acted. Her wing flicked out, her feathers releasing another one of the long throwing daggers, this one flying directly towards the running Dinky, just as she was about to pass by where Dawn stood. "What have I done?" Blood splattered through the air, glittering in the faint light of the cave as the blade bit into flesh. Author's notes. This fight scene was an interesting one to construct. It's tricky coming up with new ways that ponies can fight. I'm a little disappointed in myself that I can't come up with more opponents besides Perlin that Dawn can really go all out against. But half the fun is finding clever ways to allow his opponents to even the playing field. Next chapter, Shade Steel gets a scolding. Bloodshed. Chapter 16, Bloodshed. For a moment, it was as though sound briefly ceased to exist within the confines of the cave. The faint sounds of the wind outside died away, as did any sounds of motion from the ponies within the cave, all to be replaced by the faint plip-plip of blood dripping to the floor, forming a small pool beneath the wound it had inflicted. Dinky Doo was transfixed by the sight of it. All thoughts of running had vanished in that brief instant, only to be replaced by thoughts of horror at what had just happened. Shade Steel was just as horrified, completely shocked by how much her training had betrayed her, making her launch a lethal projectile at an innocent filly. Worse still, were it not for the actions of the pony she'd actually been seeking to kill, it would be that filly's blood now dripping on the ground. For the moment, Dawn was having trouble looking away from the long, thin knife that had been run through his right foreleg, its elongated tip having pierced through his flesh, sliding straight between the bones of his lower foreleg, the tip having come out the other side, now resting scant inches away from the barrel of the filly it had been flying towards. That was close, was Dawn's first thought, which was almost immediately followed by another more emphatic one, also. Ouch. He wished he'd reacted faster. If he had, he might have simply been able to knock the knife away with a well-placed gust. However, he hadn't even remotely expected Shade to attack Dinky. The hesitation and surprise had delayed his action to the point that Dawn had seen only one way to act that would allow him to protect her. "Dawn," whimpered Dinky. "Dinky," hissed Dawn between his teeth as he lowered his foreleg, even the slight motion causing him additional pain. "What did I say?" Keep running, she whispered, her voice on the edge of tears, no matter what. Exactly, said Dawn, grunting out the next syllables as best he could. Go. Though she was reluctant, Dinky knew she needed to follow Dawn's instructions. She bolted, her little body quickly covering the remaining distance between herself and the cave entrance. Just as she reached the walls of stacked stones that Shade had used to make the opening smaller, Dawn's wing flared out, sending a gust out behind him that picked Dinky's body off the stone floor and sent her hurtling out into space. No, shrieked Shade Steel, shooting back onto her hooves and rushing towards the cave entrance, her fight with Dawn momentarily forgotten. Her eyes widened with horror as she saw Dinky seemingly hanging in space, hovering somewhere between flying and falling as the last of the momentum Dawn's push had given her petered out. Shade was certain that her next sight would be of the filly plummeting towards the unforgiving, snow-covered ground below. She had already decided to temporarily give up her plans to kill Dawn Lightwing and do her best to catch the falling filly. That's what he wanted, she realized, to distract me while he gets away. However, before the filly could begin falling in earnest, an orange and purple streak cut across Shade's vision. Less than a second later, Dinky briefly vanished from sight as the streak intercepted her. I've gotcha. Shade's eyes widened at the sound of Scootaloo's voice as the bright orange filly curved her flight path around, leveling out with Dinky wrapped in her arms pressed securely against her barrel. For a moment, the dark gray mare could only stare silently at the spectacle, until Scootaloo seemed to notice her gaze and returned it, her lavender eyes glaring straight at Shade with seething anger. Muffin. Another, light gray streak came down from above. The familiar voice prompted a happy squeal from Dinky. Mama. Scootaloo dutifully held out the filly in front of her as Ditsy came to a hovering stop in front of them. Immediately, Dinky was snatched up by her mother into a loving hug. Start heading back to town, said Scootaloo as Ditsy affectionately nuzzled her daughter's mane. You shouldn't stay here. Ditsy gave Scootaloo a thankful glance and turned to fly back towards Ponyville, all while Shade Steel stared on dumbly. Now I wonder just whose true colors are showing. Shade turned back towards the interior of the cave at the sound of Dawn's voice, which contained equal measures of taunt and reproach. The ebony colt was watching her with an unreadable expression in his cat-like eyes, his right foreleg still lifted slightly off the floor. In the darkness, Shade could still make out the shape of the blade that was run completely through it. For a moment, Shade simply couldn't speak. Her mind was reeling from what she had seen and what she had nearly done. She tried fitting everything together to explain the seemingly impossible circumstances. He set the filly free. He must have known that I would attack her. Now he's gotten her out of the way. He's free to do what he likes without having to worry about any pony who matters seeing him, and he's made himself look like a hero while doing it. Harsh, bitter anger began to build up inside of her as her thoughts continued to churn. Dawn, in the meantime, had turned his attention back to his wounded leg as he eyed the dagger sticking out of it dubiously. He had only two options at this point. He could either leave it in and try to finish the fight without dislodging it, or he could pull it out and try to finish the duel before he bled out fatally. He wasn't certain if he'd managed to avoid cutting anything vital when the blade had gone in. It was within the realm of possibility, but Dawn had the sickening feeling that, if he pulled the blade out, the blood that was already leaking out of the wound would only start to pour out faster. However, this wasn't like getting shot with an arrow. The edges of the blade ran all the way down its length. If Dawn tried moving too much less fighting, with the throwing knife still lodged in his flesh, the edges would probably continue to cut him, slicing the wound open further. Sadly, removing it and getting the leg treated was not an option. He had no reason to believe that Shade Steel would abandon her plans to kill him simply because he needed to do some first aid. I guess this means I can't afford to take my time, he thought glumly as he lifted his leg up to his mouth and carefully clamped down on the flat of the blade with his teeth. Carefully, so as not to slice his wound open further, Dawn pulled the blade out of his leg, sliding it back exactly along the path it had entered along. Once it was clear, he flicked his head to the side and let go, tossing the blade aside and letting it fall with a clang to the cave floor. As he had feared, blood began to stream from the hole pierced in his leg. The dripping sound intensified as it started to pour in earnest. I don't have long. Now he was at a serious disadvantage. All Shade had to do was draw the fight out as long as possible, and Dawn would ultimately bleed out onto the floor, leaving her free to finish him at her leisure. However, it seemed that Shade no longer cared for clever strategies. Instead, she let out an angry shriek and charged at Dawn. Her wings beat erratically, with heavy movements that he couldn't possibly miss, launching all of the knives she'd concealed amongst her feathers at once. All that metal rushing through the air made the knives impossible to not notice. However, her throw was wild. Most of the knives were flying wide of their target. Dawn easily slipped between the few that were actually heading for him, trailing a ribbon of blood as he turned his body to slip between their blades. Now Shade closed with him, the larger combat knife clenched in her fetlock as she launched a rapid series of thrusts at him. Dawn slipped from side to side, ducking and jumping to avoid her strikes. He thrust forward with one wing, sending a blast of compressed air at her. Shade managed to read his move and throw herself to the side to avoid the burst, which rushed forward and blasted the walls she'd constructed to rubble, blowing out chunks of stone and dried mud into the air outside. The two of them passed each other, then immediately turned around to face each other once again. Shade turned around, once again launching a series of thrusts so fast that her blade seemed to be in multiple places at once. Dawn did his best to slip between the stabbing motions of her knife, looking for an opening to strike her once again. Shade grit her teeth angrily. Her rational mind was already telling her that she had won. Time was on her side and Dawn wouldn't be able to keep this up much longer. But he had given the wound to himself by blocking the knife she had thrown at Dinky. If there was one thing Shade was certain of, she wanted to end the fight on her terms, rather than his. If only he would give her the opening she needed, she could put her secret weapon to use and put an end to this demon once and for all. Then it happened. Rather than sidestep one of her thrusts, Dawn avoided it by leaning back, moving just out of the knife's reach. His wings were buzzing as he built up another electrical charge amongst his feathers. He needed to end this fight now, so there was no purpose in clinging to pointless pride and letting himself bleed out because of it. He knew that none of his loved ones would approve of that. Already, his vision was beginning to fade and he was starting to feel fuzzy and lightheaded. It was time to put this battle to an end. Unfortunately, Shade had exactly the same idea. She extended her arm as far as it would go, keeping the tip of her knife leveled straight at Dawn. Though his wind sensed, the colt barely perceived the way her fetlock tightened about the handle. His ears barely heard the click of the concealed switch being pressed. None of that registered to Dawn consciously, because his mind was suddenly occupied by the fact that the knife that he should have been safely out of the reach of was now about to punch through his skull right between his eyes. Dawn dropped down, ducking out of the way. However, he already knew that it was too late. The blade of the knife etched a sharp line of pain along the top of his head as the edge glanced off the bone underneath his skin before bouncing away, scattering more droplets of blood into the air as it went. Dawn leaned forward, stretching out with his wings as Shade's body went rigid with surprise, shocked that her secret weapon had missed. His leading primaries made contact and the electrical charge that he had been building jumped straight into the mare's body. Shade Steel's muscles locked in spasm as the current surged through her. Her mouth opened in a soundless scream as arcs of energy played across her skin, followed by smell of burnt flesh. Her jolt threw her back away from Dawn, where she collapsed to the cave floor, still twitching and spasming as thin tendrils of smoke rose from patches of burnt fur. For a moment Dawn stood there panting for breath, barely conscious of the feeling of blood dripping down the sides of his head. As it was, the world both sounded and felt very far away. Dawn realized that he was near his limit and needed to staunch the bleeding from his leg and head soon, but he couldn't find the energy or strength to do so. A fluttering sound, followed by the sound of hooves alighting on the ledge outside the cave, seemed a world away. Slowly, the muscles of his neck feeling stiff and unresponsive, Dawn turned to look, seeing two Pegasi coming into the cave. He must have been worse off than he thought because, while they were familiar, he couldn't recall who they were at the moment. He could hear the smaller of the two Pegasi calling his name, but couldn't really think about that as his legs gave way and he too sank down. Dawn continued to hear voices talking above him, even as he felt some pony applying pressure to both sides of his wounded foreleg, the jolt of pain surging up through his body, briefly clearing away the cobwebs gathering in his mind. Listen carefully, said the voice from above, calm but radiating authority. I need you to stay awake. Whatever you do, keep listening to my voice. Dawn wanted to respond in the affirmative but was feeling very tired. He was also starting to feel cold. However, he did his best to hold on as the voices continued talking over him. We have to get him to the hospital, said Stormfront as he finished wrapping the lacerations in Dawn's foreleg. It was a temporary measure at best given that the wound went all the way through the limb. Already, a patch of red was starting to form on the white bandages. Okay, said Scootaloo quickly, doing her best to secure the gauze pad over Dawn's head injury in place. We need to move fast, I'll carry him, said Storm, picking Dawn's limp form up in his forelegs. I've got an idea, said Scootaloo, keep behind me. Storm wondered just what she had in mind but didn't have enough time to ask for an explanation. Instead, the two of them quickly took off, winging their way towards the Ponyville hospital. In the distance, he could see the sunlight illuminating the figures of a pair of armored Pegasi. That gave the mercenary Pegasus some comfort at least. They would make Sea to Shade Steel and put her where she belonged. But Dawn was the one who mattered right now. A second later, Storm understood why Scootaloo wanted him to fly behind her. She was using her magic to split the air around her, sharply reducing the drag that Storm was feeling and allowing him to manage the load of another pony with greater ease as the filly ahead of him bent all her will and strength towards pushing as hard and fast as she could. The forest was a brown and white blur below them, which gave way to the pure white of the snow-covered park fields, then the roofs of Ponyville houses before, finally, the hospital came into sight. The two of them stooped sharply towards the doors, Scootaloo shooting ahead, but still leaving a channel of clear air for Storm to follow through. We need a doctor, now, she screamed as she practically slammed the hospital doors open. Storm swept in behind her, Dawn still wrapped securely in his arms. The mare at the reception desk took one look at the situation and quickly summoned one of the doctors. A brown unicorn stallion was soon rushed into the lobby, just as they were loading Dawn onto a gurney. The doctor and nurses were shouting to each other in the typically impenetrable jargon of medical professionals while Storm and Scootaloo looked on. The group quickly vanished into the hospital hallways, their voices muffling slightly as the doors swung closed before fading out altogether. Storm gulped. In a sense, Dawn had been in much worse shape after his fight with Storm and Red River. But Dawn had taken a serious injury in this most recent fight and had been fighting hard while losing a lot of blood. Is he gonna be okay? Asked Scootaloo, her eyes watering as she watched the doors that Dawn had gone through. He should be fine, said Storm. It isn't very difficult for a unicorn doctor to staunch bleeding. Once that is done, all they have to do is close the injuries and then replenish Dawn's blood supply. It won't even require a very powerful healing spell. The only thing he'll need to do is rest to recover from the blood loss. Oh okay, said Scootaloo, her lip trembling. This was the third time, she reflected, the third time she'd found herself waiting out here in the hospital's reception area while Dawn was within, being treated by the doctors for some injury he'd sustained. The first time had been when Applejack had bucked him in the ribs. The second had been after his savage duel with Stormfront and Red River. Now, he was here after one of those damn cultists had come after him for no good reason. The doors to the hospital swung open again, this time admitting a gray mare with a blonde mane as Ditzy trotted inside. On her back rested Dinky, who was looking a little grimy after being tied up in that cave, but, ultimately, no worse for wear. Where's Dawn? Asked Ditzy, her eyes moving on separate tracks, as though she was trying to look over both sides of the waiting room at once. Inside, said Stormfront, the doctor is seeing him now. Hopefully we'll get some news about him soon. Okay, said Ditzy as she let Dinky climb down. She settled onto one of the cushioned chairs to wait while Dinky climbed up onto her lap. The little filly looked as though she was on the verge of tears. I'm sorry, said Dinky softly. Why? Asked Scootaloo. Dawn was saving me, she whimpered, it's my fault he's hurt. It's not, snapped Scootaloo, getting close to Dinky, he was there because he wanted to protect you. If any pony's to blame, it's the mare who did this to him. She should be in guard custody for now, said Storm, who was heading towards the door. I'm sure that a doctor will be seeing her soon, though I for one wouldn't mind if she had the chance to savor the pain of her injuries for a little longer. Yeah, agreed Scootaloo before noting that Storm was leaving. Where are you going? I'm afraid that some pony is going to have to let Fluttershy know that Dawn's been injured, said Storm warily. She gets quite upset when she finds that she's been left out of the loop. He shuddered involuntarily, and I don't want to get on her bad side ever again. Scootaloo nodded and watched as Storm took his leave. With a sigh, she settled into for a wait that she hoped wouldn't be too long. For Dawn, consciousness returned in fits and starts. First, he was aware of the tingling sensation of his limbs, followed by the feeling of the hospital sheets against them. Then his ears began to pick up the ambient sounds around him. Slowly, his eyes crawled open and Don found himself staring up at the white featureless ceiling of a hospital room. Ah, he thought wryly, back again. Welcome back to the waking world, said Symphony from beside him. Slowly, Don tilted his head over and saw the familiar blue and crimson figure of Red River, who was seated next to the bed. From the look of things, he had been there for a while. There was a closed book on the side table that the stallion had clearly set aside once he noticed that Don had been waking up. How long this time? Asked Don, his voice a bit hoarse. Before responding, Red went over to the sink on the far wall and used it to fill a glass with water. Returning, he helped Don sit up before aiding him in sipping the water down little by little. It was just overnight, said Red, in answer to Don's question. The doctor put a sleep spell on you to help you rest. I think he was very relieved that you didn't fight it. Don nodded. He still felt a little lightheaded, though he wasn't sure whether that was from the blood loss or the grogginess that came from regaining consciousness. You did need a transfusion, explained Red as he took the cup back from Don. Fortunately, Storm and Scootaloo managed to get you here rather quickly, so your condition wasn't as serious as it could have been. The doctors also closed the wounds on your leg and scalp. Don lifted a hoof up and felt the faint, raised line of flesh that ran along the length of the top of his head. What about Shade Steel? He asked finally. Red frowned. She is in guard custody. Storm and I sent the paperwork along to Shining Armor and she should be transported to Canterlot within the next day or so. I hear that Princess Celestia wants to handle this one personally. It would seem that she's furious that one of her royal guards would go this far astray. Don's lips pressed into a tight line as he turned his eyes back towards the sheet covering him. That weapon of hers, what was it? Red smiled. That was a bit of a surprise. It's a fairly rare weapon known as a ballistic knife. It uses a spring to propel the blade towards a target within a short distance. It's mostly a gimmick but can be deadly when used under the proper circumstances. Don nodded in agreement with that last sentence as the circumstances of the fight resurfaced in his memory. Shade had attacked with a series of thrusts but hadn't fired the knife's blade until Don had dodged by pulling back away from one of her stabs. It was a weapon designed to strike a target just when she thought she was out of range, an action made all the more deadly because the strike could be made without any of the signs that would accompany throwing a weapon. Ironically, it was probably Shade's choice of target that had saved Don's life. The spring for the knife blade couldn't have been very strong, which wouldn't have given the knife much range or penetrating power. As a result, the blow had glanced off his skull rather than punched through. Had she managed to aim the blade a little lower, it would have been embedded in his throat, which would have ended the fight much differently. How is Dinky? Asked Don. She's a bit shaken up but fine otherwise, said Red. Shade didn't want to hurt her, so she didn't even tie the filly up all that tight. Scootaloo told me how you got her out of there, by the way. Good work. How is every pony else? Asked Don. He realized that they must be worried about him, again. Red raised a hoof and pointed over the bed to the opposite wall, which was dominated by a window with closed curtains. The window was set into an alcove in the wall, the bottom of which was covered by a broad cushion. In the faint light of the morning sun, which was just beginning to illuminate the room, Don could make out the forms of Fluttershy and Scootaloo, the two of them curled up next to each other as they slept peacefully, with the filly tucked safely beneath Fluttershy's wing. Don simply watched as soft breaths from Scootaloo's nostrils gently stirred some of the long loose strands of Fluttershy's mane. The warmth, almost searing in its intensity, settled in his stomach. I'm so lucky to have them, he thought. After everything he had been through, after everything he had done, after all the bridges he had tried to build and then subsequently burnt, here he was, in the presence of ponies who cared intensely. No, desperately about him. Don felt a tear slipping down one of his cheeks. Seeing his mother and Scootaloo there made him so happy that it almost overwhelmed him sickeningly. These thoughts had occurred to him before, but they had always been offset by that nagging doubt in his gut. That nagging doubt had nearly burned another bridge for him when he'd run away from Fluttershy after that mare from Full Services had come. That nagging doubt had nearly consumed him and destroyed the one truly, unquestionably good thing that Don currently had in his life. Now, as he woke up in a hospital bed from his latest round of injuries, sustained in yet another fight for his life, there were two of the most precious ponies in his world, still there, still waiting for him. I have a family. I have a home. I have ponies that want me. I have ponies that love me. I have ponies that will wait for me to come back. I have ponies who will go out with me. This must have been the feeling that a street-dwelling pauper might have when the keys to a massive fortune fell into her lap without a single string attached. I think I'll step outside for a moment, said Red softly. As the Azure Stallion took his leave, Fluttershy's eyelids began to twitch before slowly drifting open. Slowly, she lifted her head and let her gaze come to rest at Don. Her lips curled upward into a radiant smile. Moving carefully, so as not to disturb the filly still slumbering beneath her wing, Fluttershy stood up and got off the cushion in the window alcove, taking a moment to settle the gray hospital blanket over the still slumbering filly once again. From there, it was a couple of short steps across the floor to reach the bed. For a moment, Fluttershy stood there, looking at Don. The relief was evident in her gaze. Don expected a little reproach, possibly for being reckless and getting himself hurt once again, but there was no sign of it. All he saw was his mother's smile. Slowly, Fluttershy leaned in and nuzzled Don's cheek tenderly. Don took a moment to bask in the gesture before returning it, pressing his muzzle against her cheek. Their nuzzle continued until Don wiggled further out from under his sheets so that he could wrap his arms around Fluttershy's shoulders, pulling himself out further and holding onto her tightly. Fluttershy responded by lifting her own forelegs off the floor and returned the hug, pulling herself halfway up onto the bed. Even as they embraced, they continued to nuzzle one another as Fluttershy planted gentle kisses on his cheek. I love you, Mom, said Don, his voice little more than a whisper, but more than enough. I love you too, said Fluttershy without the slightest hesitation. You're the most precious pony to me in all the world. Neither of them really cared that Scootaloo had woken up now and was watching silently from the window alcove. The orange filly could only smile as she watched Don and Fluttershy express their affection so openly and naturally. She had to admit that she was a bit jealous of Fluttershy right now. Then again, she was sure that she would get her chance soon enough. After all, Don clearly took after his mother when it came to sharing his affection. The sound of the door opening made Scootaloo's ears perk up and she looked up to see the tan coat and brown mane of Caramel as he slipped silently into the room. Caramel met Scootaloo's gaze with a smile and a nod before turning his attention to Don and Fluttershy. He approached the bed from the other direction and reared up to enfold Dawn and Fluttershy in a hug of his own. Mind if I get in on this? Asked Caramel Riley from where he rested his head across Dawn's shoulder, just opposite from where Fluttershy was still nuzzling to the colt's cheek. It seems you already have commented, Dawn, just as Riley. It's good to see you're all right, said Caramel, holding his filly friend and her son tighter. Scootaloo had had enough. The bed jumped slightly as she landed on it after leaping across from the alcove. She quickly ducked beneath Caramel and Fluttershy's arms, wriggling her way into the group hug so that she could sidle up against Dawn, providing some nuzzles of her own, mixed with quick kisses to his cheek. Geez, I could forgive you for getting all mushy on me, she said, but you aren't gonna get away with leaving me out of it. I wouldn't dream of it, replied Dawn, turning and meeting Scootaloo's lips with his own. Shade Steel's awakening was far less gentle than Dawn's had been. Granted, the ponies transporting her had counted her comfort as least amongst their worries, if they counted it at all. She was still conscious, only barely, when they roughly dragged her off the floor of her cave and carried her out of it and into the open sky, where she dangled limply between two Pegasi of the Ponyville Guard, who hadn't cared one bit if they jostled her burned skin and still spasming muscles. They'd thrown her roughly, almost carelessly onto the cot in the cell. One of the guards had ruthlessly strapped her wings down, sending searing jolts of agony up and down her spine as the straps tightened around still fresh electrical burns. Finally, only just as Shade had been certain that her captors planned on letting her die from the shock of her injuries, did a unicorn from the hospital arrive in her cell. He hooked up an IV bag to the wall and inserted tube into the artery of one of her forelegs, providing her with nutrients as he hit her with a healing spell. After that, everything went dark as the healing spell did its work. When Shade awoke, she was groggy and sore. It was clear that the healing spell she'd received wasn't exactly comprehensive in nature, just enough to help her recover from the injuries that might otherwise kill or cripple her and curb the risk of any infection. However, her muscles were still sore from the spasming and her skin was still tender where it had burned. The fur of her coat hadn't grown back overnight, so it looked patchy in the areas where it had been scorched away by the electrical arcs of Dawn's attack. The fact that the straps of her wing restraints stung as they rubbed against those areas made it perfectly clear that the doctor had done the bare minimum to heal her injuries. Shade rolled over to get her hooves under her. At that moment, she realized that the IV tube had been removed from her foreleg at some point. Her stomach growled unpleasantly, making it clear that she needed to eat soon. Shade had had enough healings by this point that she knew how important it was to get sustenance and replenish her body's nutrients. As though summoned by her hunger, the scent of food reached Shade's nostrils, indicating that some pony had apparently been thinking along the same wavelength that she was and cared enough that they didn't simply ignore her. Looking over, she saw a platter of hay and potatoes, accompanied by poached eggs and a large glass of milk. There was also a tiny plate with a few pills placed on it. After the rough treatment she had undergone, the sight of that wonderful-looking meal nearly brought tears to Shade's eyes. At least these ponies cared enough about her that they were willing to feed her properly. Taking the pills, Shade swallowed them and chased them down with a gulp of milk. Then she tucked into her meal with a gusto, completely clearing her plate in just a couple of minutes. The food had been delicious and Shade found herself wishing wistfully that the rest of her experience could be that pleasant. It seems you enjoyed that well enough, said a stallion's voice from outside her cell. Shade lifted her head away from the plate and looked through the bars to see a stallion with a beige-colored coat and a darker brown mane standing outside. His eyes were closed, but his ears were turned directly towards her and his muzzle also pointed directly at her. Even though he couldn't see her, he knew exactly where she was. Shade recognized him immediately. This was Arkenstone, Twilight Sparkle's colt friend, the proprietor of the tea house next to the library. He was the pony Dawn had asked to help examine the place where she had hidden the other night. Now, he was standing outside her cell, as though he had been the one to put her there. Perhaps he was the warden as well as a business owner. Shade frowned and glared defiantly at him, not that her expression could have any impact on a pony that couldn't see it. She didn't bother trying to hide her feelings. This stallion was clearly on the side of Dawn Lightwing. Given what she had read in the news, it was likely that he was fully aware of the faux colt's demonic origins and supported him anyway. She had no respect for filth like him. Arkenstone pulled the cell door open. It had been unlocked the entire time he had been there. Shade would have heard the sound of a key turning any time between when she would have regained consciousness and now. Arkenstone had probably been the one to bring her food and take away the IV bag. She realized that it meant that the door to her cell had been unlocked the whole time. Shade Steel tensed. Her muscles were still sore, her wings were bound, her skin still raw. But she had fought more serious battles in worse conditions than this. Her time in the SES had trained her to fight even when she was injured, even when she was in pain. Pain that might incapacitate other ponies was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to her. Furthermore, the stallion in front of her was nothing more than the owner of a tea shop. While he had apparently helped Dawn learn about her, he was still just an earth pony civilian. There was no way some pony like him could be a serious obstacle. Shade would simply subdue Arkenstone, find a way to remove her restraints, and make her escape. Once she was out, hiding and losing any pursuit would be simple enough. She would be able to make another attempt on Dawn Lightwing's life later. That's a bad idea, said Arkenstone, his sightless eyes opening the barest fraction. You shouldn't be making such grim plans in your situation. Shade's eyes went wide. It was as though Arkenstone had known exactly what she had been thinking, like he had been reading her mind. Wah, the word died on her lips, probably because she died in the next instant. She felt a series of chills across her body, including one in her neck. The next moment, her vision seemed to shift wildly. It was strange, like she was looking at her body from outside herself. Only an instant later did the sudden change in perspective make sense as Shade realized that her head had been severed at the neck and was now spinning away through the air, giving her a perfect view to watch as the rest of her body was cut to pieces. She couldn't even see the attack, couldn't even see the blades that had just ended her life. It was too horrible to comprehend. Just like that, Shade Steel was dead. Shade's eyes snapped closed and then opened again. She opened her mouth to scream, sucking in a breath that expanded her chest explosively, only to halt as Shade realized that she could feel her chest feel the rest of her body. Her head hadn't been severed after all. Even so, the sensation had been surreal that Shade couldn't resist reaching up to feel her neck. It was intact, without a scratch. What happened? Did you enjoy your taste of death? asked Arkenstone softly, his eyes still open, revealing nothing more than orbs of milky white as they stared down at Shade where she had sunk to the floor of her cell, unable to hold herself up any longer. What happened? Gasped Shade, trying to make sense of it all. It took a minute, but then she remembered what she had learned during her time in the Royal Guard. Some ponies had honed their skills to such an extent that their intent itself was nearly a lethal force. He cut me down with nothing more than his mind, she realized with horror. It was nothing more than an illusion, but it was an illusion powerful enough to completely overpower her sense of reality. It was a stark indicator that the stallion in front of her was more than capable killing her for real. I can't fight him. Who are you? Asked Shade, unable to wrench her eyes away from the terrifying pony in front of her. Nothing had changed visibly about him, but, all the same, it was as though she was laying helplessly in front of some sort of inconceivable monster. My name is Arkenstone. I am merely the proprietor of the local tea house, replied the stallion, but I'm guessing you knew that already. The dossier that Shining Armor sent me indicated that you're a pony who does your homework. How? Shade couldn't even finish her sentence. Just who was this pony that he was able to get information directly from Shining Armor? The me that you know is merely the me that I allow most other ponies to see and know. She felt, rather than saw, and heard Arkenstone taking a deep breath. In that moment, Shade felt as though the weight of her body had increased tenfold. Unconsciously, she dug in her hooves, useless against the solid stone of the floor, in an effort to keep from sliding towards the stallion. At the same time, she heard groaning and grinding from the stonework of the room around her. Shade almost fancied that she could see the walls themselves shift in Arkenstone's direction as though everything was straining towards the stallion, as if he had become a singularity, as though he stood at the center of all creation, drawing it into himself. I am Sir Arkenstone, Knight of the Celestial Order, named champion of the Princesses Celestia and Luna, said the stallion, his volume not increasing, but his voice sounding like claps of thunder to Shade Steele's ears, making her want to cover them with her hooves as they lay flat against her head. Only the feeling that she would fall forward into this terrible pony-shaped monstrosity stopped her. The knights are real. I thought they were just legends. But there was no denying the feeling before her. This awesome power, indescribable in its potency, could only belong to a pony whose strength exceeded Shade's comprehension. As skilled as she was, she now understood completely and fully just how far beyond her this stallion was. Who else could he be but a celestial knight? But, at the same time, her mind reeled for a different reason. He was a knight all along. But he was helping Dawn Lightwing. Why? Why would Princess Celestia's most dedicated servants help a demon like? Then she recalled Arkenstone's words when he denounced his true identity to her. Quote. Named champion of the Princesses Celestia and Luna. In his own words, he recognized Luna as a princess of Equestria and an equal of Celestia. He did not regard her as an enemy or a threat. She supposed that it was within the realm of possibility that Nightmare Moon had warped the mind of even some pony as powerful as a celestial knight to bend to her will. But if she had, then there was no way that his presence before her would come off as so clear and absolute. This was a pony of unshakable will and perseverance. To bend such a will was just as likely to break it as anything else. This meant that Arkenstone acknowledged Luna as a princess of his own will, which would mean, no, it can't be possible. It can't be true. Luna is Nightmare Moon, the demon of night eternal. She seeks death, destruction, and perversion. There is no way. I can see that you are beginning to understand the severity of your crime, said Arkenstone, and the depth of your mistake. You, who once served amongst those closest and most respected by Princess Celestia, were led astray by foolish superstition and prejudice. But then, why? Gasped Shade, why were the elements of harmony needed to stop Nightmare Moon? If she is not the bane of all that is good, why was the mightiest magic of the known world needed to stop her? Exactly, said Arkenstone, to stop her, the elements of harmony were needed. But you yourself supplied the answer to your question through simple omission. 2. Stop. Her. Repeated Shade, running the words through her mind. It seemed odd. After being on the receiving end of the elements of harmony, which had once banished her to the moon, Nightmare Moon had not been banished again, nor had she been punished more severely by being destroyed. Rather, the elements had. You know, we were there, said Arkenstone, the stern tone falling from his voice, replaced by one that was sad and guilty. You were there. Arkenstone nodded. When Nightmare Moon returned to the world, when she came down to Ponyville, all of us knights had assembled in preparation. We were there, watching as Nightmare Moon made her appearance. We were waiting as Twilight Sparkle and her friends made their journey into the Everfree Forest to awaken the elements of harmony. We stood by as they confronted Nightmare Moon and purified her with the element's power. Why? Arkenstone smiled sadly. It's very simple. We were there to kill Nightmare Moon. Princess Celestia herself gave us the order. If Twilight and her friends failed, if they were unable to awaken the elements, we were to step in and put an end to Nightmare Moon ourselves. Only with all of us present could have such a feat been accomplished, and it was likely that more than half of us would have died in the ensuing struggle. So that was why, said Shade, Princess Celestia wouldn't want to risk losing half of her knights if she could avoid it. Arkenstone shook his head. That was not it at all. We have the capacity to ignore her orders if we deem it necessary. If we thought there was too much risk in waiting to see if Twilight and her friends would succeed first, we would have happily ignored Celestia's orders and attacked. But that was not the point. You see, if we had acted, if we had battled Nightmare Moon and triumphed, what would have happened? Then Nightmare Moon would be dead, said Shade simply. It was fairly obvious after all. She began to ponder the long-term consequences of that development. However, before she could think too much on it, Arkenstone spoke again. Exactly, Nightmare Moon would be dead. That would mean that Princess Luna, Celestia's precious younger sister, would be dead. Celestia would spend the rest of her existence never able to see her sister's face, to hear her voice, to see her smile. That was why she gave us the order to hold back. As knights, we hold incredible power, the power to lay low Equestria's greatest enemies, the power to smite down Nightmare Moon herself. We had the power to stop her, but Celestia wanted to put her trust and faith in a much greater power, in ponies far stronger than us. What? Stronger than you? Shade gasped. Certainly, the elements of harmony were powerful beyond all description, with the strength to seal even the eternal master of chaos and disharmony, Discord himself. But the bearers were ordinary ponies. Sure, Twilight Sparkle was considered one of the most brilliant magic users in Equestria's history since the legendary Starswirl the Bearded, and Rainbow Dash was probably one of the, if not the best flyer in the history of the nation. But they weren't warriors. They were a scholar, an athlete, a fashion designer, a baker, a farmer, and an animal caretaker. How could they possibly be stronger than Equestria's order of greatest martial practitioners, ponies who were said to stand equal to entire armies on the field? As knights, explained Arkenstone, what we have trained and honed is the art of bringing death and destruction to our enemies. I have long sought to learn other ways to avoid such bloodshed. But, ultimately, to be a knight is to be recognized for your capacity for murder. He spoke as though the title was something to be ashamed of rather than praised. As knights, we had the power to put an end to Nightmare Moon. We had the power to stop her, but Twilight and her friends command an even greater power. They had the power to save her. Shade's jaw dropped as Arkenstone's words registered in her mind. The elements didn't defeat Nightmare Moon. They saved her. Killing is such a simple thing, said Arkenstone sadly, and, sadly, as knights, what we ultimately do is hone that power. The best we can do is learn ways to solve crises without it, how to go without utilizing that power. That is why you disgust me so much. You approached this situation only thinking of killing, of how to kill. You never thought about anything else. From the moment you laid eyes on Don Lightwing, you refused to think about him as a pony and only thought about how to end his life and why his life needed to be ended. Let me ask you something. Between a pony, whose every waking thought is about how to kill, and a so-called demon who has been living peacefully with the ponies he's supposed to a threat to, just who is the real monster? Shade went cold. Arkenstone's words had struck a serious chord within her. Have I really fallen? She wondered, was I the real monster here? I've said enough, said Arkenstone as he took his leave, closing and locking the cell behind him. You will be sent to Canterlot within the next day. Princess Celestia has expressed an interest in handling your case personally. You can see for yourself just what she thinks of your devotion. Author's notes. 1. Thanks to transmutation spells, blood can easily be transmuted from one blood type to the next. Thus, all unicorn doctors are taught the transmutation spell, which they can then cast on stored blood before it is given to the pony who requires it. Thanks to this magic, every pony in Equestria technically qualifies as a universal donor. Interestingly, this spell is descended from a similar spell that was developed by members of the unicorn nobility. Its original purpose was to transmute the blood of another pony, usually a foal, to make the foal a blood descendant of a particular noble house in cases where, for whatever reason, adoption was required to continue a particular noble's line. However, transmuting another pony's blood while it is still inside the pony in question is a potentially lethal process, especially if the new blood type is different from the foal's original. This led to the spell's complete prohibition by direct order of Princess Celestia, with promises of the severest punishments possible under equestrian law if it was ever used. We now return you to your regularly scheduled WAF. Next chapter, Shadesteel gets scolded. The show must go on. Chapter 17, The show must go on. The door to Ponyville's guard station shut behind Arkenstone. He let out his breath slowly and willed his body to relax. It's a bit strange, he thought, it's been so long since I've been that openly furious with some pony. Still, he hadn't had to kill her. That was something good about this situation. Well, that was entertaining. Arkenstone's ears perked at the sound of Arcana's voice. It took less than a second to pinpoint the location of Trixie's brother. Arcana wasn't trying to hide himself anyway. I noticed you didn't do anything to help, said Arkenstone. You could have looked for Shadesteel yourself, aided our search. Too many cooks spoil the broth, said Arcana in a smug tone that allowed Arkenstone to practically hear the smirk on his face. I figured that, if I interfered, I might unintentionally muck things up more than they already were. We aren't exactly accustomed to working together after all. Besides, I figured this was a good chance. A good chance for what? Arcana's smile widened. It was a good chance to see Don Lightwing in action for myself. After hearing about him from both you and Spitfire, I figured it was a good opportunity to see how he handled the situation. I must say, he didn't disappoint. He has great potential, said Arkenstone, nodding in agreement. I can see why you and Spitfire have marked him as a possible successor. Arcana chuckled. I noticed that you didn't mention anything to Shadesteel about how the fight ended. She will probably figure it out soon enough, remarked Arkenstone. Indeed, agreed Arcana. Don was rubbing it in a way. Even though he had removed Dinky Doo from the picture, he was still fighting as though she was there in the cave with them, still at risk. He conformed to the rules that Shadesteel set to the very end of the match, even though it could have potentially cost him his life. It seems rather silly that he'd risk so much for the sake of pride. It wasn't pride, said Arkenstone, it was about Dinky. Oh, said Arcana, raising an eyebrow, how so? What Don despises more than anything is that the ponies who seek him would try to hurt others or put them at risk in order to put him at a disadvantage. Even though Don had helped Dinky Doo escape, he still abided by the conditions that Shadesteel had set to show that there was no need for her to involve an innocent pony. He still would have faced her in a situation that was to her advantage. He was even willing to forego his most effective skills. Don played by Shadesteel's rules, not to uphold his own pride, but to show Shadesteel just how wrong she was about the way she saw him. I don't know if Shadesteel will see things in quite that way, but it was Don's own way of striking at the very pillar of her cause directly. Arcana chuckled. In a way, that's rather vindictive of him. If Shadesteel realizes that, it could tear her very world asunder. I'd heard that your two hirelings helped him with his emotional issues, but it would seem that Don still has quite the mean streak when it suits him. Perhaps, said Arkenstone with a small smile, but he is channeling even that attribute in a positive direction, so I cannot truly complain. Besides, it's not as though we haven't done similar things in our day. True enough, agreed Arcana with a shrug. Ooh yes, right there darling. Rarity sighed happily as Lotus kneaded her hooves into the muscles along Rarity's back, working out the tension and placing Rarity in a state of absolute bliss. With a soft moan, Rarity settled more heavily onto the massage table as she turned her gaze to Twilight, who was relaxing in the mud bath while wearing a full facial mask. Don't keep us in suspense. Just how is Don doing? Twilight smiled and turned her head in Rarity's direction, though Twilight couldn't see Rarity though the cucumbers resting atop her eyes. Arkenstone told me that Don's life isn't in any danger. He lost quite a bit of blood, but they managed to get him treated before he went into shock. That's a blessing, said Rarity. It's a good thing they had enough blood on hoof. I don't think there'll be a shortage anytime soon, said Twilight wryly. How are Dinky and Ditzy doing? Asked Applejack, reclining on her back and enjoying another hoofacure. I talked with Ditzy this morning, said Rainbow Dash from where she and Melon Cream were relaxing in the herbal bath. She says Dinky's fine. She had a few light bruises from the wires that the nutjob tied her down with. But other than that, she's okay. She's a tough filly and she'll bounce back without too many problems. Melon raised a hoof to her lips and tittered lightly. If anything, I'm willing to be that. Dinky was actually thrilled that Dawn came to her rescue. Rainbow let out a sly cackle of her own. Yeah, there is that. What are you talking about? Asked Twilight, turning her head about in confusion. Dinky has a big crush on Dawn, explained Rainbow. Rarity gasped dramatically, nearly shooting to her hooves before a cough and a stern glare from Lotus caused her to laugh and grin sheepishly at her masseuse prompted her to lay back down on the table. Oh my, so Dawn was like Dinky's knight in shining armor. That's so romantic. Rainbow couldn't help but laugh some more. Yeah, but the poor guy is completely clueless about it, not to mention that Scootaloo's not about to let him go anytime soon. Ooh, a love triangle, gasped Rarity, how marvelous. Twilight was disappointed that her mask completely obscured the deadpan expression she was giving Rarity. Somehow, I get the impression that it's not nearly as dramatic as you're making it out to be. At that moment, the door to the sauna slid open, releasing a billowing cloud of steam into the room. Ah, the great and powerful Trixie is reborn, gasped Trixie with a toss of her head, the lustrous locks of her mane swinging about dramatically as she trotted into the room. I must say, you look much better now, said Rarity as she smiled at Trixie. Indeed, Trixie looked like a completely new pony, or rather, the pony she had been the last time they'd seen her in Ponyville. Her mane had been trimmed and evened out, her tail combed, and her fur brushed. With Rarity's help, Trixie looked as good as new, only the faint thinness along her barrel and the heavier musculature along her legs served to indicate the time she had spent in the northern climes with her brother. With a grateful sigh, Trixie sank into the bath along with Melon and Rainbow. Thank you so much for treating me to this. I don't deserve it after the way I treated all of you. Perhaps not, said Rarity, but if what Twilight told us is true, then your brother has more than seen to your punishment. I'm surprised he came to Ponyville with you, said Twilight. Well, he is overseeing my training after all, said Trixie. Arcana may not be a stillway practitioner himself, but he has been helping me try and learn it. Besides, that's not his only reason for coming. Then why? Asked Twilight. Arcana was very curious about that colt you've been talking about, said Trixie. What was his name again? Don Lightwing, said Melon helpfully. Exactly, said Trixie. I have to admit, I'm curious about him too. It's a shame I haven't gotten a chance to meet him yet. I thought you'd been over to the tea house a couple of times, said Twilight. Trixie nodded. Yes, but he wasn't there when I went. Well, we can arrange for you to meet him sooner or later, said Twilight. By the way, in about a week, we're going up to Canterlot to get ready for the pageant. Did you want to join us? Trixie gasped, her hooves going to her mouth. Oh my goodness, are you sure? Of course, said Twilight, you're welcome to come with us. We'd even be happy to have you attend the winter gala with us. Rarity ducked her head to hide a sly smirk. That would be wonderful, said Trixie, looking like she'd won the lottery. So, it's become a summons? Asked Arkenstone, running his hoof over the card in front of him. To Arcana, who sat across the table from him, it appeared blank, though he knew otherwise. The silver, monogrammed writing on his own invitation stood in stark contrast to Arkenstone's own. The sender was well aware that any fancy filigree would be lost on the blind stallion and had simply made the lettering raised on Arkenstone's invitation to make it easier to read. More like a general invitation, said Arcana. I think it was Spitfire's idea. She knew you'd be there with Twilight Sparkle. She will be there, since it's typical for the Wonderbolts to attend the winter gala, barring emergencies. I recently told her that I would probably be attending as well. A whim? Asked Arkenstone. Well, I figured that Twilight Sparkle and her friends would invite Trixie to come with them, so I figured I would tag along. How very brotherly of you. Arcana ignored Arkenstone's snark and continued his explanation. So I believe that Celestia and Luna got it into their heads to invite all the knights. It's the first time in a long time that all 7 of us will be in one place at the same time. Assuming all 7 of us actually make it, said Arkenstone, who sent out the invitation. Given how fancy they look, I guess this is Sunny's work, remarked Arcana. Arkenstone raised an eyebrow. I never figured she'd go along with this. She's normally too prickly to want to get along with any of us if she can avoid it. Who knows, said Arcana with a shrug. I take it Swift was invited as well. Probably. Who knows if he'll actually be there. Even if he RSVPs, he could simply be faking it. I wouldn't bet either way. Arkenstone sighed. I'd hate to say this about one of my contemporaries, but every pony would probably be better off if he stayed away. I rather agree, admitted Arcana without the slightest hint of shame. At the very least, we'd know that he and Applejack would probably get along like oil and water. More like vinegar and baking soda, muttered Arkenstone. Well, either way, this gathering promises to be quite interesting, said Arcana with a grin. Regardless of whether Swift shows up or not, I haven't seen any of the others in quite some time. We can only hope that their respective duties allow them to attend, said Arkenstone, nodding in agreement. Don blinked and shaded his eyes. After spending so many hours in the slightly darkened hospital room, with the curtains drawn over the windows, the bright sunlight of the afternoon stung his sensitive eyes. Beside him, Fluttershy let out a demure giggle. Maybe we should get you some sunglasses. I'll adjust soon enough, said Don, squinting against the glare. The snow on the ground didn't help, its white surface catching the sunlight and throwing it at Don's face from below. He briefly considered simply closing his eyes and using his wind sense to navigate, but opted to stick it out. A few moments later, his eyes properly adjusted and Don was ready to join his family and Scootaloo for the journey back home. As they began to set out, their attention was drawn to the sound of wing beats as a familiar Pegasus alighted on the ground in front of them. Don, exclaimed Ditzy happily, I'm so glad to see you're all right. Thank you, said Don. A grayish-purple blur leapt down from Ditzy's back and bounded across the ground between them. Don rocked back as Dinky all but crashed into him, throwing her arms enthusiastically around his neck and nuzzling against him. My hero, she squealed. Why, you're welcome, said Don, awkwardly reaching up with one foreleg to return the embrace while he balanced on the remaining 3. Fluttershy and Ditzy couldn't help but giggle at the scene, whilst Caramel snorted with restrained laughter. Only Scootaloo didn't seem amused as she glowered sullenly at the sight of Dinky snuggling against her cold friend, only to flinch as Dinky pulled her face away from Dawn's neck to give Scootaloo a sly and triumphant smile before turning and giving Dawn a peck on the cheek. Scootaloo's expression went from sullen to outraged in an instant. Why that little sneak? If anything, Scootaloo's unconcealed frustration only served to amuse the onlookers even further. Shadesteel had never found herself so completely and thoroughly intimidated by absolutely nothing. The throne room was empty, the dual thrones of Celestia and Luna looming ahead on the dais, empty and unattended. Even the pair of guards, who stood on either side of Shade, were more like ornaments than actual ponies, silent and unresponsive, moving in sync with Shade like mindless automatons. Shade remembered her own days, spent standing and waiting, her watchful gaze surveying a hall or room for any signs of disturbance. While it was no state secret, it was very easy for regular ponies to forget that the Royal Guard were some of the finest guardsmares in all of Equestria. Most simply assumed that their only role was standing guard at the gates and along hallways, that they were mostly for appearances. Given the rigorous standards required to join, Royal Guards were, as a rule, better trained and more experienced than most average members of any other city or town guard in the nation. Furthermore, the majority of the elite guard teams, like the SES which Shade had originally served on, were attached to the Royal Guard. Though Shade knew that she was probably more experienced and more skilled than either of the two ponies flanking her, she had little chance of escape in her current condition. She'd expected to spend a few days cooling her hooves in the dungeon before she was dragged before Celestia to learn her fate. To Shade's surprise though, she was escorted through Canterlot in the palace, straight into the throne room, where she was now waiting in silence for the pony she had once sworn allegiance to. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the doors behind the throne opened wide. The bottom dropped out of Shade's stomach when she saw, not one, but two ponies coming through. It was all too easy to recognize the alabaster coat and shimmering auroral mane of Princess Celestia. But what really shocked and frightened Shade was the dark blue coat and flowing starscape mane of Princess Luna, who walked alongside her older and taller sister, her stern gaze no less intimidating. Shade felt a cold sweat break out on her brow. She'd known that Princess Celestia would want to see her, but to have Princess Luna, whom Shade had always believed to be darkness and evil incarnate, along for the ride was terrifying, though not because Shade was afraid of Luna. Shade had always been prepared to give her life in battle against Nightmare Moon if it ever came to that. Rather, what intimidated the former guardsmare was the fact that Luna's presence was a slap in the face to everything she had believed since she was a little filly. For as long as she possibly could, Shade had always managed to convince herself that Luna's presence and supposed role in Equestria's politics since her return had been the result of her scheming and lying. But now, faced with Luna and Celestia, standing together as sisters and equals, Shade realized that her fantasies couldn't stand up to reality any longer. Guards, said Celestia calmly, her voice completely devoid of any trace of anger, you may leave us. The two royal guards on either side of Shade bowed slightly and turned, taking their leave without the slightest hesitation. Had she not been a royal guard herself once, Shade might have been shocked at their compliance. But it had always made sense to her. If there was a threat dangerous enough to be potentially harmful to the princess, then there was very little the guard could actually do about it, least of all try and protect a pony who was leagues above them in power. They were better served getting civilians and servants out from under hoof so that Celestia could manage whatever that threat was. When the doors behind Shade slammed shut, silence returned to the throne room. Shade was now alone with the two alicorns, both of them staring down at her. Celestia's gaze was impassive, cold as the void between stars. In contrast, Luna's gaze was relaxed, with a hint of curiosity, as though she was more amused and perplexed by the pony who stood before her than incensed by Shade's affiliation with the Order of Celestial Light. Finally, it was Celestia who broke the silence. Shadesteel, once, I could have counted you amongst the finest ponies to ever serve in our guard. Your record speaks for itself, as do your skills. In your time as a member of the Royal Guard and a member of the Special Equine Services, you have performed great services for our nation and have done a great deal to protect our little ponies from harm. A long pause hovered in the air. Quote. All of which only serves to make me all the more disappointed to be forced to meet you like this. She sighed. Shade was trembling, the weight of Celestia's disappointment pressed down upon the dark gray mare like a massive boulder pressing down between her wings. Celestia began to pace back and forth on the dais. I could easily overlook your affiliation with the Cult Solar, as they were probably a fixture of your earliest days. Barring their animosity towards my beloved sister, I have heard that the group has actually done much good for the communities they have joined in recent years. It upsets me that so many of you would go so far as to ignore my explicit wishes by persecuting ponies on the basis of sham superstitions that have no basis in reality. It upsets me, but there is only so much I can do to combat it without overstepping the bounds of a just ruler and into tyranny. She came to a halt and turned with a snap, now facing Shade directly, an expression of outrage that looked completely alien to her decorating her face. But you served under me in my guard. You acted as an extension of my will and authority across Equestria. You were taught and trained to protect our ponies' harm. You were there when I came back to Canterlot on that fateful day and introduced Luna as my sister and explicitly stated my wish that she reclaim her throne to rule beside me. You chose to ignore all that, abandon your position, threaten and harm the very subjects you had once sworn to protect. Why? Her last word echoed like thunder across the empty expanse of the throne room, the sheer force of her voice and will practically pressing Shade down to the floor with a whimper. Celestia remained where she was, glaring down at Shade with all the fury that her thousands of years could imbue into her gaze. Silence returned once again to the throne room, only occasionally broken by the soft whimpers from Shade as the Pegasus fought for the words to justify her actions. Answer me, snapped Celestia. Shade could only squeak unintelligibly. All of her justifications, all of her carefully considered arguments, her detailed reasoning. All of it fell apart completely as she lay here before the very object of her adoration, who was telling her in no uncertain terms that she had been wrong about everything. Tia, said Luna softly, her voice cutting through Celestia's rage, causing the older of the royal sisters to jolt out of her anger. Celestia turned to regard Luna, blinking in slight confusion. Luna simply nodded to her and stepped forward to address Shade directly. Shadesteel, said Luna, stand up and look upon me. Slowly, Shade rose back to her hooves and lifted her eyes to look at the princess of the night, really look at her. For the first time since she had entered the room. Luna gazed back, her expression impassive, almost serene. Shade Steel, I want you to look me in the eye and tell me all that you think that I am, said Luna, be completely honest with me. There shall be no punishment, no retribution for simply speaking your mind. Pay no mind to my sister's presence for the moment. Shade opened her mouth, ready to spill out everything she had ever been taught and ever believed about Nightmare Moon in a torrent. But her words turned to ash on her tongue. Her mouth worked silently as she tried to say something, anything. But words failed her utterly. Luna waited a little bit longer to see if Shade anything to say before sighing. I see, she said, would that you could have realized your errors before it came to this. In all honesty, I could forgive you for your misconceptions regarding me even if you went so far as to defy my sister to hold true to your beliefs. Even your actions against Don Lightwing could be forgiven. I have spoken to the boy and know him to be skilled and tenacious. I have placed my trust in him and his friends to help him, regardless of what threats may come his way. But all of that pales in comparison to your most grievous crime. Shade was about ready to fall back down to the floor as her legs shook. Luna spoke calmly and softly, her voice devoid of anger but weighed down by a heavy sadness that seemed to seep into Shade's very soul. Taking a deep breath, Luna pressed on. You took an innocent filly hostage, imprisoned her in order to lure your true victim out. But what truly saddens me is that you deliberately placed that filly in harm's way solely to give yourself an advantage over Dawn. We know the whole details of the fight. You had Dinky Doo bound to a makeshift lightning rod so that if Dawn ever resorted to that technique, Dinky would be the one to suffer the consequences for it. The marble floor beneath Shade's hooves grew wet with tears. To make matters worse, continued Luna, imagine what might have happened if you had, by some freak chance, been right about Dawn. If he had truly been a demon without regard for the well-being of others, he would have unleashed his lightning there with nary a thought for Dinky's safety. An innocent filly would be gravely injured, perhaps even dead, all because you used her as an equine shield. Even worse, she was one of the ponies that you, as a royal guard, had sworn to protect. Did you cast aside that oath as well when you left? Did refusing to bow to me earn you the privilege to endanger the lives you were once sworn to preserve? Shade collapsed sobbing. Once, she would have been incensed at the idea of the princess of the night putting her in this position. But hearing the cold, stark truth straight from the mouth of the pony, Shade would have once decried as the queen of lies, shredded all thoughts of resistance and anger. I'm sorry, she sobbed, unable to lift her face from the floor any longer. The phrase escaped her again and again as she sobbed and wailed, the realization of just how far she had fallen, leaving her with nothing but regret and remorse. Celestia's horn flared, summoning the guards waiting outside. Put her in the dungeon, said Celestia, looking pityingly at Shade. Luna and I shall decide what her punishment shall be soon. The guards nodded and began to slowly drag the still sobbing Pegasus away. When they were left alone in the throne room once again, Luna turned to regard her older sister. Well, what shall we do with her then, Tia? I am not yet certain, admitted Celestia, but it must be appropriate. The first thing we need to do is gather all the information we can about the cult solar from her. We need to know its overall shape, who is spreading its message, how are they getting from one community to another. Most importantly, we need to track down this supreme pontiff of theirs and his cardinal. Until we have genuine proof of their intended action, all we have is hearsay from members acting on their own. Haven't you had Shining Armor investigate that temple in Appaloosa? Asked Luna. Celestia shrugged. Without additional proof of action and intent from the cult's leadership, there's only so far we can go. It's the difference between Shining being permitted to scan for secret doors and being able to simply blow through the floor to find out what they've buried under that building. If we can locate the cult's leaders and obtain proof of their intent, then we can tear the whole organization up by its roots and find out what the so-called Supreme Pontiff is up to. If we can manage it before he and his crony actually attack Dawn, so much the better. Are you absolutely certain that you'll be all right on your own? Asked Rarity as she stacked another trunk on the pile of luggage awaiting transport to the train station. Flaxseed eyed the pile dubiously before returning his attention to his employer, landlady. You do realize that I was living on my own before I came here, right? Of course I do, dear, said Rarity, giving him a warm smile, but it doesn't change the fact that it's going to get very lonely without any pony here for you to talk to. Rumble told me that you are welcome to join his family for dinner on Hearth's Warming Eve. They are all wonderful and decent ponies who would be only too happy to have you join them. Flaxseed frowned slightly, not sure what to say. I'll think about it. Rarity nodded and reached up to rest a friendly hoof on his shoulder. Please think hard about it. You're never going to learn to relax in the company of others if you don't expand beyond your comfort zone a little. I'm not suggesting that you throw yourself into the middle of Filthy Rich's post-pageant wrap-up party, but please consider doing more than spending the evening by yourself. Flaxseed let out a despondent sigh. I'll try my best. That's all I can ask, said Rarity. She turned her attention to the stairway leading to the second floor. Sweetie Belle, it's almost time for us to go. Are you packed yet? Yes, Sweetie shouted back as she trotted down the stairs, a pair of suitcases floating in her magic behind her. She was also wearing her saddlebags, which were bulging, possibly with the presents she had gotten for her friends. Excellent, let's head for the station then. Rarity lit her own horn and lifted several of the bags she had packed. A few seconds later, Flaxseed picked up the remaining bags and, together, the three of them left the Carousel Boutique behind, making their way to the train station. Every pony was already waiting for them there. Of course, the fact that Rarity was behind everyone else made sense when she had more luggage than the rest of them put together. Geez, Rarity, groused Rainbow, you think you brought enough stuff? Well, I am traveling rather light, so I had to make sure I had nothing but the bare essentials. Also, your new dresses are all in here. Rarity nodded at the pile of bags that she and Flaxseed had deposited on the platform. I thought Twilight was the only one asking for a new dress, said Rainbow, tilting her head curiously. Well, her idea was so fascinating that I couldn't help but make one for every pony. Rarity tossed her mane and posed proudly. With this, we are sure to make a spectacular impact at the Winter Gala. The others were already in the process of loading their bags on the train, a process exacerbated by the number of bags that Rarity had brought with her. The adults and foals worked together, save for two. It's gonna be okay, said Rumble, giving Sweetie a nuzzle on the cheek as she sniffed. It's only for a little bit and then you'll be right back. But I was really hoping I'd get to spend my Hearth's Warming Eve with you, said Sweetie. Are you sure you can't come? Yeah, said Rumble looking down. If I came, I'd have to invite Thunderlane and Cloud Chaser, Flitter too. Then Flitter would probably want to invite Stormfront. I don't think the princesses have that many rooms. Yeah, said Sweetie with a despondent sigh, trying her hardest to mask her disappointment. It's not fair though. Every pony else is gonna be with their special sumpony. Rumble smiled and leaned in to give Sweetie a light peck on the lips. Listen, when you get back, I promise we'll say something special. Is that okay? With a sigh, Sweetie managed to will a smile onto her face. Yeah. Good. I'll see you then. Rumble and Sweetie shared one last kiss before the colt backed up to let Sweetie join her family and other friends on the train. Twilight looked around, taking stock on the situation. Okay, all the luggage is stowed, every pony who's coming should be on the train. Right, Spike? Let's. Twilight's voice trailed off as she remembered the absence of her number one assistant. Huh, Scootaloo leaned out the window, noticing for the first time that their party seemed to be short by a few members. Where's Spike? For that matter, where are Applejack and Apple Bloom? Finishing up the winter silk harvest, said Twilight. Spike's helping them keep it organized. They're going to catch a later train and probably be about 6 hours behind us. Only 2 days ago, Twilight and Applejack had determined that the winter silk apples had fully ripened. The apples had quickly gone into full harvesting mode, divesting the winter silk trees of their fruit and stowing them in the barrels that Twilight had equipped with stasis spells. The family had even started production on a few cider varieties, trying to find the best way to use the ample juice content of the winter silks. Unfortunately, it would be a couple of weeks at least before the first hard ciders made from winter silk juice were ready. Applejack, with Spike's help, projected that they would at least be finished with the harvest before the remainder of the day was out so that she, Red River, Apple Bloom, and Spike could catch the late evening train to Canterlot. Big Macintosh and Granny Smith would be staying behind, Granny Smith because she didn't feel up to traveling, while Macintosh wanted to celebrate the holiday with his fiancée and daughter-to-be. I hope they don't work themselves too hard, said Rarity, glancing in the general direction of Sweet Apple Acres. Don't worry, said Twilight, the winter silk orchard is still relatively small, especially compared to the rest of the farm. I suspect that they're already wrapping up the actual harvesting and are getting everything stowed right now. They just won't be in time to catch this train because they have to pack too. Rarity nodded and settled into her seat. What about Trixie? I thought she was coming with us. Actually, Trixie and Arcana went ahead on an earlier train, replied Twilight. Trixie said they would meet us at the palace tomorrow. The train let out a whistle and began to pull out of the station. Sweetie leaned out the window and waved enthusiastically to Rumble, who used his wings to follow along for a short distance until the train began to pull away from the Ponyville town limits. With a despondent sigh, Sweetie closed the window and sat back down on her seat. Dawn and Scootaloo shared a glance. The two of them climbed up on the seat, settling themselves on either side of Sweetie. Extending their wings, the Pegasi enfolded the unicorn in a double embrace as they leaned against her from either side. Drawing comfort from their presence, Sweetie gave them both a small smile before she allowed herself to lean against Scootaloo and enjoy the comfort of her friends. There, exclaimed Coco Pommel as she made the final adjustments to the Princess Platinum costume that Rarity would be wearing for the pageant finished. It looks very nice, observed Perlin Bluestreak from his position slightly behind Coco. I must admit that I am rather impressed that you managed the fine details without magic. Once again, Coco felt a shiver go down her spine as she was reminded of the young stallion's presence. She wished her employer was here. Lockstitch wasn't exactly engaging company. But, at least when she was present, then Perlin would make himself absent, as no pony was supposed to know where he was. Coco got the impression that Perlin might have been going against Baron Elderflower's orders by visiting her to begin with, though she couldn't fathom the reason why. At first, she had simply thought that he was keeping an eye on her. But it seemed that Perlin was doing it more for the sake of his curiosity than out of any obligation to his employer or any other cause. Well, said Coco nervously, a sewing machine helps, but it usually comes down to practice. Practice. Perlin raised an eyebrow at her. Well, of course, said Coco, I don't have unicorn magic, so I had to learn how to do all the stitches by hoof and tooth. There are only a couple of the most complicated ones that I don't have a handle on yet. To her own surprise, she felt a bit easier now that the conversation was clearly in her territory. She hadn't really noticed it before, but Perlin always seemed to steer things this way when he was with her. He asked about her work, asked about the things that interested her, but hardly offered anything from his own interests and experiences. Which is probably for the best, she thought queasily. She wasn't sure if she'd get anything done, and Perlin had insisted on reminding her just how deadly he was every time he came, much less how casually he approached the idea of killing. It shows, said Perlin, stepping past Coco, shifting just a couple of inches so that he didn't brush against her, something that Coco was grateful for, as it ensured that she wouldn't accidentally be cut by the blade like feathers of his wing. Then she realized that he was wearing his coat, which should have prevented such an accident, even if he had brushed against her. It almost seemed that he was giving Coco the extra space out of consideration for her. Is this his way of being polite? She wondered as she watched Perlin carefully examine the dress, looking genuinely fascinated by her work. It looks like something the ancient unicornian royalty would actually wear, said Perlin softly, seemingly lost in the design, though I don't think the pattern quite matches. Huh, Coco had to process that for a second. What are you talking about? The embroidery, said Perlin, inspecting a piece of the dress that flowed over the back. I saw the pattern used by the House of Platinum in a history book when I was young. Its use was discontinued when the last Princess Platinum relinquished her position and authority to the royal diarchy, along with the leadership of the other tribes. It was never actually used again out of deference for the work the House of Platinum had done to help build Equestria. I didn't know that, said Coco, leaning in to inspect her own work more closely. It wasn't her design, unfortunately. Lockstitch had been the one to design the pattern and had merely instructed her on how to produce it. It was actually part of Coco's ongoing training as she worked to finish her apprenticeship under the Canterlot seamstress, as the pattern had included several of the stitches Coco had been working to perfect. It had been the hardest part of the costume. That was one of the things that made Lockstitch so much better than Suri Polymer as a master in Coco's eyes. Suri had merely used Coco's apprenticeship as a source of free labor, while Lockstitch treated it like an actual learning experience, continuing to give Coco assignments that challenged her abilities and helped her to learn more of the aspects of her business. I saw the pattern in a history book when I was still learning, explained Perlin. I don't remember it exactly, but it was a fair bit different from this one. It's probably for the best. I'm guessing that an accurate reproduction of the pattern would be something of a faux pas. A history book. It was hard for Coco to imagine the idea of Perlin sitting behind a desk in school, listening as a teacher droned on in front of him. On some level, she must have known that the young stallion in front of her must have had some sort of education. He was far too well-spoken and insightful to be uneducated. My father had always favored history of all subjects, aside from combat. When it came to my education, said Perlin with a shrug, he always said it could be useful for gaining insight into my enemy's ways of thinking. Your father taught you? Asked Coco, tilting her head. Not directly, said Perlin, but I was homeschooled in nearly all basic subjects during the gaps in my training regiment. So you never went to school? Asked Coco, a bit curious, in spite of herself. Never, replied Perlin. After all, my father didn't want the public to know that he had sired a Pegasus. If he did sire me. Perlin tapped his chin thoughtfully for a moment. But he was adamant about raising me to be the instrument of his vengeance against Princess Celestia, so he didn't skimp on my education otherwise. Oh, said Coco, feeling a bit sympathetic in spite of herself. She couldn't help but feel sad at the idea of a young foal being locked inside his home with nothing but a spiteful tribalist father and a hoe full of instructors for company. I'm sorry. Don't be, said Perlin, smiling at her. I enjoyed my education, especially the combat training. Why you did, stammered Coco, a hint of her earlier queasiness returning. Yes, said Perlin with a nod as his expression turned wistful. It was like learning magic tricks. He paused to think his words over. Only, instead of learning how pull a bit out of a pony's ear, I learned to separate a pony from her head. Coco's knees nearly went out from under her, they were trembling so badly. Oh, she could barely manage to squeak. For a short time, she'd been able to forget how terrifyingly dangerous Perlin was and hold something resembling a normal conversation with him. But, in just a few seconds, a slight shift in the conversation served to undo all of that and remind Coco of just who she was dealing with. And yet there was something off about it in a way that strangely comforted Coco. Perlin spoke of killing with an eerie degree of casualness. Given how easily she had seen him cut down 2 score of trained guards mares in the crystal caverns below the city, that was understandable. However, it hadn't been anything more than casual. There was no sign of gleeful sadism, the idea that Perlin sincerely enjoyed killing, in his voice and words. It wasn't that he liked killing, but rather, that he liked fighting and that killing just happened to result from that. It was still a twisted and warped way of thinking, but perhaps not as bad as Coco had feared after the first time she'd met the young stallion. Then, there was the way he was behaving now, looking at her with a slightly guilty expression, seemingly signifying that Perlin was aware that he'd misstepped and that he genuinely regretted upsetting her. I think I'll go, said Perlin softly. I have a few errands to run before I call it a night. Perlin quickly walked past her toward the door, once again shifting to avoid brushing against her. When he was gone, a sense of quiet descended on the workroom, the emptiness Perlin left behind somehow just as disconcerting as his presence. Coco was more than slightly miffed by the fact that while she never felt quite completely at ease in his presence, she had actually started to get used to having him there. Thinking back to all the times she'd seen Perlin, she wondered if it was truly some sort of fascination with her work that prompted him to keep coming back. At first, he'd always had some kind of excuse, such as repairing the tears to his cloak that resulted, almost inevitably, from his work. Then, after a while, he'd simply show up without a word of explanation and settle in to watch her work quietly and never overly intrusively, aside from how intrusive the fact of his simple presence was. More importantly, he seemed to care what she thought of him, moderating his conversation to avoid things that made her uncomfortable, save for the occasional slip of his tongue, like this most recent one. Could he, she wondered, could he have a crush on me? The idea was almost as inconceivable as it was disconcerting. It certainly would explain a few things, such as his creepy behavior, essentially stalking her and watching her intently, even if it didn't make them any less disturbing. In some ways, Coco preferred the idea that Perlin found her an interesting oddity more, if only because that suggested that he might one day lose interest and stop watching her so often. No matter what, she wanted as little to do with Perlin Bluestreak as possible, because whenever she saw him, she would always be reminded of the first time she had truly met him, when he was standing amongst the carnage he had wrought. With a final shudder, Coco shook her head fiercely to clear the images of blood and bodies that hovered before her eyes. Author's notes. So yeah, Perlin's kinda pulling an Edward Cullen, I suppose. At least he's not watching Coco while she's asleep, or is he? As if he wasn't being creepy enough. Next chapter, brunch. Royal Welcome. Chapter 18, Royal Welcome. It was fairly early in the morning when the train pulled into the Canterlot station. Even though it was so early, the station was already bustling with ponies who had either recently arrived or ponies who were waiting to leave. Through the light crowd moved a pair of ponies who drew countless eyes, even as their presence and the presence of their entourage cleared a swath through the crowds between them and the train just pulling in from Ponyville. On the train, several ponies were in the process of gathering their belongings before disembarking. Sweetie Belle let out a groan as she tried to rub the sleep from her eyes. Darn it, Scootaloo, you aren't supposed to be a morning pony. That's Apple Bloom's thing. Scootaloo exchanged a look with Dawn, both of them looking completely bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in spite of the early hour. Then again, it was around the same time that they usually rose for their morning training. Looking back at Sweetie, Scootaloo could only shrug. Sorry, she said, you just kinda get used to it after a while. Speak for yourself, grumbled a cerulean pile with rainbow lining as it oozed down from its bunk onto the floor. After a few moments, the ooze finally stood up on 4 legs and began to bear some resemblance to Rainbow Dash. Her eyelids moved slowly as she blinked to try and clear her vision. I never get used to train travel, she said grumpily. Blinking, Scootaloo stared in surprise up at her idol. Huh, but we've gone by train before, she said. I've never seen you like this. It's because it's an early morning, said Fluttershy as she trotted up next to Rainbow, letting out a faint yawn after she spoke. She doesn't sleep well on the train, so she always takes a little longer to wake up than usual. That in the morning is evil, grumbled Rainbow, giving Fluttershy a sleepy glare, which only served to coax a giggle from her. Well, I for one can sympathize, said Rarity as she ran a brush through her mane. There is no exaggerating the importance of one getting one's beauty sleep. It's positively dreadful to have to wake up so early, to say nothing of the fact that the train's vibrations play absolute havoc with my mane. Rainbow glanced dully at Rarity and snorted. Your mane looks fine to me. And it would to you, dear, said Rarity, but that is because you haven't cultivated the fine eye for detail that I have. Why, I dare say that any pony in Canterlot would look at my mane as it is now and see a veritable rat's nest. I'm from Canterlot and, in my opinion, your mane is absolutely flawless, commented Arkenstone as he and Twilight Sparkle trotted up to join the larger group with their own luggage. Why thank you, Dar. Rarity froze for a second before giving the beige stallion a half-lidded glare. Very funny. Twilight couldn't quite hide her snigger of amusement behind her hoof. She was quickly joined by several other ponies in her quiet chortling. Come on now, said Twilight, levitating her own bags and heading for the door. It's time to get off. We've got a special welcoming party after all. They stepped off the train and gathered on the platform, waiting patiently as the porters worked frantically to unload Rarity's small mountain of luggage. In the meantime, Twilight's head turned sharply as she heard her name being shouted across the platform. Twilly. Spinning to face the source of the voice, Twilight grinned and let out a shout of her own. Shiny. The two of them rushed towards each other and met with an enthusiastic embrace. Welcome back, sis, said Shining as the two of them stepped away from each other. It's good to be back, said Twilight before turning to address the pink alicorn walking up next to Shining Armor. Hi, Cadance. Leaning down, Cadance nuzzled Twilight fondly. After stepping back, they grinned playfully at each other before going into their regular greeting. Sunshine, sunshine, Ladybug's awake, clap your hooves and do a little shake. Fluttershy and the others couldn't help but giggle at Twilight and Cadance's sunshine dance. However, she noted a lack of noise from her son. Glancing down, Fluttershy saw Dawn staring, wide-eyed at Twilight and Cadance. What's the matter? She asked. It's Dawn blinked and seemed to be struggling for the right words. Cute. Fluttershy couldn't help but titter at Dawn's statement. Scootaloo, on the other hoof, rolled over laughing. It is your first time seeing their sunshine dance, isn't it? Commented Fluttershy. Mine too, said Caramel, almost seeming spellbound by the sight until Fluttershy smacked him across the back of the head with her wing. Rubbing the back of his head, Caramel grinned sheepishly at Fluttershy as she gave him a deadpan look. I wonder what Twilight's cold friend thinks about you looking at her flank like that. Gulping, Caramel broke into a nervous sweat as he turned his head to look at Arkenstone, who was standing completely impassively. One ear swiveled in Caramel's direction before swiveling back. At least one of us should get to appreciate the sight. Fluttershy sighed in frustration before rolling her eyes. Stallions, she muttered. Well, it is kinda Twilight and Cadance's fault, Rainbow Dash pointed out bluntly, shaking their flanks in the middle of a public station. For a show like that, Shining Armor should be charging stallions for admission. Some mares as well, observed Rarity, casting her own gaze about the platform, noticing several ponies watching Twilight and Cadance with varying degrees of fascination. Twilight and Cadance, suddenly very aware of their audience, pulled away from each other blushing sheepishly. Anyway, said Cadance sharply, we've come to escort you to the royal palace. As she spoke, a small group of 6 royal guards stepped up from either side. Princess Celestia and Princess Luna have invited you and your friends to join them for brunch. We gladly accept, said Twilight, the excitement of being able to see her mentor again wiping away the last vestiges of embarrassment. The group set off for the palace, 4 of the 6 guards falling in on either side, while the remaining 2 unicorns both divided Rarity's pile of luggage in 2 and hauled it into the air with their magic. As they made their way out of the station, Don swept his gaze across the platform. Not so long ago, he had been here before, under much different circumstances. It was odd that the territory felt so familiar to him. As he looked, he spotted several ponies whispering to one another. The vast majority of them were unicorns and more than a few were dressed in expensive clothes and jewelry. These then, must have been some of the Canterlot upper class he had heard Twilight and the others talking and worrying about. Closing his eyes, Don relaxed and allowed his awareness to spread out through the air around him. This time, instead of merely focusing upon the shapes and movements of ponies, he instead focused on the vibrations of sound in the air around him, allowing him to listen in on a few of the conversations within his range. Can you believe her? Such unsightly behavior, and in front of a princess of all things. But Princess Cadance actually joined her in that unbecoming behavior. It's disgraceful. Is this what the royal family has come to? Princess Celestia must be so ashamed. Look, over there, that's him. Who? The colt from the news article, Dawn Light something or other. You mean that black colt there? Yes, him. Don frowned and resisted the urge to look towards the course of the conversation to see just who was talking about him. Instead, he continued to eavesdrop quietly. Can you see his eyes? They're unnatural. Dame Fluttershy must truly be kindness incarnate if she is able to care for such a monstrosity. Didn't the article say something about his parents abandoning him? I can see why. Who in their right mind would want a deformed freak like that for a child? Indeed, it would be a disgrace to even admit that one had birthed such a foal. It would have been much more merciful to smother the creature at birth. Don abandoned listening to the conversation. He had heard enough. Don, the colt looked over to see Scootaloo watching him concernedly. Are you okay? I'm fine, said Don, it's nothing important. From his other side, he sensed Arkenstone leaning down to whisper into his ear. Pay them no mind. There is nothing worthwhile in listening to the words of those who take such pride in their own pettiness. Don subtly nodded back to Arkenstone as the group left the station and made their way towards the royal palace. Shining and Cadance led the group towards the royal dining room, while the palace servants took custody of every pony's bags and belongings. Celestia and Luna were already waiting for them in the dining room, presiding over a table that had been set with a variety of breakfast dishes, even a few that had clearly been made to cater to Don's personal tastes. There was a selection of fruit and vegetables, bubbling pots of porridge, fresh baked oatcakes, complete with butter and jam for sides. Then, there were waiters to take orders for pancakes, crepes, and waffles to be made fresh at any pony's request. Everyone took their seats as Celestia smiled happily at them. Good morning. It's wonderful to have you all here again. Celestia looked around, her eyes resting on Melon Cream, Mayweather, and Caramel specifically. I am also pleased to see some new ponies that I have not yet met. Caramel and Melon bowed politely to Celestia and Luna. Mayweather bowed as well, but kept her gaze averted, a mild expression of shame on her face that only faded as Pinkie Pie leaned over and gently nuzzled her cheek. Either Celestia didn't notice it, or chose not to mention it as she turned her attention back to every pony else. I look forward to seeing another wonderful performance at this year's pageant. We're looking forward to it as well, said Twilight as she pulled up a sheaf of notes. I've made some modifications to the script to try and make it more informative. Wait a second. Rainbow Dash whipped a hoof out and stole the papers from Twilight, zipping back across the table before Twilight could even make a noise of protest. Twilight, your modification is having Clover the Clever give a half-hour lecture on thaumatic reso. Intertribal thaumatic resonance is evidenced by the fire of friendship, said Twilight in a surly tone. Give it back. Rainbow looked up from Twilight's copy of the rewritten script and glowered at her friend. Twilight, you're gonna put the audience to sleep if you try to make them sit through this. Hey, they might even chase you off the stage. May I? At Celestia's request, Rainbow nodded and held up the papers, which were picked up by Celestia's magic and levitated over the table to the elder princess, who began to review Twilight's notes. After taking a short time to peruse the notes, Celestia looked up at Twilight. While I understand your desire to make sure ponies learn their history, I'm afraid that I have to agree with Rainbow that this is a little much for a heartwarming pageant. Twilight let out a sigh of defeat. I'm sorry, it's just given all the trouble we've had with tribalists this year, I thought this would be an ideal time to reinforce the critical lessons of love and harmony that led to Equestria's founding in the first place. Celestia sighed. I can understand your sentiments, Twilight. I would also like to reinforce those ideals. However, your modifications to the script might even prove counterproductive. How so? Asked Twilight. Well, said Shining Armor, piping up from next to his younger sister, you are suggesting having Clover the Clever, the unicorn, explain everything to all the non-unicorns. To a tribalist audience, that could easily be construed as the well-educated unicorn having to explain everything to the lesser tribes because they're too thick to understand otherwise. Twilight gaped at Shining. How could they possibly take things that way? This time it was Cadance who answered. Because they're tribalists. They will always twist things to suit their viewpoint if they can. If you look at from a certain perspective, the Canterlot pageant is already fairly unicorn-centric. Cadance's remark drew gasps from the rest of her audience, save for Celestia and Luna, who had clearly thought about this before. What do you mean? Asked Fluttershy. I never really though the pageant was all too unicorn-centered. Well, in the script, Clover the Clever seems to have a lot of the answers, explained Cadance. She's the one who knows what the Wendigos are and she's ultimately the one who produces the fire of friendship that drives them off. In the whole scheme of things, it comes down as pretty minor, but it's enough for the tribalists. I know what you mean, said Rainbow Dash, looking up from the melon salad she had been working her way through. I remember how we were forced to sit through the pageant every year in Cloudsdale. It's way different from the Canterlot pageant. How so? Asked Rarity. Oddly enough, it was the first time that Rainbow had spoken so openly about the cultural differences of Cloudsdale, particularly her old flight school. Well, to begin with, it really comes down heavily in the favor of the Pegasi, explained Rainbow. For starters, Private Pansy was always renamed Private Panzer. Historically speaking, that may have been her actual name, observed Twilight. For a militaristic society, like pre-unification Pegasi, it's highly unlikely that they would have picked out a name like Pansy for one of their own. Rainbow shrugged. I dunno, she admitted, but it's always been Pansy everywhere else I've been. Me too, added Fluttershy. Anyway, continued Rainbow, they made a bunch of changes to the script in order to make the Pegasi look more heroic. During the first act, the Pegasi are actively fighting the blizzard while the Earth ponies are cowering and the unicorns are complaining. Then, in the second act, it's Commander Hurricane and Private Panzer who lead the rest of the group up to the cave and try to keep fighting off the Wendigos. The other two leaders are Frozen, and Hurricane is the one who basically convinces the advisors from the other two tribes to lend their strength to the Pegasi to drive the Wendigos off. That is certainly a different take on things, mused Melon Cream from where she sat with Scootaloo. She'd heard Rainbow talk about this before, but was surprised at the details. I wonder if the Earth Pony tribalists have a similar view, mused Twilight as she looked over at Pinkie Pie. I couldn't tell you, added Pinkie with a shrug. Such renditions do exist, said Arkenstone, but Earth Pony tribalists tend to dwell in outlying rural communities that have yet to see much development. Since they are in a poor position to put on an organized front, it's extremely rare for their pageants to draw an audience from any pony, save their own neighbors. Every pony fell into a pensive silence as they thought over the conversation. Some pony knocked at the door to the dining room. Celestia sat up sharply, breaking out into a smile. Oh, I almost forgot, we have some pony else joining us. The doors opened and Twilight was not surprised in the slightest to see Arcana and Trixie walk through. I figured you two were already here, said Twilight. I thought you'd be at the dining room before us. Well, we're staying at the townhouse, replied Arcana. I keep misjudging how much time that commute takes. You know, I would be only too happy to put the two of you up here in the palace, Celestia offered, that way you don't have to walk up here every day. I am afraid we must decline, said Arcana as he and Trixie took their own seats at the table. We are here for the winter gala. We will also join in the audience for the pageant, but we won't be able to contribute anything to the pageant itself. But I am sure that Trixie's magic would be of great use in aiding the presentation, said Luna. If I recall, her specialty is illusions and glamours. Surely this is an appropriate venue for them. I'm sorry, Your Highness, but I can't, said Trixie in an uncharacteristically quiet voice, because I have become a student of the still way. I have foregone my magic for the time being. I do not know when I might have use of it again. Luna's eyelid twitched. Oh yes, that art. Why any pony would still aspire to master it is beyond me. Luna, admonished Celestia, throwing a reproving glance at her sister. Is something wrong with the still way? Asked Twilight, looking between Trixie and Luna. Turning your back on everything you have accomplished since you first learned how to light your horn, what isn't wrong with it? Scoffed Luna in an irritable tone. That's enough, Luna, said Celestia firmly, earning an angry huff from her younger sister as Luna turned to scowl to one side. Celestia turned her attention back to a shaken Trixie, who looked about ready to cry. Forgive my sister's outburst. This is something of a sore subject for her. I see, said Trixie in a nervous tone. I'm sorry. I meant no offense. There is none, save for what Luna manufactured for herself, said Celestia, throwing another stern glance in Luna's direction. Trixie nodded and fumbled with her hooves to serve herself an oatcake and then spread some jam on top of it. Beside her, Arcana helped himself to all manner of dainty bites but offered not 1 ounce of help to his younger sister, nor did Trixie ask for any. Twilight and the others watched the siblings carefully. Twilight wanted to offer her own help to Trixie, but got the distinct impression that her help would be viewed more as interference than assistance. Said Rainbow, deciding to shift the subject away from Trixie. What's the plan? Well, said Celestia, it's not too difficult. The plan is mostly the same as last time. After breakfast, you'll be shown to your room so that you can get settled. You'll have the rest of the morning to do as you wish. After lunch will be the first rehearsals. Tomorrow, the tailor we commissioned will arrive to take the final measurements for your costumes. After that will be the dress rehearsals. If I might ask, just who is this year's costume designer? Asked Rarity. It's Lockstitch, replied Celestia. She was recommended by Fancy Pants. From what I hear, she has been using this project to help educate her current apprentice. Oh my, said Rarity, I've heard of Miss Lockstitch. She has an excellent reputation. What gives? Said Rainbow. Why isn't Rarity doing the costumes this year? Rainbow dash, snapped Rarity, rounding to glare at her friend. It is unbecoming to protest the princess's decisions in such a manner. Besides, regardless of the situation, I wouldn't be chosen this year. Celestia nodded, apparently having not taken any offense at Rainbow's outburst. Indeed, though I would like to make use of Rarity's skills every year, I'm afraid that we can't show too much favoritism to a single artisan. It would serve to stifle others who are trying to make their way in the same business and deny them the chance to showcase their own work and improve upon it. In this case, Lockstitch is using this opportunity to train an apprentice, which only serves as all the more reason we would give this commission to her. Indeed, said Rarity, nodding in agreement. She looked back at Celestia. Will her apprentice be coming? I would very much like to meet her if Miss Lockstitch feels that she is good enough to be given such an important responsibility. I believe so, said Celestia. After all, fitting is just as critical a part of the process as anything else. I have no reason to believe that Lockstitch would leave her apprentice out of it. I look forward to meeting them, said Rarity with an eager smile. The group turned back to finishing their meal before they were taken to their rooms. Trixie gently scuffed a hoof against the polished marble floor. Before her stood a pair of large doors, emblazoned with the sun symbol of Celestia's cutie mark, the entrance to the Sun Princess's private quarters. It was nerve-wracking to stand before these doors by herself. The 2 royal guards on either side stared forward stoically, giving no indication that they knew that Trixie was even there. Trixie had been stunned to receive a summons to Celestia's chambers. The rest of the group, with the exception of herself and Arcana, were being taken to get settled in their quarters in the palace. Trixie had been about to follow them when a servant whispered the summons into her ear. It was a summons for her, not for her and Arcana, not for her and anyone else but for her alone. Trixie had nervously excused herself and followed the servant through the labyrinthine hallways of the royal palace all the way to the doors to Celestia's room, where the servant had left her. Nervously, Trixie glanced between the 2 guards, wondering if they wanted her to wait until they announced her. However, they gave no indication that they were going to do so. Mustering her courage, Trixie took 2 steps forward and raised a hoof to knock at the door. The doors opened almost automatically, prompting Trixie to take a step back. Come in, called Celestia's voice in a kind and gentle tone from within. Swallowing hard, Trixie stepped forward and made her way into the room. In most ways, it appeared to be a room befitting one with the status of a princess. However, in other ways, it almost looked too normal. It was, in fact, an entire suite. Trixie could see one doorway leading off to a bedroom, while another one apparently opened into a marble bathroom. One wall was dominated by a massive window that looked out over Canterlot and the realm of Equestria beyond that. Near the window is a desk, its surface occupied by several small, neat stacks of papers, presumably documents that were awaiting Celestia's attention or that she had already dealt with. Ironically, given the amount of work that must have gone into governing the nation, Trixie was half expecting to see stacks of paper reaching towards the ceiling. One of the wonderful privileges of being royalty is the ability to delegate tasks to others. Trixie whirled about to face another section of the room, this one directly across from the doors to the bath and bedroom. The wall of this room was partially occupied by a large fireplace, in which a roaring blaze was crackling merrily, sending waves of warmth rolling across the rest of the room. In front of the fireplace was arrayed a fair-sized pile of cushions, upon one of which Celestia was reclined, sipping something steaming out of a mug that hovered in front of her. There was a second, unattended mug, also with steam rising out of it, situated in front of a cushion next to Celestia. With an indulgent smile, Celestia regarded Trixie and then bobbed her head in the direction of the cushion. Please, make yourself comfortable, Trixie. This isn't anything too serious. I also took the liberty of having some cocoa made for you as well. Thank you, Your Highness. Trixie did as she was bid and laid out on the cushion next to Celestia. She noted that the insulated mug in front of her had a handle large enough for her to curl her fetlock around it and lift it up. It was a pleasant surprise that Celestia had been so considerate of her current inability to use magic. Trixie sipped at the cocoa, taking a moment to wallow in the luxurious taste, the mingled sweetness and bitterness of chocolate and sugar punctuated by the heat of chili peppers mixed with faint notes of cinnamon and allspice. It's wonderful. Indeed, it's a blend that my chefs and I have been working to perfect for many years, said Celestia. I may enjoy tea and it may practically be our national beverage, but one gets tired of the same thing all the time. It hardly seems the same when Arkenstone makes it, commented Trixie, thinking back to the blends she had gotten to sample from Arkenstone's tea house. Indeed, agreed Celestia, it's sad that Twilight got to him first, or I would probably have tried to make him switch professions from knight to royal tea master. She giggled. Perhaps that would be selfish of me, but I do believe I have earned the right to at least fantasize about such things. Trixie nodded. She took another sip of cocoa and looked past Princess Celestia to the wall, dominated by shelf loaded down with countless books. Princess, may I ask why you called me here? Of course, said Celestia, I want to apologize completely for Luna's behavior at brunch today. You don't have to, protested Trixie. I mean, I take no offense at what Luna said. Even so, I feel the need to, said Celestia, her tone becoming more serious as she stared at the fireplace in front of them. Almost unconsciously, Celestia extended a wing and rested it across Trixie's back, a gesture that made Trixie stiffen at the unexpected and intimate contact. But Trixie relaxed as Celestia smiled down at her. Celestia continued, I feel that I must apologize because I fully understand that this is a decision that you did not make lightly. Is it really that upsetting? Asked Trixie. In a sense, said Celestia, but mostly it comes down to jealousy. With the centuries that we've had at our disposal, both Luna and I have dabbled in many of the pony martial arts. I would not consider myself a master of any of them, Luna neither. Our duties have precluded any serious attempts at studying them, even with the lifespans of alicorns at our disposal. However, the still way is the one martial art that is truly beyond our capacity to learn, at least, if we want to remain who and where we are. I'm afraid I don't follow, said Trixie. Think about it, said Celestia, in order to learn the still way, you must turn your back on all the magic that you have learned since the beginning. For me and my sister, that is impossible. Because of the sun and moon. Gasped Trixie, making the connection, if you gave up your magic as it is now, you wouldn't be able to fulfill your duties to raise and lower the celestial bodies. Celestia nodded. Exactly. When we first took over control of the sun and moon, we could not afford to turn away from that and place their control back in the horns of the unicorn aristocracy. Those fools would have been entirely too quick to use their renewed control as a play for power. In this day and age, organizing a sufficiently powerful group of unicorns to take over for us would be a difficult task and not one we can simply do because we want to take some time off to learn a new skill, even if acquiring the still way was so easy. But the still way is all or nothing. Either you learn it and master it, or you don't. There is no dabbling in that art. I'm not entirely certain that Luna and I would be able to resume our old positions if we mastered the still way. Our magic might no longer be compatible with moving the heavens. But isn't that what your magic is all about? Asked Trixie, twisting her head to sneak a look at Celestia's son Cutie Mark before realizing that she was contorting herself to stare at the princess's flank and returning to facing forward while blushing fiercely, something Celestia did not miss. Celestia chortled and tightened the hold of her wing over Trixie. Oh, I'm afraid not. My sister and I are able to move the sun and moon on our own with our power, but that is not what lies at the center of our magic. When I first started, my magic was barely more than an average unicorn's. In fact, I struggled with several basic spells that you probably mastered with ease. When I was born, taking control of the sun was the furthest thing from my mind, even when my Cutie Mark appeared. How could that be? Asked Trixie. Because my Cutie Mark doesn't actually represent my control over the sun, said Celestia. Trixie gasped and her jaw hit the floor. What? Celestia couldn't help but laugh at Trixie's bamboozlement. I don't think even Twilight realizes this. When you've spent millennia raising the sun and your Cutie Mark is the sun, ponies seem to simply put the two together. Then, what does your Cutie Mark mean? Asked Trixie. Celestia sighed wistfully, as though recalling a fond memory. In my youth, what I truly loved to do was bring light and laughter into the lives of other ponies. My passion was cheering others up when they were feeling down and bringing smiles to their faces. Mused Trixie, that actually sounds familiar. It should, said Celestia, of all Twilight's friends, I've always felt the strongest kinship with Pinkie Pie. She grinned at Trixie. In actuality, things don't seem to have changed all that much by me taking over the sun, as I now bring light into ponies' lives literally, as well as figuratively. What does Princess Luna's mark represent then? Asked Trixie, fascinated by this side of royalty that she'd never known before. Luna was an artist, said Celestia, she loved painting. For her, it might have been even easier to adjust to her new duties, as now she has the entire sky for her canvas every night. That our Cutie Marks ended up so closely matching what we literally do now is probably what ponies would call destiny. It truly is remarkable. In any case, we put a great deal of time and effort into mastering the spells necessary to raise, move, and lower the sun and moon. Luna spent even more time learning how to place the stars in the sky and an even greater time working out the best placements for them so that ponies could use the stars to find their way. That is why Luna has been especially attached to the magic she has learned. For her, the idea of giving all that up is anathema. I see, said Trixie. Celestia smiled and gently nuzzled the top of Trixie's head. It is hard for Luna to identify with that kind of commitment and sacrifice. We have lost countless precious things to the ravages of time thanks to our extended lifespans. That is why we cling to the things that time can't claim from us all the harder. However, you have even less time, but you show tremendous commitment by willingly giving up your magic. May I see it? Trixie nodded and raised a hoof to her head, brushing away the mane around the base of her horn, showing a thin black stripe right where the alicorn met her skull. As I thought, said Celestia, I pray for your success, Trixie, and look forward to seeing your growth when you do succeed. Thank you very much, Your Highness. Geez, this place is huge, exclaimed Scootaloo as she bounded ahead of the others, her eyes and head swiveling back and forth to take in the entire hallway. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever. It was just one of the many passageways that led throughout the massive complex. Where this particular hallway led was any pony's guess. Behind Scootaloo, Dawn, Melon Cream, Fluttershy, and Caramel followed at a more sedate pace, pausing to take in the sight of the various pieces of artwork that hung on the walls or rested on pedestals between the columns. The royal palace was home to a veritable treasure trove of art that rivaled that of any art museum in Equestria. In fact, sections of the royal palace were, in essence, treated like an art museum, home to galleries containing all kinds of exhibits of various ponies' creative works which were switched out from time to time and shared with other such facilities all across the country. Dawn examined everything with a quiet fascination. Though he had been to the royal palace once before, the circumstances of that visit had not left him with much opportunity to play tourist. So, now that he had the opportunity, he decided to take in as much as he could. In fact, Dawn was so enthralled with looking around that he almost failed to notice that Scootaloo had come to an abrupt halt in front of him and, consequently, nearly ran face first into her rump. Scootaloo, Dawn pulled back to try and see why the filly had stopped peering around to look at her face. Scootaloo was frozen, her jaw open slightly and eyes wide in an expression of astonishment. Following the path of her eyes led Dawn's own gaze straight down the hallway, where he saw exactly why she had frozen in place. Partway down the hall stood a very familiar, monotoned gray mare, staring at them with an expression that almost perfectly mirrored Scootaloo's, albeit with a bit more fear and nervousness. Dawn felt that the tension of Shadesteel's presence was abated somewhat by the maid's uniform she wore. Around her neck was some sort of collar, fastened with a clasp decorated by the sun symbol of Princess Celestia's Cutie Mark. You, snarled Scootaloo, her expression hardening into one of anger. What the hey are you doing here? Why aren't you rotting in the dungeon? Shadesteel didn't respond. In fact, her expression hadn't changed in the slightest. Dawn could tell that she was torn between staying and running, edging towards running. It was clear that Shade didn't want any kind of confrontation. Scootaloo growled and bared her teeth at Shade's lack of response, pawing the floor aggressively, as though she was going to throw herself at the former guardsmare. Scootaloo. Melon Cream's voice cracked like a whip, stopping Scootaloo cold as she turned to look in confusion at her mother. Melon stared sternly down at her daughter. That's quite enough, she said. If she is out and about, then it is undoubtedly at the princess's discretion. If you feel that you have to know, then you can ask them. I will not allow you to harass this mare. But she. Scootaloo whirled to glare at Shade, who was slowly edging away. Dawn, you're with me, right? She almost killed you. Dawn didn't respond. He was watching Shade carefully, studying her like an interesting puzzle. He too was curious about why she was here. However, he somehow doubted that this was the time or place for a confrontation. Shade had made no aggressive moves and had made no attempt to attack. At this point, all it seemed that she cared about was getting away from them. Given the fact that she hadn't simply bolted, Dawn assumed she hadn't escaped confinement to wander about in disguise. Through the air around him, he could also feel a faint, almost imperceptible buzz as his awareness brushed against the collar around her neck. It's probably some sort of magical restraint, he thought. Dawn, asked Scootaloo, staring in confusion at the colt. He'd almost bled out thanks to the wounds Shade had given him, but he didn't seem to bear her any ill will. At most, he seemed ambivalent to her presence. Finally, Dawn closed his eyes and opened them again, turning to meet Scootaloo's gaze. I think we should leave her be for now, he said, making Scootaloo's jaw drop again. I too am curious, but we should pose the question to the princesses. With a sigh, Scootaloo relaxed. Okay, fine. Dawn gave Shade the smallest of nods, which appeared to be all the prompting that she needed, as she rushed down the hallway, clearly eager to be away from them. She vanished around a corner, leaving the echoing sound of her receding hoofsteps behind. Well, said Dawn after a moment that was unexpected. What do we do now? Asked Scootaloo. We can ask the princesses about it, suggested Fluttershy softly. Since we're meeting them for lunch, why don't we ask then? Fine, groaned Scootaloo. I guess we should keep exploring then. That sounds like a plan, said Caramel. We still have a little bit until lunch. The group continued on, but Scootaloo's noticeable lack of enthusiasm seemed to suck much of the enjoyment out of the activity. It was clear that Shade's presence was weighing heavily on her mind. Shade rushed in the direction of her next job as quickly as her hooves would carry her. Part of her was appalled by the gratitude she felt towards Dawn for dismissing her without any contest, even though his filly friend looked about ready to tear her limb from limb. She couldn't believe that she was feeling even the slightest bit thankful towards Dawn Lightwing, even though her rational mind continued to tell her that this whole affair was her fault. She was the one who had opted to kidnap Dinky Doo. She was the one who had nearly killed Dinky when Dawn had cut her free. She was the one who had nearly killed Dawn. Even now, the slight parting of his mane, right at his forehead, remained as evidence of the wound she'd dealt him there. She was certain that there was probably still a faint mark on his foreleg where her throwing knife had pierced right through it. She was amazed at his complete lack of animosity, though he had regarded her carefully, clearly uncertain as to whether or not she would attack him again. In the end, Princess Celestia's punishment for Shadesteel was brilliant as it was ruthless. Shade had been assigned to the palace staff as a servant, a maid attached directly to Princess Luna. She was responsible for cleaning Luna's quarters, seeing to her needs, drawing her baths, fetching her items, anything that Luna wanted, Shade would have to do for her. But that was the extent of it. Shade would work the same hours as the rest of the staff, carry out the same duties, and even dwell in the servants' quarters with the rest of them. She even had her own room, which was comfortably, if sparsely furnished. Even when Celestia had explained Shade's punishment, Shade had been half expecting to be forced to return to the dungeon at the end of each day. That she had been given so much freedom was a shock. The only indicator that she was still on any kind of probation was the collar around her neck, which would shock her unconscious if she tried to leave the palace grounds or if she aggressively attacked some pony. It also blocked her Pegasus magic, meaning she couldn't even fly. In exchange, she would have to spend her time serving the pony she had once despised, the one she had once believed to be a source of evil and darkness. She would spend each day and night being reminded of just how painfully wrong she had been and just how far she had fallen. It was mortifying. It was mortifying, and Shade couldn't help but feel that she had earned every minute of it. The polished marble floor must have been mopped recently at one point because, as Shade turned another corner, she completely lost traction, her legs going out from under her. Her wings flapped frantically as she fought to keep from falling, but her restrained magic kept them from being of much use. The wall was fast approaching as Shade slid towards it, having fallen on her side. She closed her eyes and braced for the impact, only to feel nothing as a pair of forelegs wrapped around her barrel. The sound of beating wings reached Shade's ears as she was lifted off the floor before she could hit the wall. Opening her eyes, Shade was shocked to see a pair of pink arms encircling her as the other pony carried her across the wet floor and set her back down on a dry section. Well now, that was close, commented her rescuer, clearly an older mare, as she landed in front of Shade, giving her a clear view of the pink mare and her blue mane. You need to be more careful about running around the palace, dear. You're lucky you didn't hurt yourself. Why yes, said Shade, bobbing her head, thank you very much for helping me. I'm sorry, but I need to go. She was already off as the pink mare watched her go. As Shade vanished down another hallway, a glimmer of amusement passed through the other mare's eyes. Author's notes. For the record, I am in complete agreement with Rainbow Dash. Cora said it best. Keep in mind that I haven't read the comics, which I think present a backstory for the princesses and their cutie marks. I decided to go with this explanation for their cutie marks because it ties in with my idea of cutie marks representing a pony's passion and what they choose to personally invest themselves in, rather than basic talent. Given the evidence we see in the series, Celestia is very much a fun-loving pony at heart with a love of laughter and a solid, yet subtle, mischievous streak. So it's easy for me to envision her as a slightly older, wiser, and more toned-down Pinkie Pie to a certain extent. Luna's own cutie mark was perhaps a more direct but still abstract overall interpretation. For some people, Shade's punishment may seem kinda light, but I felt it was appropriate, especially if the one being punished genuinely regrets what they did. For them, accepting punishment is kind of an easy way out because the feeling that one has paid for their crimes tends to produce a sensation of relief. Rather, it's my opinion that leaving a remorseful person to stew in their own guilt and be forced to constantly confront their bad decisions without affording them some way to make up or compensate for their crimes is a much harsher form of punishment on an emotional level. Next chapter, Sweetie Belle gets a special lesson. Poetry and Pageantry. Chapter 19, Poetry and Pageantry. By the time lunch rolled around, the train carrying Applejack, Apple Bloom, Red River, and Spike had arrived, the winter silk harvest having been successfully concluded. The four of them were all too happy to join every pony else for lunch. However, they, like every pony else, were shocked by the news that Scootaloo brought, namely that Shadesteal was wandering the palace hallways as a maid. Twilight was first to realize the reasoning behind Celestia's decision. You made her Princess Luna's maid, didn't you? Celestia nodded. Both my sister and I thought that the most suitable punishment for a pony like Shadesteal was to remind her regularly just how badly askew her convictions were. For the next several months, she will spend a substantial portion of every day around Luna and be forced to see for herself the lies of the cult solar that she so readily accepted. Are ya sure it's safe? Asked Applejack. She ain't gonna try nothing. Celestia explained the nature of Shadesteal's restraint collar, how it inhibited her Pegasus magic and would also subdue her at the first sign of hostility. Well, if you're sure it's safe, said Fluttershy demurely as she turned back to her salad. Don raised a hoof. At Celestia's nod, he posed his question. You say the collar will subdue Shadesteal, but suppose she is attacked by some pony who holds her previous allegiance against her. His eyes flickered in the direction of Scootaloo, who had the sense to look abashed. Does the collar make allowances for self-defense? Celestia was taken aback as much by the fact that Don was the one asking the question as by the question itself. After what Shade had done to him, she was amazed that Don would show so much concern for her well-being. It may very well be Fluttershy's influence, she thought. She certainly couldn't complain if the virtues of the element of kindness were among the things that Fluttershy was instilling into her son. To be honest, admitted Celestia, we were worried about that. However, both Luna and I have the fullest trust in our guards and their ability to remain true to their duties. The only other ponies who might pose a threat are the other servants, who have been instructed in the strictest of terms to not lay a single hoof upon Shadesteal. Luna nodded her agreement. Interfering with the lawful punishment of another pony is a serious offense, which is what any pony who tried to harm Shadesteal would be doing. We have no reason to be concerned about the masses, as Shadesteal is not permitted to leave the palace and the nobles are far too self-absorbed to even notice her. She shall be safe. Why are you so worried about her anyway? Asked Scootaloo, irritably giving voice to the question that was on every pony's mind. Don shrugged. While I am upset about what she did to Dinky, our fight is over and I had no desire to watch her suffer. Celestia couldn't hide her faint giggle at Don's response. He certainly is Fluttershy's son. After lunch, the rehearsals for the pageant began in earnest. While that occupied the attentions of Twilight and the other 5 element bearers, most of the rest of the company found themselves at liberty once again. Spike was once again serving as narrator for the pageant. Surprisingly, Apple Bloom was asked to contribute to the construction of the stage and the scenery for it. Scootaloo, Don, and Sweetie Belle once again set out to explore more of the palace with Caramel and Melon Cream in tow. Red River and Mayweather had stayed behind to help with the rehearsal and had ended up being recruited as extras. In spite of the fact that they'd been exploring all morning, there was no shortage of new things for the group to see as they wandered from room to room, discovering galleries of magnificent paintings seemingly around every corner. At other times, they came face to face with massive windows that opened up to spectacular vistas of the surrounding countryside. Granted, they also occasionally stumbled into rooms used by the nation's administrators, austere offices occupied by desks stacked with paperwork, often with ponies working quietly and efficiently behind them, ponies who didn't take well to being disturbed at their jobs, especially at this time of year, eager as they were to get home and enjoy the upcoming holiday with their own families. And no thank you, we would very much prefer it if you didn't make it so that we'd have to stay any longer than we already need to, thank you very much. The approach of hearts warming did not mean that the arduous task of overseeing the governing of Equestria came to a halt. Fortunately, Sweetie Belle, the only remaining member of the original Cutie Mark Crusader trio who had yet to get her Cutie Mark, was the only member of the group who might have been interested in trying to be a Cutie Mark bureaucrat, yay. However, as dull and uninteresting as the work looked, it certainly didn't appeal to Sweetie Belle the way some other Cutie Mark Crusader activities did. The bold explorers quickly left the struggling office workers to their tasks and made their way to other sections of the palace. While traversing a hallway in one of the upper levels, Sweetie Belle came to a halt as her ears began to twitch. What's up? Asked Scootaloo, as she and Don stopped to look at Sweetie. I hear something, said Sweetie, her ears standing up so straight they seemed to be straining towards the ceiling. Huh. Scootaloo closed her eyes and did her best to listen. Don did the same. A few seconds later, they managed to pick up the faint strains of something drifting down the hallway. I think it's music, said Sweetie, leaning in the direction of the sound. Maybe it's the musicians who will be playing the music for the pageant, suggested Melon. They probably have rehearsals of their own. Sweetie frowned and hummed for a moment as she continued to listen to the faint melody drifting down the hallway. It only sounds like one pony though, she said. It sounds deep. Don and Scootaloo shared a glance. They could barely even hear the music being played, but had been unable to grasp any particular about it. Sweetie Belle, wait, called Melon after Sweetie, who was already bounding off in the direction the song was originating from. Don and Scootaloo gave chase, with the adults not far behind. I really hope we don't end up causing trouble for whoever's doing this, mused Caramel as he and Melon did their level best to keep up with the foals. Sweetie led the group along the hallway, the music gradually growing clearer with each step they took. Ultimately, they came to a halt outside a single small door, just one of many that lined the hall that might have led to another office or even a closet. Only the clear strains of a stringed instrument indicated that something else would be behind the door. Cautiously, Sweetie reached out with her magic to turn the handle. Wait, said Don softly, we don't want to disturb whoever is playing. But for reasons Sweetie couldn't explain, her curiosity had been thoroughly aroused by the beautiful sequence of notes. It's okay, said Scootaloo from Sweetie's other side, let's wait until whoever's playing finishes the song. Then we can go in. Sweetie stared at Scootaloo, a bit galled at the idea that the most impatient and hyperactive member of the original Crusaders was the one suggesting waiting. Scootaloo merely met her gaze with a shrug. It's what I do when Don's practicing lightning. It'll probably work here too. Don nodded his agreement. Together, the three of them settled their haunches onto the cold marble of the hallway floor and settled in to wait just as Caramel and Melon caught up to them. The two adults shared a confused glance before looking again at the three foals sitting on the floor, listening attentively to flowing deep notes of the instrument being played on the other side. Listening, it was apparent that the instrument was probably a cello or something similar. That's lovely, whispered Melon. She wasn't much of an aficionado, but the player on the other side of the door was clearly an expert at their craft, the kind of pony with the skill to make it apparent to even the most neophyte listeners that she knew what she was doing better than most. Caramel nodded his agreement. He had a few cello suites amongst his own musical collection. It was a wonderful instrument to listen to, even by itself. It wasn't his favorite, he favored the harpsichord, actually, but he liked it well enough to easily be able to sit through the solo performance without getting antsy. At length the notes trailed off and silence drifted out of the room and into the hallway. Sensing that the time had come, Sweetie cautiously turned the handle of the door and pulled it open. The hinges didn't offer so much as a single creak as the door moved aside and the three foals made their way into the room. The room's design was akin to a small amphitheater. 3 rows of benches, each one sitting a little higher than the last, were arrayed in an arc around the rear of the circular room so that all seats were angled towards the lower area that formed the stage, where a light gray earth pony with a black mane was in the process of switching out some sheets of music while the cello that she played rested on a stand. Sweetie and the others quietly made their way into the room and took seats on the third and highest level of benches. Sweetie watched carefully and intently as the gray mare finished setting out the next set of sheets. Taking the cello from its stand, she reared up onto her hind legs, curling one fetlock around the neck whilst her other fetlock picked up the bow. Smoothly, the mare began to draw the bow across the strings, once more sending haunting strains of music echoing throughout the room. Sweetie closed her eyes and concentrated purely on listening, having to suppress the urge to hum along with the music lest she break the mare's concentration. Instead, she let the notes roll across her mind, even though she wasn't able to identify them with their proper names. She listened, losing herself in the music. As she listened, she had an idea. Channeling her magic into her horn, she listened and let out a gentle pulse of energy in time with the mare's playing. It was nothing more than a pinprick of light winking on and off at the tip of her horn, but it allowed her to become completely absorbed into the rhythm of the mare's playing. Something occurred to her as she listened. Sweetie had never received formal education in music. She couldn't read notes, she didn't understand more than a couple of the symbols that indicated rests or stops. But she had seen a little sheet music on occasion. Music was a language of its own, as clear and precise as any line of text from any of Twilight Sparkle's hundreds of accumulated tomes. If that's the case, instead of doing the same thing with magic that Twilight and other unicorns do, maybe I could use music to structure my magic instead. It was an interesting thought. Sweetie figured that it might be a good idea to bring it up to Twilight later, as Twilight might actually know something about that. After several more minutes of playing, the mare on the stage drifted to a stop and Sweetie let out a sigh that hovered somewhere between happiness and disappointment. She couldn't have been happier to hear such wonderful music, but, at the same time, lamented the fact that it had to have ended so quickly. Enjoying the show. Sweetie's eyes snapped open and she realized that the gray mare on the stage was now staring directly at her with a pair of beautiful mulberry eyes. Oh, The mare gave Sweetie a small smile. When you've tuned your hearing as carefully as I have, you can detect the difference in acoustics of a room created by leaving a door open. Her smile widened slightly. Are the presence of other ponies in the room? Sorry, said Sweetie, painfully aware that she was the one who had drawn the cello player's attention. We didn't mean to disturb you, miss. Octavia, said the mare primly as she set the cello back in the stand and settled back onto her forelegs. Octavia Melody. And you are? Oh, I'm Sweetie Belle, said Sweetie. Taking their cues from Sweetie, the others introduced themselves. I'm terribly sorry if we disturbed you, said Melon, but the foals just wanted to listen more closely. It's no problem at all, said Octavia, a faint hint of laughter in her voice. A performer is always happy to have an audience. Granted, I don't usually find my personal practice sessions drawing listeners in, but it's nice to know that I play well enough even when I'm just practicing. It's amazing, exclaimed Sweetie Belle. There was a glimmer of amusement in Octavia's mulberry-colored eyes. I see, you're a music aficionado then. The question prompted Sweetie to stop and look away pensively. Well, I really like listening to it and singing. Why don't you come down here with me, suggested Octavia, beckoning the filly. I'd like to try something, if you don't mind. Are you sure? Asked Sweetie, a bit nervously. Don't be afraid, said Octavia, still waving Sweetie down from the bench. I think you'll like this. Okay. Sweetie stood in front of Octavia as the mare took the cello off its stand and reared up into her playing position. Now, I'm going to play a single note. I want you to listen very carefully. Sweetie nodded and lifted her ears up as high as they would go. Octavia drew her bow across the strings, playing a single, somber note. As the note faded into the silence of the practice room, Octavia lowered her bow and looked expectantly at Sweetie. Now, do you remember the sound of that note? Sweetie nodded fervently and Octavia continued. I want you to hold that note in your mind, play it over and over inside of your head. Sweetie Belle's eyes closed as she lost herself in the task Octavia had given her. The rest of the audience watched in silence, no pony knowing exactly what to expect. Now, said Octavia, take that sound in your head and use your magic to project it outwards. Sweetie's face scrunched up and the tip of her horn lit up. A second later, the air was filled with the sound of the same note that Octavia had previously played, with perfect crystal clarity. I did it, gasped Sweetie in shock. Octavia couldn't help but smile down at the filly. Yes, you did. Are you ready to try something else? Sweetie nodded eagerly, prompting Octavia's smile to widen. Good, now I'm going to play a few notes in succession. I want you to listen to them and do the same thing that you did with one note. Do you think you can? I can try, said Sweetie. Octavia raised the bow again and played a sequence of 3 notes. After lowering the bow, she nodded to Sweetie, who closed her eyes in concentration. Less than a minute later, Sweetie began to play the notes, once again imitating them with perfect clarity. Good, said Octavia, ready to try a longer sequence. Nodding eagerly, Sweetie listened as Octavia played another, longer sequence of notes, starting with the first three she'd played last time. Once again, Sweetie, after a minute's concentration, was able to replicate the sequence. Octavia did the same thing again, extending the number of notes further with each repetition, until Sweetie was able to reproduce a full dozen notes in sequence. Good, said Octavia, her voice brimming with approval as Sweetie finished. Now we're going to try something a little different. I want you to play that sequence again, but I want you to play the notes according to the beat that I set. Octavia began to tap on the floor, setting a beat for Sweetie to follow. After a second's hesitation, Sweetie began to produce the notes again. However, she stumbled a little and had to start over. In the end, it took her 3 tries to play the notes to Octavia's rhythm. When she succeeded, Sweetie let out an exuberant yell. I did it. That you did, said Octavia with a smile. Now for the last step. Last step? Asked Sweetie, cocking her head in confusion. The cellist couldn't help but chuckle at the confused expression on Sweetie Belle's face. Yes, there's one more thing to do. I want you to play that sequence of notes again, to the same rhythm as last time. However, when you get to the end, I want you to restart the sequence and play it over again. Don't forget to keep the rhythm. I want you to keep that up until I tell you to stop. Oh okay, said Sweetie. She closed her eyes and lit her horn, the sequence of notes sounding throughout the room as she used her magic to produce the notes that Octavia had shown her. Octavia settled back and listened as Sweetie played the sequence once, twice, 3 times. When Sweetie looped back to begin the 4th repetition, Octavia once again set her bow to the strings of the cello and began to play. Don, Scootaloo, Melon, and Caramel all listened in fascination as Octavia and Sweetie Belle performed together, Octavia's melody blending perfectly with and building off of the repeating sequence Sweetie played with her horn at the same time. The song was a simple one, but pleasing to listen to. For several minutes, Octavia and Sweetie simply played while the others listened in stunned silence. At long last, Octavia drew her bow across the string, playing the final note. Sweetie Belle didn't even need Octavia's prompt to stop her own playing. Wow, she gasped as the last strains of Octavia's cello and her magic faded away. That was amazing, exclaimed Scootaloo, jumping down from her seat. That was fun, exclaimed Sweetie, grinning widely. I thought you might like that, said Octavia. When you were watching me earlier, I noticed that you were using your magic to keep time with my music. You have an excellent ear for it, given that you were able to perfectly reproduce the notes I played earlier. I believe you could be an excellent musician in the future. That's. Sweetie's voice trailed off and her smile fell away. I can't. Octavia smiled and set aside her cello. What's the matter? She asked softly, walking closer to Sweetie. Yeah, your music was amazing, protested Scootaloo. Aw, Sweetie jumped at Scootaloo's sudden proximity. Dawn reached out and restrained Scootaloo with a hoof on her shoulder, pulling the orange filly back to give Sweetie some more space. Sweetie, for her part, blushed fiercely and looked at the floor, looking mortified by the attention she was receiving. Caramel and Melon exchanged a look. Why don't we step outside, suggested Caramel as he and Melon shepherded the other 2 foals out of the room and closed the door behind them. Once their audience was gone, Sweetie began to relax a little, but still couldn't bring herself to look up at Octavia, who was gazing contemplatively at the filly. I see, said Octavia softly, so you don't like performing in public. Well, not really. Sweetie still refused to meet Octavia's eyes. Every pony tells me I'm really good at singing and that I have a wonderful voice. I love listening to music and singing, but when I think about being a singer or playing music in front of an audience, it just feels wrong for some reason. Octavia slowly reached out with her hoof and began to gently run it through Sweetie's mane. I see, she said, but when I said you could be a great musician, I didn't mean that you had to become a great performer. Huh, Sweetie blinked and finally looked up at the mare. Octavia favored Sweetie with a warm smile. When you think about singing or playing, you think about doing so for an audience, in front of a crowd, and that doesn't feel right to you. Sweetie nodded. Then I think that is where your problem lies. Your talent and passion both lie in music. You love it deeply, however, I think you are thinking about the wrong audience. I don't get it, said Sweetie. Let me put it this way, said Octavia, I'm certain that you're perfectly fine singing in front of some ponies. Sweetie nodded. She'd sung for her sister on plenty of occasions. She'd sung for her friends too, most recently during their sleepover in Don's Quincy. She'd even done a couple of solo performances for Rumble, who'd been mesmerized. Then it isn't a matter of you not loving music, said Octavia, it's simply a matter of finding you the right audience. The right audience? Asked Sweetie. Octavia nodded. Not every pony is suited to playing in a concert hall, in front of an audience of hundreds or thousands. Sometimes, all a musician needs is for the right hoeful of ponies to hear her and see her performance. The question you need to ask yourself is, who are you playing for? Sweetie blinked and sank her head pensively as she tried to figure out the answer to that question. You may not have found your perfect audience yet, observed Octavia, but I think you will. In the meantime, there's something else you can look into. Huh. You have a potential to develop a skill that few ponies cultivate. The fact that you can produce music with your magic shows that you understand music as a language just as most unicorns understand magic in the terms of regular language. That's right, agreed Sweetie Belle, nodding eagerly. Octavia smiled. That opens many new avenues of learning for you. May I ask where you're from? Ponyville, exclaimed Sweetie. That got a nod from Octavia. I thought so. There's supposed to be a mare in Ponyville who's supposed to be very skilled in the field of musical magic. She goes by the name of Vinyl Scratch. She might be able to help you develop that skill. Ooh, gasped Sweetie, you mean DJ Pond 3. I can ask her for help. Octavia couldn't help but giggle at the filly's enthusiasm. Exactly, she said, from what I hear, Vinyl is very good at working with young ones, such as yourself. Okay, said Sweetie, I'll do that. You should probably join your friends then, said Octavia, I think they're getting a little worried about you. Okay, Sweetie made for the door, but paused and turned to look at Octavia more carefully. You said that the right audience is important. Who's your audience? To Sweetie's surprise, Octavia actually began to blush. Well, I can play in front of a large audience. But for a while now, there's only been one pony that I really want to hear my work. Ooh, is it your special sumpony? Asked Sweetie. Octavia blushed even more fiercely. Well no, she admitted, somewhat reluctantly, it may be just wishful thinking. She paused, apparently reluctant to express any further details. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, said Sweetie. Now that she had a special Sumpony of her own, she realized how embarrassing it would be if Sumpony started asking her a ton of questions about her personal affairs. Thank you, said Octavia, her blush fading. In any case, that's why I was practicing by myself here. I'm hoping to come up with a melody for my audience. Sweetie beamed at Octavia. I'm sure you'll come up with something. You're an amazing player. That means a lot to me, said Octavia, lowering her head and giving Sweetie a light nuzzle. Thank you. Now I think it's time for you to meet back up with your friends. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in the palace. "Okay, I will," shouted Sweetie as she bounded out the door. Bye. The door shut behind Sweetie and Octavia turned her attention back to the stand of music and the cellos that rested alongside it. Now, back to work. Phew, gasped Applejack as she sagged onto the couch, plumb tuckered out. It's bad enough we only got off the train today, but to spend all afternoon rehearsing is exhausting. Fortunately, there had been a small hitch that had delayed the costume designer, who would not be able to come until tomorrow, so that meant the group had extra time to rest. Ha, scoffed Apple Bloom from where she was sprawled out on top of the bed. Y'all think are tired. All y'all had to do was prance about and practice our lines. I ended up helping build the scenery. Let me tell ya, it's like trying to raise a barn by yourself even when the rest, the crew is helping. Probably right, admitted Applejack, taking off her Stetson and settling it on the back of the couch, but rehearsin' fair the Canterlot pageant ain't no piece o' cake. That director's a slave driver. I swear, that pony's wasted shoutin' orders at a bunch o' actors. I say we take her back and have her call the shots on the farm. Now there's a mare that knows how to get ponies movin'. She definitely has the lungs for it. Applejack stiffened up slightly as she felt the cushions on the couch shift a bit as Red River joined her. A few seconds later, Red rested his forehooves on Applejack's back and slowly began to knead the muscles around her shoulders, slowly working his way down her spine, massaging the muscles and working out the knots that had accumulated from the stress of the past few days. And a stressful past few days they had been, for everyone on Sweet Apple Acres. The winter silk apples ripening couldn't have occurred at a more inconvenient time, forcing the apples to rush to get them harvested in time for departure. Red River had helped as much as he possibly could. Mayweather had lent her assistance as well, though she ultimately ended up leaving on the first train with Pinkie Pie. Spike had joined them too, doing his best to lend the organizational skills he had polished under Twilight to increase the harvest's speed and efficiency. Had it not been for the young dragon directing their efforts, it might well have taken an extra day to gather the crop. Even so, they'd barely had time to pack their bags before running to catch the next train bound for Canterlot. Speaking of Spike, the little purple dragon came into the room behind Red, making his way to the bed, where Bloom was resting, spread-eagled on her stomach. Crawling over, Spike imitated Red and gently pressed his fingers down into the muscles around Bloom's shoulders, giving the filly a massage of her own. Both sisters let out happy sighs as their respective special someones continued their ministrations, slowly easing their tension. Bloom's situation was especially blissful, as Spike's agile fingers were working wonders that Noppany's hooves could possibly hope to match. Ya could give the Spa twins a run fair their money, Sugar Cube, she cooed as Spike moved down to her barrel. Sheesh, and I've only read a couple books about it, said Spike. Maybe I should look into doing this professionally. You think Aloe and Lotus are hiring? He secretly marveled at how much muscle Bloom had put on since the time he had first met her. She scarcely seemed the same filly that he remembered meeting on the farm on the day before the summer sun celebration. The years since then had seen her grow in both height and girth, though she still had a long ways to go before she matched her sister. Beneath the skin under his claws, Spike could feel the thick, dense muscle, the result of endless hours spent helping the Apple family do what they did best. It was only with a supreme effort of will that Spike was able to keep his mind from wandering in a more sensual direction. It was just as well, seeing as he noticed Bloom glowering at him over her shoulder. Don't even think about it, Sugar Cube, she said. At first Spike was worried that Bloom had figured that his mind had been slowly working its way towards the gutter. But a second later, it was clear that she was talking about his previous statement. I'm keeping those fingers, yours all to myself. 1. Spike couldn't help but grin mischievously at the filly. Really, even if I do this. With that, he switched the pressure from the pads of his fingers to the tips of his claws as he began to trace the skin around Bloom's ribs, eliciting squealing laughter from the yellow filly as she began to squirm and thrash beneath him. Applejack and Red River watched the two young ones laughing and playing on the bed. With a playful smile of his own, Red leaned over and gently nipped at Applejack's ear, earning a giggle from his filly friend as she twitched from the treatment. Now we're playing dirty, said Applejack in mock reproof. Oh, am I? Inquired Red, settling his weight across Applejack's back and wrapping his arms around her even as he rested his chin on top of her head. Where'd y'all learn to massage like that? Asked Applejack. In a certain sense, it comes with the territory, explained Red. Massage as a therapy is useful to any pony practicing heavily physical activities, including the martial arts. In the martial arts, a working knowledge of the equine form is required. I guess that makes sense, said Applejack, letting herself relax in her cold friend's embrace as they continued to watch Spike and Bloom wrestle playfully on the bed, keeping a weather eye out just in case the young one's activities became a bit more amorous than she was willing to allow. As of right now, there was no reason to worry, seeing as the only thing going on was an extended tickle fight. Everything ground to a halt as knocking sounded from the door, which swung open only a few seconds later to reveal Rarity, still looking as prim and immaculate as she had at lunch, as though the last few hours had never happened at all. Applejack grunted irritably, as she recalled Rarity looking distinctly more frazzled at the end of rehearsals. She greatly envied the fashionista's skill at repairing her appearance in so short a period of time, not that Applejack had been making any efforts in that direction. Chop chop darlings, declared Rarity imperiously, it is nearly time for dinner with the princesses. I hope that you can get yourselves ready in time. We don't want to be late. We'll be fine, snapped Applejack, don't you fret now. Well yes, said Rarity, but I can't help but think you should put more of an effort into grooming for this evening. We will be dining with royalty after all. We dined with them fair lunch, Applejack shot back, there ain't anything fancy or formal about it. It's just like dinner with close family. Celestia said so herself. Well, yes, said Rarity reluctantly, but we are in Canterlot, the center of equestrian culture and more like the center of equestrian snobbiness, groused Applejack. She froze when she felt Red's hoof prod her side. Turning her head, Applejack looked over her shoulder at her cold friend who gave her a somber look and shook his head slowly. Looking back at Rarity, Applejack noticed that Rarity looked a bit more hurt by her harsh words than she had realized. Aw geez. I'm sorry Rares. I'm just tired. Didn't mean to snap at y'all like that. No, it's quite alright, said Rarity. I realize you've had a difficult past few days and it's been a long afternoon. It's perfectly understandable that your temper is a bit short. I've been feeling a mite tense myself. Applejack blinked, wondering just what could have Rarity so tightly wound, at least more so than usual. Everything's okay, Sugar Cube. Oh no, protested Rarity, everything is simply wonderful. I'd forgotten how wonderful the palace accommodations are. It's truly beyond compare. What could I possibly have to get upset about? I ain't sure, but it seems to be enough to make ya dance like on a bed. Oh hot coals, observed Applejack. It was a mild exaggeration, but it was indeed true that, for a mare of her poise, Rarity seemed to be having a hard time standing still, constantly shifting her weight from leg to another and occasionally glancing about with a faint air of nervousness. Oh don't be silly, dear Applejack, said Rarity in a faint effort to dismiss the topic. I assure you that there is nothing here for me to worry about. Applejack's eyes narrowed. Here, huh? She grabbed the thread of Rarity's statement and pulled sharply. Then maybe something back in Ponyville's got ya riled up. Well, Rarity's anxious behavior was only continuing to gather momentum as Applejack's interrogation came closer and closer to the truth. Spike and Apple Bloom had long since abandoned their play and were watching the back and forth between the two mares with careful interest. Applejack flinched at another prod from Red. Looking at him again, she saw the stallion give her a warning glance and shake his head. Realizing what she was doing, Applejack gasped shortly and turned back to Rarity. I'm so sorry Sugar Cube. Got so worked up that started prying into things that ain't any, ma business. Reluctantly, Applejack slid out of Red's embrace and made her way across the floor to Rarity, where she rested a hoof on the impeccably groomed coat over the alabaster unicorn's shoulder. It might not be any, ma business, but we're friends Rarity. So I hope y'all believe me when I say I don't want y'all to feel that y'all have to hide anythings from me. I was getting a mite concerned and I'll let myself get carried away. Just say the word and I won't ask another question. No, it's perfectly alright, said Rarity, looking down. You're right. I am a bit nervous about what is happening in Ponyville. Poor Flaxseed is back there, all by his lonesome, on hearts warming no less. How can I not worry? I recall, Flaxseed's a big colt. I think he can manage on his own. In fact, given what Flaxseed must have gone through to grant him such a paranoid mindset, Applejack was willing to bet that he could handle himself quite well. That's not what I mean and you know it, said Rarity with an angry huff. Think about it. On Hearts Warming Eve he's going to be all by his lonesome, no friends, no family, no one to share the spirit of the holiday with. I know that I recommended that he join Rumble's family for the evening, but I am fairly certain that he has no intention of following my recommendation. Forgive me fair askins, said Applejack, but ain't that his choice to make? If he wants to be by himself for the holiday, that's his right. Rarity sighed. He doesn't want to be by himself because he wants to be alone. He wants to isolate himself because he still has a great deal of difficulty trusting other ponies. Even after all the time he has spent in the boutique with me and Sweetie Belle, the poor dear still hasn't made much progress with ponies outside of our immediate circle and he won't if he doesn't learn to step outside of his comfort zone. Far be it for me to belittle that stallion after all he has been through, but I can't help but feel that his unwillingness to spend any amount of time with any pony besides me and my sister is very much like a foal unwilling to step away from her mother even when she should be old enough to go off and do things on her own. In order for Flaxseed to recover from his trauma, he needs to take that extra step. Then maybe it's fair the best, said Applejack, watching Rarity somberly. Y'all compare Flaxseed to some foal who don't want to leave their ma, but here you are, acting just like y'all wanna stand right next to him and hold his hoof the whole time. If he's gonna step outside his comfort zone, he needs to do it himself, not cuz are standing behind him and pushing and prodding him. Rarity let out a gasp and her hooves flew to her mouth. Dear me, you're absolutely right, she sighed. That was extremely disrespectful of me. I should know better than to think of him like that. Her heart sank with guilt as she realized that, in many ways, she did see Flaxseed in that manner, as stallion who was not quite able to look after his own needs, even though she knew better. The thought that she was being so inconsiderate of him was horrifying. Applejack felt her lips pull up into a smile. Looking back, she saw that Red was wearing a similar look and realized that they had come to, more or less, the same conclusion. Turning back to Rarity, Applejack's smile became a grin. If I were any judge, I'd say so wound up cuz y'all actually want to spend hearts warmin' with him. Rarity gasped sharply, raising a hoof to her mouth which failed to conceal the blush blooming across her cheeks. Oh my, don't be ridiculous darling. It's nothing like that. Not that I would have anything against spending hearts warming with Flaxseed, but. Come on Rarity, ain't no shame in admitting it, said Applejack, her expression softening. I understand that feelin'. After everything's that fella's been through, y'all wanna be there and make this year's hearts warmin' special for him. Y'all want that cuz y'all know y'all may not have the same chance next year. But I can't just go rushing back off to Ponyville, protested Rarity. Regardless of what I want, I have made commitments here to play our role in the pageant. Don't sweat it, Sugar Cube. That's what them under what sits. Understudies Applejack, huffed Rarity. Right them. Applejack nodded as though she'd known that all along. That's what they're fair. But the audience. Come on Rarity, what's more important, putting on a show for a bunch, oh hoity-toity Canterlot snobs more interested in us cuz we get to hobnob with the princess or making the holiday special fair a stallion who hasn't really had a chance to be part of a real hearts warmin' fair most, his life. Well, Rarity's expression shifted from Applejack to the floor, to the wall, to the ceiling as Rarity argued with herself about what to do. Applejack didn't bother trying to suppress her sigh as she watched Rarity dither. While it was one of her most endearing traits, Rarity's willingness to give of herself for the sake of her friends was something she could easily take too far, given the chance, just as it had when she first made those grand galloping gala dresses for the girls and had been too willing to accommodate their personal desires, even though Rarity had known better about what would truly make the girls look their best. At some point, Rarity would just have to accept that she couldn't please every pony and meet everything that was asked of her. I beg your pardon. Rarity froze and whirled about in the direction of the voice that had spoken. Applejack leaned to try and get a view of who had interjected herself into the conversation and was rewarded by the midnight blue coat and starscape mane of Princess Luna. Oh, Princess. Rarity immediately sank into a respectful bow. Please, rise Rarity, said Luna as she smiled down at the fashionista. You are our guests and friends. There is no need for such formality here. Aye, thank you, said Rarity, getting back on her hooves a little shakily. She was already out of sorts thanks to her own dilemma. At the unexpected appearance of Luna, old habits and traditions had quickly asserted themselves, even though she knew better. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, said Luna, glancing into the room, drawing a nod from Applejack and Red, along with happy waves from Spike and Apple Bloom. Ah yes, well, Rarity wasn't sure that she was allowed to be upset that a princess had been essentially eavesdropping on their conversation. But, at the same time, she supposed it was her own fault for talking to Applejack from the hallway. This Flaxseed you are speaking of, said Luna, I presume he is the same stallion I heard about on Nightmare Night, the one with the same condition as Dawn. Both Applejack and Rarity nodded in confirmation. I see, said Luna, I must admit I am ashamed that I did not follow through on my plans to visit him that night. Ever since then, I having been hoping to drop by, as it were, but could never find the right time for it. I am sure that we could accommodate you at your convenience, Princess, said Rarity, uncertain of how else to respond. Excellent, said Luna, but that is why I have chosen to talk to you now. As I said before, I was listening to your conversation and it gave me an idea. Author's notes. Once again, too easy. Way back at least a couple of stories ago, I had an uncomfortable feeling that I'd written myself into a corner with the way Sweetie's cutie mark was working out. Though all evidence on the show points to her becoming a fantastic singer if she can just get the moxie to get on stage and perform, I wanted to take that somewhere else. Fortunately, I hit upon a few ideas that let me figure out exactly what direction I wanted to take Sweetie's cutie mark. Suffice to say, I was rather pleased with what I came up with and I feel quite clever. It doesn't happen this story, but she does get it. I think you folks might be surprised with what she decides to do with that lovely talent of hers. Next chapter, Heartwarming Eve has arrived. The Fires of Friendship. Chapter 20, The Fires of Friendship. Oh my goodness, these are positively marvelous, exclaimed Rarity as she twirled about spinning to observe the silver and purple robes draped about her. She had to admit they were more than a match for the costume she had worn last time. Truly, Miss Lockstitch, you've done wonderful work. A dark red unicorn mare with a grass-green mane bobbed her head politely. She was a fair bit older than Rarity and clearly had the weight of experience behind her, especially seeing as she was able to maintain a successful business in the midst of Canterlot, a city whose inhabitants had the most demanding standards in all Equestria. I wish I could take all the credit, said Lockstitch, but I have to say that my new apprentice handled a great deal of the work. Your apprentice. Rarity blinked and turned to give her costume a closer look. I honestly didn't notice. This is fully professional quality. Though she is serving her apprenticeship under me, she already has considerable experience thanks to the mare she was working under in Manhattan. Lockstitch turned to the door of the dressing room. Coco, come in please. Oh, a young, off-white mare carefully made her way through the door, her cheeks colored faintly red as she met Rarity's gaze nervously and ducked her head in greeting. I'm Coco Pommel. Pleased to meet you, Miss Rarity. This is a great honor. I must say, I am very impressed with your work, darling, said Rarity, once again looking over her costume. If Lockstitch hadn't told me, I would have never guessed this is an apprentice's work. Thank you. In spite of her stammering, Coco's eyes lit up like a filly opening a birthday present and realizing she had gotten exactly what she had wanted. Lockstitch couldn't help but chuckle softly. Coco here is a great admirer of yours, Miss Rarity. Coco's blush intensified as she gasped and ducked her head, this time to hide her face from Rarity, who was blushing herself. Well, I'm very flattered, Miss Coco. I had no idea I was such an inspiration. Rarity fanned herself with a hoof, unsure of what else to say in response to that. While she prided herself by being a shaker and mover in the fashion world, she felt a bit put on the spot to be confronted by one of her admirers so directly. She was no Rainbow Dash after all. I have to concede that you are probably one of the finest fashion designers in the country, said Lockstitch, though she didn't sound the slightest troubled by that fact. In fact, I was hoping to suggest something while I have the opportunity. And what is that? Asked Rarity, her interest piqued. I am the second designer Coco has apprenticed under, explained Lockstitch. The first mare she apprenticed under in Manhattan was a charlatan of lowest grade. Coco ended up here in Canterlot after that mare was exposed as such. In her apprenticeship there, Coco was actually the one doing most of the work when it came to actually making the clothes. Because of that, her technical skills are, more or less, at a professional level. Coco blushed all the more fiercely at the praise being heaped on her. Because of that, I feel that there is very little that Coco would gain from apprenticing under me. I believe that the best thing for her would be to broaden her experience further, like say, having her finish her apprenticeship under one of the most influential ponies in the fashion world. Coco's gasp was matched by Rarity. Are you saying that I should take Coco Pommel to Ponyville to finish out her apprenticeship under me? Asked Rarity. Would you have a problem with that? Asked Lockstitch, raising an eyebrow. Rarity really wished that Lockstitch hadn't made her proposal while Coco was still in the room. Rarity was almost ready to break out in a nervous sweat under the pressure of Coco's gaze as the younger mare stared at her with starstruck awe. It wasn't that Rarity had anything against Coco. Taking on an apprentice, even one who was merely finishing out her apprenticeship, was a serious decision to make. While Rarity wasn't immediately inclined to say no, she couldn't necessarily guarantee that her answer would be yes either. But to say no right in front of Coco's face no less. Rarity wasn't certain that she could dash Coco's hopes like that, but if she agreed, she wanted to do so for the right reasons. I have to admit that this is something I have to think about, said Rarity. I'm not certain the answer will be yes. She hid a grimace at the sight of Coco's expression falling. Sympathy came to her face easily enough considering it was genuine. Please don't think it's any fault of yours, darling. It's just, I've never taken on an apprentice before. I'm not certain whether or not I could provide you with what you need and deserve. I more than think that you can handle the job, said Lockstitch with a confidence Rarity only wished she could feel herself. Coco's education is nearly complete. The most beneficial thing for her would be to expose her to other schools of thought and different perspectives. That your boutique can flourish in a small town like Ponyville is a definite sign of your skill and business savvy, things that Coco will have to learn if she wants to open and run her own shop at some point. See, Rarity still felt uncertain. All things considered, she was very well off, in spite of the fact that she was providing for herself, her sister, and one rather dependent stallion, whom she had also now taken on as an employee. She wondered if Flaxseed, with his nearly miraculous skill for number crunching, might be able to find a way to stretch their finances to accommodate an apprentice as well. But then, something else occurred to Rarity. While taking Coco on as an apprentice might be a financial risk in the short term, there was something in the future that could alleviate it. In the spring, Rarity would be trying to obtain the royal warrant. Having what was essentially the princess's official stamp of approval on her business would cause her notoriety and the demand for her products to skyrocket. She could even resume business with the Canterlot nobility, free from her previous worries about their plans to manipulate her. If she could obtain the royal warrant for her business, Rarity had little doubt that she would soon be making more than enough to accommodate an apprentice, maybe even 2 or 3. If she succeeded, therein lay the problem. Obtaining the royal warrant was far from a sure thing for Rarity. There would be a great deal of competition for such prestigious recognition, and while Coco's clear admiration of her made it apparent that Rarity was amongst the foremost of those in her chosen profession, she was wise enough to realize that she was still quite a long ways from having it in the bag, as Rainbow Dash would so eloquently call it. She was optimistic about her chances, but wouldn't go far as to assume she had already won. But still, maybe if she had the assistance of an apprentice, particularly one as skilled and experienced as Coco clearly already was, then maybe she might have an even better chance at obtaining the royal warrant. I think, said Rarity, still a bit hesitantly as Coco's ears perked up, I think I just might be able to take you on after all. My finances might be tight for a little bit, but I believe that I might be able to manage. Turning her full attention back to Coco, Rarity gave her a warm smile. If you feel that you would like to finish your apprenticeship under me, then I will expect to see you at my boutique in Ponyville a week after Heartswarming. Rarity turned back to Lockstitch. Is that acceptable? I believe so, said Lockstitch with a pleased smile. With that out of the way, let's finish with the fitting. Of course, said Rarity, going still so that the seamstress and her assistant could make the final adjustments to the costume. Rarity was the last of her friends to be fitted. Of the costumes for the 6 leaders, 4 had been done by Lockstitch and Coco, who had also done the costumes for Clover the Clever, Puddinghead and Smart Cookie. The costumes for Commander Hurricane and Private Pansy had been chopped out to a different costume maker, one who was better versed in creating the imitation armor the 2 Pegasus leaders would be wearing during the pageant. Lockstitch and Coco were also responsible for the costumes for many of the extras in the play as well, though those garments had not required the same exacting attention to detail the leading roles did. It was only the work of a few minutes for Lockstitch and Coco to finish up, at which point Rarity carefully removed her costume and draped it over the nearby Ponyquin in preparation for the upcoming dress rehearsals. Thank you both so much for your hard work, said Rarity as the 3 of them made their way to the door. Oh, I'm looking forward to seeing you perform, Miss Rarity, said Coco with a wide, adoring smile that actually reminded Rarity a good bit of Sweetie Belle. The resemblance was so uncanny that Rarity had to stifle a giggle. I'll try my hardest not to disappoint you, said Rarity politely. After bidding the 2 tailors a good day, Rarity made her way to the dining room to join everypony else for lunch. The dress rehearsals went smoothly in the last night of preparation before Heartswarming Eve. The group reconvened for dinner before retiring to their rooms at night. The next morning, they rose bright and early to join the princesses for breakfast before returning to the general preparations for the pageant that evening. It was now officially Heartswarming Eve. Strangely, the palace felt practically deserted compared to the previous 2 days. The majority of the servants had been dismissed to spend this day and the next with their families. The only ones still working in the palace and its adjoining facilities, including the auditorium where the pageant would be performed, were the cast and crew of the pageant. Even the cooks had left, leaving everypony, including Celestia and Luna, to use the kitchens themselves when it came to preparing meals. Thus, while the cast and crew of the pageant focused their efforts on final rehearsals before the guests arrived, everypony else assembled in the kitchens and, led by Caramel, went about the all-important task of preparing a Heartswarming Eve's dinner. Fortunately, Caramel and Melon Cream were both well versed in preparing various large dishes for the meal. The foals, save for Apple Bloom and Spike, who were helping with the crew again, did their best to assist in the preparations. Fortunately, their experience in Arkenstone's tea shop allowed them to aid the adults without causing any disasters. Work continued throughout the day, with only a brief pause for lunch. Still, spirits were high as everything came together. By the time the sun started to set and the first guests attending the pageant started to arrive, everything was ready. What are those things? Gasped Smart Cookie as she gaped upwards at the spectral horses circling above them like sharks. The waves of cold washing down from those bizarre perversions of equinety had already frozen the 3 leaders. Princess Platinum, Commander Hurricane and Chancellor Puddinghead were now encased in thick ice. Now that ice was slowly stretching across the floor towards the remaining 3 ponies in the cave as the monstrous creatures above whinnied in excitement. I'm not sure, said Clover the Clever, watching the beasts with a similarly fearful expression. I think I've heard about something like them from my teacher, but what do you think they are? Stammered a frantically shivering Private Pansy as she too watched their tormentors with a look of abject terror on her face. I think they might be Wendigos, said Clover finally. They're supposed to be monsters that feed on hatred and animosity. My teacher said they were just a myth though. Clover had already tried to blast the fell spirits away with her magic, but it had seemed to simply pass through them without consequence. Cookie's eyes immediately dropped from the creatures above to Clover. Wait, ya said they feed on hatred. Well, yes, said Clover with more than a little uncertainty. That's what the stories about them said anyway. I had no idea what they looked like. So y'all think they're the ones behind the blizzards that chased us out of our homes? Demanded Cookie, looking up again at the monsters but now glaring instead of gaping. Maybe, said Clover, they seem to be behind this blizzard right now. But I don't understand why. Clover was cut off by a sharp gasp of terror from Pansy, drawing the eyes of the other 2 to her. It's our fault, exclaimed Pansy, her eyes going even wider than before. Why, you said they feed on hatred, right? Clover blinked as Pansy's words dawned on her. So then it's our fault, said Cookie, the horror beginning to sink in for her as well. We did this, we 3 tribes, with all our fightin' and arguin'. It must have been like a dinner bell to the monsters. Tears were beginning to fall from Pansy's eyes. Then it's too late, she said, the others are already gone. As soon we will too, all because we Because we were too obsessed with the idea of one tribe being better than the others, said Clover, her voice almost a whisper. I'm scared, whimpered Pansy, once again directing a look up at the Wendigos which she could have sworn were now circling closer and closer down towards them. So am I, said Cookie, drawing up close to Pansy and wrapping her in a tight hug. But you sound so brave, said Pansy, I thought you weren't scared at all. Cow saw him, said Cookie, but I feel a bit better to have ponies all respect with me at the end. Don't ya feel the same? The look of terror on Pansy's face began to fade and she found herself smiling at the Earth Pony advisor. I guess so. What about you? Asked Cookie, turning her head to look at Clover. I guess, Clover sniffed, I guess there's nothing left. None of my magic worked against them. We're all just as helpless. But, she managed a faint smile. I guess that, if it's the end for me, then I'm happy to be there with ponies I could call friends. Cookie and Pansy smiled at the unicorn. It's too. Clover joined them in their embrace. At that moment, something spectacular and miraculous happened. The bodies of the three ponies began to shine white with light. Power seemed to surge out from them as each in turn opened their eyes, the normal colors being replaced with shining white. A column of energy erupted upwards, piercing through the center of the Wendigos formation. Their cries changed from triumph to terror as pink and violet fire swirled outwards from the epicenter of the blast, drawing them in and consuming them. The light faded from the three ponies, leaving them in a daze in the middle of the cave. Clover was the first to come to, blinking slowly as she looked from Cookie to Pansy, the Earth Pony and Pegasus slowly coming out of their own trances as well. The three of them looked between one another, completely baffled by the sudden, completely unexpected reversal of their fortunes. Finally, it was Clover who spoke. What just happened? As the last strains of the familiar carol faded away, the curtain fell across the assembled actors as they bowed. The theater echoed with cheers and clopping hooves as the assembled audience applauded the performance. From his place next to Caramel, Don looked around, sweeping his eyes across the assembled ponies. Through the cheering and whistling and stamping was a faint undercurrent of murmurs that stood out to Don's ears. Trying to identify the source of the strange counterpoint to the cheering, Don's eyes picked out small pockets of ponies who seemed less than pleased with what they had seen on the stage. There were a scant few of them, pairs or trios of ponies, all of them unicorns, staring at the stage as they exchanged harsh whispers with each other. Something wrong? Asked Caramel, realizing that Don's attention had wandered. Not every pony seems to have enjoyed the pageant, said Don pensively. Looking around, Caramel noted the few pockets of discontent as well. I guess some ponies aren't too happy with the changes Twilight made to the script, he observed. That's not too surprising really. Don blinked and continued to look around. This was the first time he had actually sat through the pageant himself. He certainly hadn't seen any renditions of the previous version. Is it really that different? Caramel shrugged. This was the first time he had seen the Canterlot pageant himself. Not really, said Scootaloo. I mean, the scene in the cave was a little shorter the last time we were here. But it's not a huge change. Sweetie Belle and Apple Bloom exchanged looks and shrugged. I don't get it either, said Sweetie. Not a big deal, added Apple Bloom. Don blinked and looked over at the upset unicorns again. All of them were dressed to the nines, at least two of them looking as though they'd dressed for some elaborate ball than merely attending the hearts-warming pageant, which from the state of undress sported by the vast majority of the audience did not strike Don as a particularly formal event, no matter how important it was supposed to be. Well, let's forget about it, said Caramel. If they want to be sour apples about the whole thing, let them. We should get backstage and congratulate the girls and Spike on their hard work. The rest of the group nodded and they all made their way towards the backstage. Caramel and Melon Cream had accompanied the foals, but Red River, Arkenstone, and Mayweather were absent, the three of them having stayed behind to finalize preparations for the evening's dinner. The door to the green room had just barely opened when Don and Caramel, who had entered first, found themselves nearly bowled over as Rarity came rushing out. There you are, Sweetie Belle. We need to hurry or we'll be late. Sweetie's eyes went wide as she gaped at Rarity. Oh, she went to join her sister as they rushed down the hall. Bye every pony. I'll see you later. With that the two sisters galloped away. What? Asked Don, looking after them in confusion. Don't worry about them, said Apple Bloom, smiling after the retreating pair. Princess Luna's doing something right nice for 'em. But cuz, oh that they ain't joining us fair dinner tonight. Okay, said Scootaloo. Once again, Caramel found himself shrugging. Well, let's not worry about it too much. Come on kids. They entered the green room, where Caramel was immediately tackled by an enthusiastic Fluttershy, who was giggling almost drunkenly as she planted several quick kisses on her cold friend's muzzle, her enthusiasm causing her to frequently miss his lips. Oh, it was amazing. Were you watching? Did you see me? Was I any good? Fluttershy's words spilled out in a torrent that would have sounded normal coming from Pinkie Pie, but seemed completely alien coming from the mouth of the normally shy and retiring mare. You were great, said Caramel, hugging her to his chest and gently running a hoof through her mane. He quickly realized that Fluttershy was actually trembling, apparently overloaded with nervous energy. He looked over Fluttershy's shoulder at Rainbow, who was giggling. It's an adrenaline rush, she explained. She got all worked up over the performance and she's coming down off of it now. Given what an adrenaline junkie she was, Rainbow Dash knew exactly what she was talking about. After all, the feeling of euphoria after accomplishing some hair-raising feat of daring do was something that athletes like her savored. Still, she's doing a lot better this year, observed Twilight. I remember the first time we did this. We had to actually yank her out of the prop box because she was terrified of going out on stage. Yep, agreed Applejack, she's a of a lot more confident this year. She smiled slyly as Don gently sidled up against Fluttershy and Caramel, only to be pulled in to join the embrace. I can think, oh a couple, oh things that might have happened this year to do that. The others joined her in giggling and nodded. Okay every pony, yelled Pinkie Pie, vaulting into the center of the green room. The show's over, so now it's time for dinner. Let's go eat. Yeah, shouted Scootaloo, her wings carrying her up above every pony's head. Sounds like some ponies eager to chow down, teased Bloom, smirking as Scootaloo blushed. Hey, we've been helping with the food all day. I'm starving. Let's not waste any time then, said Melon, pulling her daughter down out of the air before depositing the filly on her back. Moom, you don't have to carry me, whined Scootaloo as Bloom and Spike both snickered at her. Hush, said Melon, you're starting to get too big for me to do this. At least let me enjoy it a few more times as a heartwarming gift, please. Scootaloo let out a resigned sigh, casting a glance at Dawn to see that the colt was still busy cuddling with Fluttershy and Caramel. Fine. Amongst the crowds exiting the venue, a pair of very well-dressed unicorns made their own way towards a parked carriage. Compared to the rest of the throng of ponies streaming out the exit, one could easily have mistaken this pair as having come from a different event entirely. Any of the commoners in attendance at the pageant would have probably called Baron Elderflower and his companion overdressed. Of course, that was exactly why such ponies were commoners. Commoners didn't understand how important it was for those of noble stock to set themselves apart from the masses. When Elderflower went out amongst the rabble, he wore his pride and dignity as the Baron of Dream Valley for all to see. It was one of his chief responsibilities as a member of the noble court. As such, he'd attended the play dressed in a pure white suit with ice blue cuffs that stood out against his violet coat. Without the clothes, Elderflower could have almost passed as a male version of Twilight Sparkle if some pony had drawn a hot pink streak down his mane and tail and supplied colored contacts for his dark brown eyes. His companion was even more elaborately dressed than he was. Sweetwater, the Viscountess of Diamond Mountain, wore a pristine white gown with several glittering flakes of clear diamond woven into the fabric. When she moved and walked, the gemstone chips caught the light and sent shining ripples up and down the length of the dress. As a Viscountess, Sweetwater wouldn't allow herself to be shown up by some pony of inferior rank, thus the eye-catching ensemble she was currently wearing. Of course, said ensemble was ruined somewhat by Sweetwater's eyes as she glared straight ahead. Of all the insulting things Twilight Sparkle is guilty of, this one takes the cake. Elderflower raised an eyebrow, glancing sidelong at his companion. I don't really believe it's worth getting upset over. Sweetwater immediately glared at him. Not worth, she sputtered indignantly. She dumbed down Clover the Clever into an ineffectual simpleton who didn't know the least thing about the Wendigos. How dare they suggest that it wasn't ultimately her leadership that led to the liberation of the tribes? Elderflower turned his head slightly so that Sweetwater couldn't see him roll his eyes. Certainly, he had no reason to believe that the new version of the pageant was more historically accurate. Historical accuracy had been something of a minor concern for the hearts-warming pageant for centuries, possibly since the actual passing of the ponies responsible for Equestria's founding. Obviously, a historically accurate recreation of the events that led to Equestria's founding would have been far too large and elaborate to occupy a simple stage. Thus, what truly mattered was the message of harmony between the three tribes, which had driven off the Wendigos. Of course, what mattered in the eyes of those like Sweetwater was that the necessary corollary to that message was that some ponies were more harmonious than others. But to Elderflower, it was all so much window dressings. If Twilight Sparkle wished to reduce her own character's role to better showcase the characters from the other tribes, then who was he to object? If anything, it showed she had a gift for bending the message behind the pageant to suit her purposes. Elderflower believed he could turn that skill in a more useful and important direction. The two nobles making their way towards the carriage were an odd couple, to say the least, made even odder by the overall context of their association. Sweetwater had recently suffered severe humiliation when, in an attempt to gain influence over Twilight Sparkle, she had arranged for the younger sister of the now former head of the Department of Full Protections to be detained at her estate in Diamond Mountain. The humiliation had come when Dawn Lightwing, the colt whose home life hung in the balance of Sweetwater's manipulations, went to Diamond Mountain to rescue the captive mare. In the ensuing battle, there had been severe damage to the historic estate, which had been carved from the bedrock of the mountain itself. Such damage could not simply be fixed and hidden away, and Sweetwater had become an object of pity and scorn as a consequence. But that was not what made their relationship odd. What was truly the oddity of the pair's interactions was that Elderflower had been the one behind said humiliation. It had been Elderflower's agent, one Pearlin Bluestreak, who had informed Dawn of Sweetwater's machinations and had then gone with Dawn to assist in the captive's recovery. Sweetwater knew it too. After all, Elderflower had told her as much himself, which only served to make their relationship all the stranger. Nonetheless, while Elderflower suspected that Sweetwater hadn't forgiven him for his actions and that she would seek her retribution when she thought the time was right, for the time being, she was an ally who held the same objectives he did. When they reached the carriage, Elderflower courteously held out a hoof to help her in before climbing in himself. They settled onto separate seats that allowed them to face one another. So now what? She asked irritably. For now we wait, said Elderflower. I'm certain that, after the events of the previous few months, Twilight Sparkle is plenty leery of nobles approaching her. I need to find the appropriate time to make my presentation. She will be in Canterlot for another week, so we have a great deal of time at our disposal. Sweetwater glared. And you think you can just talk her into agreeing with us just like that? Elderflower gave his erstwhile ally a smug smile. Twilight Sparkle is, amongst other things, a dedicated academic. If our plan is presented to her on a foundation of sound reasoning and secure logic, she will see its appeal and support it to the fullest, especially if it is properly phrased. We'll see, said Sweetwater, but I remain doubtful. Is your contingency nearly ready? The Baron nodded. My agent is almost in place, and I am certain that, should my attempts to convince Twilight Sparkle to cooperate fail, then we can resort to the more drastic measures. I pray for all our sakes that you do not bungle this, growled Sweetwater. You have no reason for concern, said Elderflower, his smirk growing. Awesome, crowed Rainbow, fluttering upwards to get a better look at the dining room table. Look at this spread. Rainbow dash, get down here right now, scolded Fluttershy. You know it's impolite to fly in the dining room. "Kay," said Rainbow with a petulant sigh as she lowered herself to the floor. The food does look amazing, observed Twilight. Indeed, the ponies who had spent the day preparing the meal had outdone themselves. The table was practically groaning under the weight of countless dishes. 3 massive bowls of salad dominated the center, each one a different variety. They jostled for position with large casseroles, still steaming from having just come out of the ovens. Also prepared were a selection of savory pot pies, each one small enough for an individual pony's consumption. Freshly baked biscuits were heaped on a large platter, complete with pots of honey and a boat of gravy for toppings. Finally, a mid-sized cauldron of bubbling vegetable soup waited at one end. The various aromas wafting about the room tantalized the nostrils and set mouths to watering as every pony took their seats. Ooh, this all looks so scrumptioumptious, squealed Pinkie Pie as she rubbed her hooves together excitedly. You all did a really great job. Thanks so much. Turning, she wrapped Mayweather in an enthusiastic hug as the other mare blushed lightly. It's not that big a deal, said Mayweather a bit nervously. You certainly outdid yourselves, said Celestia. I wonder if any of us will have enough room for dessert. Well, the members of the group who'd been working on the meal all exchanged nervous glances. Arkenstone coughed. You see, we were a bit swamped just trying to get everything ready for dinner. And, unfortunately, we didn't have time to make anything for dessert, added Mayweather, shying away from Pinkie Pie, who almost looked heartbroken. Caramel let out an embarrassed laugh as he rubbed the back of his head. It didn't help that the two best bakers in our group were occupied. He looked over at Pinkie Pie and the empty seat where Applejack should have been sitting. Hey, where's Applejack? Red River's not here either, observed Arkenstone. Excuse me, but did I happen to hear that no pony made dessert? Arcana and Trixie came trotting into the room. Arcana moved with as much grace and poise as a professional model making her way down the runway. Several large boxes floated behind him in his magic. If that's the case, it's a good thing I brought some for us. The assembled ponies, Celestia included, stared wide-eyed at the svelte stallion. You made that? Asked a baffled Arkenstone, whose eyes were just as wide as anyone else's. It was Trixie who answered as she let out a dismissive snort. Of course not. My brother can't bake to save his life. He bought these cakes from a bakery yesterday. Oh, said every pony at once. Arcana didn't seem to be fazed by Trixie's revelation, merely continuing to a table set up off to the side of the room and setting the boxes down. Arkenstone drew a foreleg across his forehead. Phew, for a moment, I was afraid that stallion had no weaknesses. Twilight smiled slyly as she elbowed him in the side. You mean, aside from his personality? Yes, agreed Arkenstone readily, aside from that. Arcana chuckled. You would count my personality as a weakness. He and Trixie took their own seats. Looking around, Arcana also noticed the empty places at the table. We seem to be a few ponies short. AJ's bringin' something special, said Apple Bloom as she and Spike grinned eagerly at each other, apparently sharing a private joke. A minute later, every pony else learned why as Applejack and Red River arrived. Sorry to keep y'all waitin'. Red and I had to get these from Maroom. The pair of them were carrying a single massive barrel each. Said barrels were almost as large as the ponies carrying them, but Applejack and Red River bore the strain with only minimal difficulty as they carried their loads to the room. Twilight quickly jumped to help them, using her magic to lift the barrels off the backs of the two earth ponies and set them down on the table next to the boxed cakes. Rainbow's eyes went wide as she stared at the two barrels. Is that? Yep, said Applejack, smiling smugly, that there's the first batch of winter silk cider pressed on Sweet Apple Acres right before we came up to Canterlot. Y'all are gonna be the first ponies to get a taste. So awesome, said Rainbow, her tongue lolling as she stared at the barrels. At the sound of her friends, even Scootaloo, giggling, Rainbow managed to reassert control over herself and pull her tongue back in. So, AJ, bring any of the hard stuff. Applejack shook her head. Sorry to disappoint ya Sugarcube, but the first batch, hard cider ain't gonna be ready for another couple, weeks. It's gotta ferment, ya know. Besides, this first batch is just the test batch. We need to see if the winter silks'll make good cider on their own or if we need to blend them with some other apples to get a better product. Groaned Rainbow, earning a chuckle from Applejack. Don't ya worry your head Sugarcube, she said, I promise I'll let ya be one, ma taste testers. The disappointment melted away as Rainbow broke out into a silly grin. Best job, ever. Each place set at the table included a tall stemmed beverage glass, though only the adults got wine goblets to go along with those glasses. Twilight lifted them all in her magic and floated the glasses over to the barrels, which Applejack had already set spigots into. She filled each of the glasses in turn before returning them to their places. As her own glass hovered in front of her, Twilight found herself staring in surprise at the liquid contained within. This is unfiltered, right? Applejack nodded definitively. Course it is. Wouldn't be cider otherwise. It certainly didn't look that way. The liquid resting in the glasses was crystal clear, resembling nothing so much as clear spring water. Amazing, said Twilight, so this is what winter silk cider looks like. We were mighty surprised too, the first time we saw it, said Bloom as Spike nodded in agreement. Celestia cleared her throat. Well then, before we try the new cider, I propose a toast. Taking her glass and hoof, she raised it up. The others followed suit. To another year of friendship and harmony, for those here with us and those precious ones who are absent. Every pony nodded solemnly before raising their glasses to their lips and taking their first sips of the winter silk cider. Silence descended on the dining room as every pony mulled over the taste of the unfamiliar drink. Wow, exclaimed Apple Bloom. After the first gulp, she'd been unable to resist draining her glass down. It really is amazing, said Spike, nodding in agreement. I had no idea cider could taste like this. The others nodded in agreement, some of them still swirling the drink around in their mouths and savoring its flavor. It was incredibly sweet but counterbalanced with a refreshing crispness that kept the sweet flavor from becoming too overwhelming. It all flowed effortlessly down the throat with each gulp, a refreshing taste that seemed to chase away the fatigue that had built up over the course of the day. This is the best cider ever, gasped Rainbow as she put her own glass down on the table, letting out a sigh of contentment. Applejack chuckled at her friend's enthusiasm. I'm glad y'all like it Sugarcube. Every pony drink up, there's plenty more where that came from. Huh, mused Don, looking down at the drink swirling about in his own glass. I'm surprised you have so much. There can't have been that many apples. Actually the winter silk harvest was really big, said Spike, especially for such a small orchard. It's only about half as big as the Zap Apple orchard, but the output at least matched the apple's last Zap Apple harvest. Not only that, added Bloom, but winter silk apples give up a ton of juice, so we got a barrels and barrels, cider to work with and we ain't even pressed all them yet. Rainbow was already rushing over to refill her glass. As she got back to the table, Fluttershy smiled at every pony. I know the cider is delicious, but our friends worked really hard to help prepare this wonderful dinner. Let's enjoy it. Well said Fluttershy, said Celestia, nodding in agreement. They paused when Trixie raised a tentative hoof. I was meaning to ask earlier, but isn't it rude to start without Princess Luna? Indeed, said Arcana, and what about Miss Rarity and her sister? Oh, said Celestia, raising a hoof to her mouth, I'm afraid they won't be joining us tonight. You see, Luna and Rarity have other plans and Sweetie Belle will be joining them. joining them where? Asked Scootaloo, who realized that Spike, Apple Bloom, Applejack, and Red River were all sporting suspiciously knowing looks. By now they should be nearly back to Ponyville, said Celestia. Ponyville. Flaxseed stared down at his much-vaunted hearts-warming Eve dinner. It was nothing special, just a basic creamy hay and mushroom casserole he'd cobbled together. Even without having to taste it, he could tell he hadn't gotten it quite right. The top was a little bit burnt, while the inside appeared to still be slightly runny. But at least it's edible, he thought as he lowered his fork into the bowl, the casserole not holding up well on a plate, and lifting another mouthful out. All told, it didn't taste too bad. He could even say, without any reservation, that it tasted quite good. It's better than some of the other things I've tried. Years spent on the run had given Flaxseed very little time to refine his cooking skills. He'd also rarely had the money to spend on ingredients and had been forced to work quite frugally in previous years. Even now, he felt more than a little guilty about the number of ingredients he'd used up in the creation of this dish. Certainly, though Rarity had said that he was more than welcome to help himself to the food in the icebox, he still couldn't help but feel he was overindulging. I made too much, he said finally, realizing that there was more than he could eat by himself. Perhaps that's just as well, darling. Flaxseed jumped upright and spun about to see Rarity standing poised in the door to the kitchen. Rarity, what are you doing here? Me too, exclaimed Sweetie Belle, bounding into the room and stopping in front of Flaxseed before carefully wrapping her forelegs around one of his own. We thought it would be fun to spend the night here with you so that you can have a hearts-warming with friends. But you were in Canterlot. Flaxseed tried as hard as he could to wrap his mind around the fact. The pageant went swimmingly, said Rarity calmly, you needn't worry. You see, a very good friend of ours went out of her way to bring us here so that we could spend the evening with you. She's actually been quite keen to meet you. A friend. Flaxseed couldn't help but tilt his head, trying to make sense of what Rarity just said. Indeed, said Rarity, she's just behind us and is waiting to introduce herself. Who? Flaxseed began to ask, his mouth closed with a snap at the sight of a midnight blue mare ducking her head to fit through the doorway. Princess Luna wasn't as tall as her older sister, but she was large enough to have some slight difficulties navigating portals meant for more normally sized ponies. I've been waiting for the chance to meet you, my dear little pony, said Luna, smiling as the shimmering starscape of her mane twisted around her. PPP princess, gasped Flaxseed, almost smacking his face against the floor in his eagerness to bow. Please rise, said Luna, her tone gentle. Rarity had warned her about how nervous and jumpy Flaxseed could be around unfamiliar ponies. Fortunately, Luna had an idea to help put him at ease. Slowly, the stars glittering across her mane began to fade into lighter, silvery blue. Her stature diminished until she was only just a little taller than Rarity. Does this make it easier? Flaxseed forced himself to look up. Without her magically empowered appearance, Luna looked very much akin to a normal pony, albeit one with both wings and a horn, as well as a statuesque form that would put the finest of models to shame. However, the easy and friendly smile on Luna's face did more than anything else to relax the gold-colored stallion. It's an honor to meet you, princess, said Flaxseed, still stammering a little in spite of himself. Please call me Luna, said Luna, if any pony, you are probably one of the few who I feel has more than earned the right to call me by name. I'm not sure I understand, said Flaxseed. Luna's smile faded, replaced by a slightly guilty look. I am aware of your condition and how you have suffered for it. She closed her eyes and frowned darkly. When she opened them again, her eyes had turned turquoise and now sported cat-like pupils. Why you? Gasped Flaxseed. Luna nodded. Though I was not aware of it until recently, I am the pony from whom the cult Solar's name for your condition originated, as well as the stigma that goes with it. For that, I can't begin to apologize enough. She closed her eyes again and, upon reopening them, now looked normal to Flaxseed. I don't think it's your fault, said Flaxseed, averting his gaze slightly, not sure how to respond to this situation. Of course it isn't, said Rarity, interjecting herself back into the conversation. If anything, it's the fault of those beastly cultists. But enough about such grim topics. Let's enjoy dinner together. This a time for family. She pulled the delighted Sweetie up against her side. Dot and friends. She nodded to both Flaxseed and Luna. To truly revel in one another's company. Yay, squealed Sweetie, rushing past the table to the cupboards where she got out additional plates and silverware to set the table. Luna quickly moved to help her while Rarity made her way to Flaxseed, who was looking completely stunned. You didn't have to, he said softly. I didn't, said Rarity, raising her forelegs and wrapping them around the stallion to pull him into a warm embrace, but I wanted to. What kind of friend would I be if I allowed some pony I care so much about to spend hearts warming by himself? Turning her head, she planted a quick kiss on Flaxseed's cheek before drawing back and looking at him, her cheeks faintly blushing. Flaxseed was blushing too, gently raising a hoof to the cheek Rarity had just kissed. How long has it been, he idly wondered, since some pony did that to me? Certainly not since. He shuddered and forced himself to stop thinking about that. That line of thought would only lead him back into misery on a night where these three ponies had done so much to make it special for him. Rarity giggled softly before going to join her sister and Luna in helping to set 3 additional places at the table. Flaxseed felt a little guilty that all he had to offer was the crummy casserole he'd baked up. But at least it won't go to waste. The table set, they all gathered round and loaded up their plates. Just before they were about to eat, Rarity stiffened, her ears going up. Oh my, I almost forgot. She left her place and trotted out of the kitchen, returning a minute later while towing a small keg in her magic. Applejack was kind enough to spare some for us to bring back here. I believe that there would be no more appropriate time to share it. With that, Rarity filled their glasses with the winter silk cider she'd brought back from Canterlot. Everything ready, the 4 of them settled down to what was probably one of the most frugal and simple hearts-warming dinners that 3 of them had ever tried before, though for Flaxseed, it seemed the richest, most satisfying meal he'd had in years. Wow, I feel like I'm gonna explode, said Caramel, patting a slightly distended belly as he Fluttershy and Don made their way to the guest suite they'd been assigned to for the duration of their stay in the palace. Don nodded his agreement, feeling rather drowsy after eating far more than he was used to. There had been so many delicious and savory things to try that he had found himself unable to even think about the possibility of dessert, had he been inclined towards any to begin with. Wow, this is so much fun, said Scootaloo, almost seeming no worse for wear after the large meal she'd enjoyed, along with plenty of dessert. Only the faint downwards twitch of her eyelids betrayed the fact that she was drowsy as well. What should we do next? I think that would be quite clear, said Melon Cream, scooping up her daughter and depositing the filly onto her back. It's bedtime, young lady. Ah moom, groaned Scootaloo. Come now, said Melon, you'll want to get up bright and early tomorrow. After all, you have presents to open. Oh, said Scootaloo, her annoyance vanishing, that's right. Let's go. Laughing at her daughter's antics, Melon trotted off towards their own suite. Fluttershy, Caramel, and Dawn watched them go. Fluttershy couldn't help but giggle at the sight, gently rubbing up against Caramel's side, nuzzling cheek to cheek with him as they saw the mother and daughter duo off. After dinner had ended and as they'd passed the remainder of the evening trading stories and singing carols, Fluttershy had gradually grown more and more affectionate with Caramel, often nuzzling and kissing his cheek or running the feathers of her wing across his back. The latter had actually made Caramel shiver from the pleasant contact, although he'd felt more than a little unnerved by the smug, knowing look Rainbow Dash had been giving him every time Fluttershy had done that. Come on, said Caramel, slowly nudging Dawn and Fluttershy towards their own suite's door. I think we're ready for bed too. Dawn was interrupted by his mouth stretching into a yawn. Have to agree. Caramel ruffled the colt's mane fondly. How did you like your first real hearts-warming eve? He asked. It was amazing, said Dawn. After so many wonderful moments spent with his new family, he couldn't imagine that he'd ever feel more fulfilled or content. And yet, on this night, he'd experienced just that. I'm so glad, said Fluttershy, kissing her son on the forehead. Dawn paused and turned to nuzzle up to both his parents. Fluttershy and Caramel wrapped their arms around him. I love you, he said. I love you too, said Fluttershy. Me too, added Caramel. Good night, whispered Fluttershy, giving her son one last kiss on the tip of his nose. Dawn retreated to his own room to get ready for bed as Fluttershy and Caramel retired to theirs. Caramel finished first given that he only had to brush her teeth. Fluttershy took a little bit longer on account of having to preen her wings. In the meantime, Caramel banked the fireplace in their room to keep it warm throughout the night. The wards would keep any stray sparks from escaping, allowing them to sleep safely. The sound of the bathroom door opening prompted Caramel to turn around. His jaw dropped at the sight that awaited him. Fluttershy stood there. Her mane had been combed down so that the front part of it hung over one eye. With her remaining visible eye, Fluttershy smiled sweetly at him, tilting her head adorably, with one forehoof raised slightly off the floor as she reclined casually against the frame of the door. At first, it had seemed that Fluttershy had stepped back into her old, shy, retiring self. However, as she stepped forward, moving smoothly and confidently, Caramel felt his heart start to race. Sweet Celestia, she looks so beautiful like that. Any other thoughts trying to make their way through Caramel's head were abruptly cut off as Fluttershy closed in and pressed her lips against his. To his shock, she didn't stop there, continuing to push forward, forcing Caramel back until his haunches connected with the side of the bed. Following her lead, Caramel climbed onto bed, allowing Fluttershy to do the same. She'd barely gotten off the floor before she pounced on him once again, pushing Caramel down onto his back, kissing him with even more passion than before. Her tongue snaked out of her mouth, lightly teasing his lips. Caramel quickly moved to oblige her, opening his own mouth and gently twisting his tongue around hers. Not wasting any time, Caramel quickly wrapped his arms around Fluttershy to pull her closer, triggering a breathy moan as his hooves pressed down against the joints of his wings, where they joined with her shoulders. In the meantime, Fluttershy's wings began to twitch, sending her feathers dancing up and down her stallion's sides, the light tickling causing Caramel to twitch and grunt, even as his tongue continued to dance with hers. Finally, they had to pull away to breathe. Caramel stared up at Fluttershy as she panted lightly above him. Once again, he was overwhelmed by that desperate feeling to hold her and never let go. Caramel, whispered Fluttershy, I love you. I know, said Caramel, raising a hoof up to lightly stroke Fluttershy's cheek. I'm so lucky to be able to share my life with some pony like you. Lowering herself down, Fluttershy planted a soft, long kiss on Caramel's lips. The passion was still there, but it now simmered away behind honest affection as their kiss transitioned into a loving nuzzle. Caramel, said Fluttershy, her voice going almost impossibly quiet, I think I'm ready. Caramel's eyes went wide as he met Fluttershy's gaze. Are you sure? Fluttershy nodded slowly. You mean so much to me. You mean so much to Dawn. Ever since we've started living together, it's gotten to the point where I couldn't imagine living on our own without you. I don't want to think of what it would be like to wake up without you there. I want to fall asleep with you holding me and I want to see your face when I wake up. So, leaning down, she began to plant gentle, feathering kisses along Caramel's neck. Quote. I'm ready. I want to share everything with you. Listening to Fluttershy's words slowly made Caramel realize that he felt the same way. Both Fluttershy and Dawn were precious to him. After spending so long living as a bachelor, he'd once, a long time ago, worried that he might have found living with them would be a chore, something he'd have to put up with. However, he couldn't have been more wrong and he was glad that he had been so wrong. Recently, he'd been thinking about the end of winter, dreading the day when Fluttershy and Dawn would move back to their cottage on the edge of town. Thinking about how empty the house would feel without them there almost made him feel sick. He'd come to love spending the winter days with the two of them and had come to wish that those days would never end. Finally, Caramel found himself smiling. Using a hoof, he slowly lifted Fluttershy's chin, tilting her face away from his neck and turning it back towards his own so he could capture her lips in another loving kiss. If you're ready, he said finally, as he pulled away from her slightly, then so am I. Fluttershy's smile stretched across her face as she descended on him with an exuberant squeal to press her lips to his again. Caramel held her tightly as they began to go through the motions, both of them exulting in the moment that they became one as they showed their love for one another. Author's notes. And then they banged. Now you know why this story had that sex tag. That said, I have no intention of making this into clop or anything of the sort, either now or in the future. I have the feeling I wouldn't feel very good at writing it and I don't think it would jive with the rest of the series as a whole. Next chapter, Dawn gets scolded. Giving and forgiving. Chapter 21, Giving and Forgiving. Dawn's eyes opened as the first light of the sun began to stream in through the palace windows. Rolling off the side of the bed, he stretched and yawned, fanning his wings out with a few popping noises as he rolled them in their sockets. Making his way to the bathroom, Don quickly went through his usual morning routine, brushing his teeth and combing out his mane and tail. Looking at his wings, the Colt decided that he wasn't in any need of preening and made his way out into the main room of the guest suite. Looking over, he noted the door to Caramel and Fluttershy's room was still shut. That wasn't all that surprising. Even though his mother and presumptive father were no slouches when it came to waking up in the morning, Don was still the earliest riser in the family, waking up for his morning training sessions with Scootaloo. Don briefly considered going to fetch Scootaloo from the suite she and her mother were occupying. However, he figured that Scootaloo might want to sleep in, on account of the holiday, especially given how much they had eaten the night before. Even Don himself was still feeling a little sluggish, in spite of the good night's sleep he'd gotten. On reflection, Don figured that, while Scootaloo might not be up training, there was no reason he couldn't go through a few practice runs himself. He'd noted a few locations he could use during the time he'd spent exploring the palace with the others. In fact, there was at least one location that Don felt would be particularly suitable. Making his way out of the guest suite, Don trotted down the hallway in the direction of the dining room. That was where they were expected to assemble for breakfast before heading to some other room, though he couldn't be sure which one, to open their presents. In between the guest suites and the dining room was a second, relatively large, open room. The room itself was devoid of any normal furnishings and was probably one of many just like it, large rooms that could be set up to serve any of a variety of purposes depending on the needs of whoever was using it. Given that there was plenty of space, the room was perfect for Don's purposes. Stepping into the center of the room, Don spread his wings halfway and took a deep breath, holding it for a moment before letting it back out. With his breath, he let all his extraneous thoughts and feelings bleed out into the ether, until nothing remained within but silence. For several minutes, Don simply basked in that stillness, allowing it to settle and center him, relaxing him mind, body, and soul. Finally, he went into motion, beginning with the steps of the first form, flowing smoothly from one technique to the next, the only sound accompanying the ruffling of his feathers being the tap of his hooves against the marble floor. After the first came the second, then the third, and so on, until Don had moved through every single one of his forms, returning to his usual resting position. Taking a moment, Don centered himself once again. Then he began to go through the forms a second time. This time, he put just a sliver of his magic into the motions, just enough to stir the air around his feathers to life, creating whirls, vortexes, and mild breezes that only barely resembled the devastating techniques that they were when unleashed with the full force of his strength behind them. Once again, Don went through all of his forms before settling down and relaxing, taking another deep breath and sinking once again into the stillness of his meditation. As he came out of his mediation, the faint ghost of a smile played across Don's face. "Enjoy the show?" he asked as he turned towards the door, easily spotting the orange earth pony mare, who had taken off her Stetson in what seemed to be a gesture of respect for what she was watching. Applejack hadn't made any particular effort to hide the fact that she had been watching Don. In fact, she was certain that he'd known that she was there the moment she passed by the door, possibly before. "I'd have to say it's a mighty fine thing to watch," she admitted. It was the first time she'd ever really seen Don go through his forms. The beautiful, flowing motions were amazing to watch, and Applejack had easily found herself mesmerized. In those minutes, she could see the years of effort and honest hard work that Don had put into his own training. That kind of mastery had nothing to do with talent and inclination, just hours upon days upon years of constant training and devoted effort. Applejack could understand that kind of dedication perfectly well. After all, it was the same kind of dedication she had put into maintaining her family's farm. But that understanding made a pang of guilt shoot through her system. How could I have ever doubted this boy? She remembered perfectly well how she'd reacted the first time she had met him. She remembered the vacant, neutral expression he'd worn when she'd thrown insults and threats at him, everything she had said being nothing he hadn't heard before. Most of all, she remembered what he had done when she finally apologized for her foolishness. She remembered seeing the cold, stoic Colt break down into tears and cling tightly to Fluttershy. Swallowing hard, Applejack stepped closer to the Colt, feeling a bit surprised when Don didn't so much as flinch at her approach. "Don," she said. "Yes." Applejack took a deep breath to calm her nerves. "I know I said it to ya once before, but I feel like I need to say it again. I'm sorry." Her body began to shake. "I'm so sorry fair how I treated ya. Ya didn't deserve any, oh that, but I tried to drive ya out, tried to." She couldn't bring herself to finish that sentence. "And I know I said it before, but I forgive you," said Don, moving closer to her. "There is no need to continue apologizing." Applejack's sense of guilt made her take a step back. "I know, but it don't seem right to me. I did something terrible wrong and all I could do to make up for it was say a few words. I don't feel like I've atoned at all." Don glanced upward at the skylights. The low angle of the sun meant that the light was not yet streaming down into the room just yet. However, just enough light seeped down to provide illumination. "My master gave me my name to remind me that each day is a new beginning." Huh. Applejack blinked and sat down, surprised by the sudden tangent. No matter what happened before, dawn comes inevitably, and with it the promise of a new day. Don looked down from the skylights, his eyes, which had once been the source of the conflict between the two of them, drifted down to meet Applejack's own emerald gaze. The past is the past. What has happened has happened. We have each done things that we regret. But no matter how much we might wish otherwise, we cannot change that. Applejack couldn't help but chuckle at Don's words. She certainly knew that to be the truth. After all, Twilight Sparkle had tried once. It hadn't exactly gone well for her. Even this day, hearts warming, comes near the eve of the year's end. Though winter can be cold and bitter, it is filled with the promise of the spring to come after. He smiled warmly up at Applejack as he stepped closer. We can spend our lives wallowing in the winter of our misdeeds, or we can learn to look beyond them to the spring to come. Applejack sniffed as Don gently pressed up against her. Slowly, she reached out and pulled the colt into a warm embrace. Her master tell ya that too? Don nodded against her. He did. He told me that because he didn't want me to dwell on my past mistakes or the mistakes of others. He nuzzled in a bit tighter to Applejack. So even though our beginning was so rocky, I don't want you to waste your time on atonement you do not need. I would much rather that we were friends now. Applejack smiled. Sure thing, Sugar Cube. She gently nuzzled the top of Don's head. After letting go, Don looked curiously at Applejack. May I ask what you're doing up so early? Applejack simply shrugged in response. Same as you. I'm too used to rising early to change my habits now. I'm pretty sure Bloom ain't gonna be far behind me. Farm life'll do that to ya. Don nodded. If you'll excuse me, I'd like to get a little more practice in before breakfast. Sure thing, said Applejack with a smile, taking her leave of the colt. As the sound of her hooves faded into silence, Don glanced around furtively. You can come out now. Slowly and soundlessly, a dark gray mare made her way out from the far corner of the room, where the shadows had been at their deepest. Her dark coat had allowed her to blend in seamlessly, making her all but invisible to Applejack. Don eyed Shadesteel curiously. So, what can I do for you? Shadesteel looked vaguely out of place. Her collar was the only thing she was presently wearing. Don suspected that she, like the rest of the palace staff, had hearts warming off. However, Shadesteel wasn't permitted to leave the premises, so was unable to go and visit her own family. Don felt a twinge of sympathy for her. Certainly, she had made her own bed and would now have to lie in it. But after having spent so long without family of his own, he could imagine how empty she must have felt inside to not be able to see hers. I just wanted to say, Shade sighed and looked away, unable to meet Don's eyes for too long. Even if she realized her mistakes, she still felt on a certain, visceral level, that the colt's eyes were unnatural, which made them unsettling to look at. Don appeared unfazed by her pause, simply watching patiently as he waited for her to speak again. I'm sorry, said Shade finally, I was wrong, about you, about Princess Luna, about everything, I guess. Is that what you genuinely believe? Asked Don. Huh. The colt simply shrugged. While I would be happy to accept your apology, I would rather go without if you felt as though you were forced to by the princesses or my friends. That's why I'm asking, do you really believe that you were wrong? Well, once again, Shade looked away. The feeling of Don's eyes on her made her flesh crawl. I don't want to believe that Princess Celestia is lying about her sister or you. I believe her, but, at the same time, changing long-held feelings isn't such a simple matter, suggested Don, getting an idea of where she was going. Even if you understand it in your head, your heart still rejects both me and Luna. Looking deeply ashamed, Shade nodded. I understand, said Don. After all, he'd had similar experiences. When Fluttershy had first taken him in, he'd had difficulty trusting her. Even when he'd been first introduced to her friends, even when he had started going to school, he'd been on pins and needles, waiting constantly for the other hoof to drop, even though he'd rationally understood that he could trust them. It had taken a few weeks to simply stop flinching whenever Fluttershy had tried to initiate any kind of physical contact. And, even then, those feelings had surfaced recently during the whole fiasco with full protections. Even though Don had understood, on a rational level, that Fluttershy would never betray or abandon him, his heart had still reacted to that initial feeling. I accept your apology, said Don finally, prompting a sharp intake of breath from Shade. But, you just saw the moment I had with Applejack, Don pointed out. She tried to drive me out of Ponyville the first time she met me. The second time, she actually tried to kill me and ended up breaking a wing and some of my ribs. Shade's jaw dropped. But Princess Celestia helped her to see the error of her ways as well. I forgave her then and we are friends now. He gave her a slight smirk. I suppose that one of the perks of having several different ponies try to kill you is that the act itself loses its emotional impact over time. However, there is one pony who needs an apology from you much more than I do. Shade swallowed, having a very good idea of exactly which pony Don was talking about. Which is why, Don continued, when you finish your sentence to the princess's satisfaction, I expect you to come to Ponyville first thing, and deliver your apology to her. I will accept your apology on that condition. Slowly, Shade nodded. I will. Don smiled at her. Thank you. He paused to think for a moment. I'm guessing you're probably one of the only ponies besides us in the palace. Maybe you could join us for breakfast. I'm not sure that's such a good idea, said Shade, with good reason. After all, while Don had forgiven her rather easily, she had a hard time believing that his friends and family would give up their grudge, especially Don's filly friend, considering the sheer ferocity with which she had been glaring at Shade earlier. I understand that the others might have an issue with it, said Don, but I've gotten the impression that no pony should truly be alone on this holiday. But, if you'd rather not, I understand. Shade thought quite hard about it. I'll accept, she said finally. Though she was nervous, the fact that Don himself would be vouching for her presence would probably protect her from any overt hostility. She was genuinely moved by the colt's willingness to forgive her. Don smiled. Well, let's go then. Shade nodded and the two of them set off for the dining room. Caramel's eyes fluttered slightly before drifting open. The faint smile he'd fallen asleep with only stretched as the blurry yellow figure in front of him slowly swam into focus. Fluttershy lay across from him, still wrapped securely in his arms, still fast asleep. If any pony had bothered to look in the room, it would have been obvious to them that the couple had engaged in some rather intense activities the night before. Fluttershy's mane and tail were severely tangled and mussed from the pair of them rolling back and forth across the bed. Likewise, her feathers were ruffled and her coat was matted in places. However, that only made her look all the more beautiful to Caramel's eyes. Part of him still couldn't believe that they'd made love to each other the previous night. I guess I should probably start looking into getting a necklace, he thought. He figured that their courtship had been rather brief as these things went. But more than ever, he was sure of his feelings towards both Fluttershy and Don. He wanted to truly be Fluttershy's mate and he wanted to be Don's father. The thought of going all the way actually made his heart skip a beat as he pulled the mare a little more tightly against him. The slight motion seemed to stir Fluttershy into wakefulness as her eyes slowly blinked open and she regarded him sleepily. Good morning, she whispered before letting out a cute yawn and returning to smiling bashfully at him. Good morning, Caramel returned before leaning in to plant a soft kiss on her lips, which Fluttershy gladly returned. How do you feel? Fluttershy's hind legs flexed a little. Their first time had been painful for her when Caramel had taken her virginity. Even though it had been extremely pleasurable after the pain had faded, the vigor with which she and Caramel had consummated their love for each other had left her feeling a bit sore in certain places. But still, she figured that she wouldn't be limping when she finally got out of bed. I'm fine, I guess, she said, darting forward to kiss him again. Thank you for last night. If I recall, said Caramel with a wry smirk, it was your idea. So I should be the one thanking you. His words prompted Fluttershy's cheeks to flush pink as she shyly looked away from him. The expression made her look so cute that Caramel desperately wanted to kiss her again. So he did. This time, his tongue darted out to her lips to tease her lightly before retracting. Her blush intensifying, Fluttershy gave Caramel a longing look as he pulled away again. For a moment, it seemed as though they were about to start up another session of lovemaking until Fluttershy noticed the clock. Oh no, we'll be late for breakfast if we don't get up soon. Caramel couldn't help but chuckle at the urgency in her voice and gently began to run his hooves up and down her back, the gentle rubbing motion helping to calm her down. It'll be fine, he said. I don't think we need to worry too much about being late. It's heartwarming after all. I guess that's true, admitted Fluttershy, leaning in so that she could tuck her head under Caramel's chin and nuzzle into his chest, but we probably shouldn't keep them waiting for too long. That's true, admitted Caramel, but we can at least rest a little longer. Yeah, agreed Fluttershy, closing her eyes and inhaling deeply, taking in the sweet scent of her stallion. The two of them relaxed and drifted off to sleep again. In the dining room, Dawn waited patiently, along with Apple Bloom. At present, the two of them were the only ponies in the room, with no sign of anyone else in sight. Applejack and Shade had gone to the kitchen, where they were quickly joined by Red River. No pony else was awake just yet, which meant that Dawn and Bloom, more or less, had the room to themselves. Both Applejack and Bloom had been shocked to see Dawn enter with Shadesteal walking beside him. However, given Applejack's own circumstances, she was quick to accept the former guardsmare's apology, given that they were in the same boat. Still, Dawn was a little bit worried about the responses of every pony else. Scootaloo in particular had not struck him as being especially forgiving. True to form, when Scootaloo arrived in the dining room followed by her mother, her eyes nearly leapt out of her head at the sight of Shade. What is she doing here? I invited her, said Dawn levelly as Shade cringed and shifted slightly to hide herself behind Applejack. It was a bit odd to see the once confident and determined ex-guardsmare behave like a quailing filly, or Dawn's mother for that matter. You what? Gasped Scootaloo, whirling to stare at Dawn in shock, after what she did. Dawn nodded levelly. She apologized and I accepted. I invited her because her only other option was to be by herself today. None of the other members of the palace staff are in. But she deserves it, snapped Scootaloo. Dawn, she nearly killed you. She stabbed you through the leg and you almost bled out. If we hadn't gotten to you in time. Tears started to stream down her cheeks. You can't fix that with an apology. She sharply pointed a hoof at Shade, who looked like she was about to cry herself. All of the ponies in the room were clearly torn between admonishing Scootaloo for her harsh words and agreeing with what she was saying. Only Applejack could count herself on Shade's side in the matter, given what she had done. But, at the same time, Applejack didn't feel remotely qualified to speak out against Scootaloo. I'm leaving, declared Scootaloo, throwing one last angry, tearful glare at Shade. I'm not going to sit down to breakfast with a murderer. Her hooves clicked harshly against the marble floor as she stomped out. Melon stared out after her daughter. I don't know if I should try to bring her back or go with her, she said finally. Let me speak with her, said Dawn. Shade's voice quivered as she struggled to find the words. She's not wrong. I tried to kill you. As simple, I'm sorry, can't make up for that. Dawn looked at her and shrugged. A lot of ponies have tried to kill me. Some came closer than others, just as you did. But it isn't about making up for what you've done. I don't believe that forgiveness is some sort of currency to be exchanged for something. You asked my forgiveness and I gave it. It's as simple as that. He sighed. I need to talk to Scootaloo. He fixed Shade with an intense gaze that would not allow her to turn away. You stay put. With that, he set off at a brisk trot after Scootaloo. Finding her didn't prove all that difficult. Scootaloo hadn't gone all that far when Dawn set off after her. Her anger made it even easier to follow as she agitated the air aggressively with her passage, the swirling currents leaving a trail that stood out clearly to Dawn's wind sense. Scootaloo had stopped, having apparently worked herself up into such an angry frenzy that she'd run out of breath. She was glaring fiercely out the window, staring down at the snow-covered valley below. From this vantage point, she could even make out Ponyville in the distance. Her eyes drifted upwards to the cloud-covered skies, which were delivering a special light snow on Hearth's warming day. Her eyes stung a bit and she wiped fiercely at them to clear away the tears. But more quickly came in their place. Nonetheless, she wasn't so lost in her emotions that she failed to notice that Dawn was behind her. I'm not going back, she declared with an almost haughty determination. No matter what you say, I am not eating in the same room as that mare. Is it really that important? Asked Dawn, feeling a bit confused by the sheer scale of Scootaloo's rage. He had never seen her this furious. Of course it is, she snapped. You don't get it because you're only thinking about yourself. Dawn's jaw dropped and hit the floor. What? He wasn't sure he could even begin to wrap his ears around what Scootaloo was saying. Because she was trying to kill you, it's your call to forgive her, snarled Scootaloo. I don't buy that for a second. Do you have any idea what it was like for me and Fluttershy, huh? She whirled around, glaring at Dawn even as still more tears ran down her face. We thought you were gonna die. It was like that time with Red River and Stormfront all over again. Only, this wasn't some kind of test or weird martial arts style psychology treatment. That mare really was trying to kill you and she nearly succeeded. You think it's okay because she ultimately didn't, because it was your life on the line. But it's not okay at all. I nearly lost you. She was screaming now. You were there in that cave bleeding all over the floor. Even when Storm put that bandage on you, it was still leaking before we'd even got into the air. We flew as fast as we possibly could to get you to the hospital in time, but even then I was afraid that we hadn't made it. The doctor told us that you were out of danger, that you just needed to rest. But when I looked at you, all I could think about was just how close he had been to telling us the opposite, that it would be the last time I would get to see you before your funeral, that the only thing I would be able to do was say goodbye. She was sobbing openly now. Dawn wrapped his arms around her shoulders and pulled her into a tight hug, simply sitting as she continued to sob. When I saw your eyes open after that, she said, I was so relieved because all night, all I could think about was what it would be like if we couldn't train together anymore, if I didn't get to learn anything else from you, if I never got to hold you, if I never got to kiss you again, if I would never see your eyes again. She pulled away just enough to look Dawn in the eyes. Fluttershy felt the same way, but she didn't want me to get even more upset on her account. Her hoof thudded against his chest. That's why you don't get it. You think that, when you go out and fight some pony, as long as you're the only one in danger of getting killed, it's alright that nothing else matters. But you're wrong. She leaned in again, pressing her forehead against Dawn's shoulder. If Fluttershy and I lost you, can you even begin to imagine how much it would hurt, not just us but Caramel, Mom, Rainbow Dash, Apple Bloom, Sweetie Belle, Twilight, Arkenstone, Red, Storm, Applejack, Ditzy, even Dinky. That's why I'm mad. Shadesteel didn't just hurt you. She hurt all of us. She terrified all of us and she would have actually been proud of herself if she'd actually done it. She apologized to you, but what has she done to apologize to the rest of us to show that she understands just how badly she hurt every pony? Dawn was silent, mulling over Scootaloo's words. Her angry rant had driven home how selfish he had been. It was the same selfishness that had almost prompted him to leave Ponyville after Willow's attack that had driven him to go face Stormfront and Red River for his execution. Every time he had left them behind on some kind of life-risking venture, whether to Cloudsdale or Diamond Mountain, he had been selfish, putting his life at risk without thinking about how those left behind would suffer if anything had happened to him. Having friends and loved ones is so much more complicated than I thought. Finally, he found the words to say. You're right, I'm sorry. He nuzzled Scootaloo's cheek. I wasn't thinking about that at all. I should have been. I'm so sorry for scaring and worrying you. Why you should be, said Scootaloo with a sniff. Even though I know how you feel now, I can't promise that I won't go and put my life at risk again, he said softly. I know, she whispered back, I wouldn't ask you to do that. But even then, I want you to think about how we feel. I want you to try your hardest to keep living, to not just give up and let some wound that some pony else gave you end you. I want you to always try your hardest to come back to us. Can you do that? I will, promise Dawn, tightening his hold on Scootaloo. However, can you try to forgive Shadesteel for what she did? I don't want to, muttered Scootaloo petulantly. How can you forgive her so easily anyway? Because I know how much trouble it is to hold a grudge, said Dawn. Huh. Dawn sighed and began to gently stroke a hoof through Scootaloo's mane. Remember how I spent a year in the Everfree? When I first went in there, I was furious at the ponies who persecuted me. In truth, the reason I went into the forest was because I was coming so close to snapping and doing something I would regret for the rest of my life, something I would never be able to undo. I hated those ponies for always trying to kill me for something I had no control over. I'd always done my best to not harm any pony, to be a good colt, to not strike down even the ponies who attacked me. But it didn't matter, not to them. In a rage, I simply gave up trying, because I felt that the alternative was giving into that rage and raising a town or two with tornadoes. That would have made me into the monster they always thought I was. How could you forgive any pony for that? Asked Scootaloo. How could you ever bring yourself to come out of there again? I almost didn't, said Dawn. For a long time, I'd resigned myself to spending the rest of my life in that forest. I trained and refined my techniques because there was nothing else to do, no job to be had, no ponies to be around. That was fine to me. As far as I was concerned, the rest of Equestria could rot. For the first few months, I stewed in my anger, always thinking about those ponies that had wronged me, thinking about how much I hated them, how much I would have loved to get back at them, all while knowing that I never would. How did you get over it? Asked Scootaloo. In a sense, replied Dawn, I didn't, not until I came to Ponyville. That's the thing about holding a grudge. After a while, I realized that holding on to my hatred and wallowing in my own pain only made me tired. My anger seemed to consume everything inside me, and when it finally faded, there was nothing left. It left me feeling empty. That's exactly how I felt when I found Mom. By the time I met her, I'd given up on feeling anything ever again. I was tired, too tired to even be angry anymore, perhaps too tired to keep on living. He felt Scootaloo shudder at his words and nuzzled into the base of her mane in an attempt to provide some comfort. It was Mom and you and every pony else who drew me back. You gave me a home, a family, and friends, a reason to keep on living and trying. I learned how to feel again. But I also learned to feel anger again as well. You remember how well that went? Slowly, Scootaloo nodded against him. Dawn smiled. That's why I can't bring myself to hold a grudge against Shade, especially not after she apologized to me. Trying to stay angry with her would have only made me feel worse later. I think it'll only make you feel worse too. Scootaloo sniffed hard and pulled away from Dawn, looking into his eyes. Okay, she said, I'll try. Dawn smiled and planted a feathery kiss on her lips. That's all I can ask. Shall we go back? Sure, said Scootaloo. However, as she was about to head back to the dining room, she caught a glance of herself in the reflection of a nearby window. On second thought, let me find a bathroom. I need to wash up a little bit. As Dawn and Scootaloo trotted off, a pair of Pegasi stepped out from around the corner and watched their departure. Well, said the first one, the older of the two as she moved a hoof to brush some strands of her blue mane away from her eyes, what do you think? The other Pegasus grinned as her magenta eyes followed the two foals. I like them. The filly's got a lot of spirit, a regular firecracker. I agree. Wait, I thought we were talking about the colt. Who cares about the colt? The filly's the one that interests me. The younger mare couldn't help but grin. I heard she only started learning the Gale King a few months ago, but the way she moves. It's the colt that Arkenstone and Spitfire are talking about, said the older mare, smacking a hoof against her forehead. I still want to hear your opinion on him. The younger mare sighed in resignation. Finn, she groaned, he's not half bad. I'll give him that much. He's obviously been around the block more than a few times. From the sound of things, he's got a good head on his shoulders and his heart's in the right place. More importantly, said the elder one, his heart's in the right place, but it sounds like he's figured out how to keep from doing wrong in spite of that. Maybe, agreed the younger mare, but he's still got a ways to go. Then again, I can see why Arkenstone and Spitfire like him. I think we should let him age a few more years though. Obviously, agreed the older mare. Now, said the younger one, tell me what you think of little Scootaloo there. The older mare's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. You're right about her spirit. She certainly has a few rough edges that need to be smoothed out. But, I think she's worth looking at too. I've read the reports on her training sessions. It would seem that Dawn is being very thorough about hammering home the basics with her. If the way she moves now is any indication, that's going to pay huge dividends in the future. Time, talent, and inspiration, observed the younger mare, she's laid out a very solid foundation. If her cutie mark is any indication, it would seem that she's given herself to pursuing the path of mastery, mind, body, and soul. I say we mark both of them as perspectives and call it good. I wonder what Sunny's going to think about them. Something snarky, I'm sure, said the older mare, we'll find out soon. The younger mare couldn't restrain an amused laugh. I can't wait. After that, the two Pegasi quietly withdrew. When Scootaloo and Dawn returned, almost every pony else had arrived for breakfast. Twilight and Arkenstone were seated next to Celestia, quietly chatting. Rainbow Dash had parked herself next to Melon, staring somewhat dully at the plate in front of her. Mayweather was also waiting in her seat. Pinkie Pie was carting heaps of food back and forth from the door that led to the kitchens, helped by Red River, Spike, and Apple Bloom. Even Trixie and Arcana had arrived, the two of them waiting quietly for the meal to begin. Strangely enough, Fluttershy and Caramel were still absent. Shade was still huddled, cringing in her seat at the table under the various looks and glares being directed her way. Applejack sat next to her, occasionally giving the ex-guard's mare a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Mayweather was seated on her other side, doing much the same from her position. Shade looked up and shuddered at the sight of Scootaloo as she moved to sit down next to Melon, who regarded her daughter with a worried gaze. Scootaloo ignored her mother for the moment and instead focused her attention on Shade Steel, who quailed away from the filly's intense gaze. Scootaloo's entry seemed to signal a halt to everything going on in the room as every pony's attention was drawn by the tension crackling between her and Shade. It was Scootaloo who spoke first. You have something you need to say, she said, not just to Dawn, but to all of us. Shade glanced nervously at Applejack, then Mayweather. Both of them gave her an encouraging smile. She turned to face Scootaloo again and took a deep breath. You're right, she said. I owe every pony here an apology, not just Dawn. I am sorry for what I did. I was wrong and you have every right to hate me for it. She closed her eyes. I don't know what else to say. What else could I say? Nothing I could say could ever take back the things I did. I know that feelin', said Applejack softly. This scene was eerily familiar to her. Scootaloo took a deep breath of her own, closing her eyes. As she let it out, her body relaxed. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze was calm. I guess that'll have to be good enough, she said. I can't quite forgive you yet. I understand, said Shade softly. But I can accept Dawn forgiving you, so I won't fight him on it anymore. Scootaloo finished. Now, it's time for our hearts-warming breakfast. Where the hay are Caramel and Fluttershy? Eek. As though they had been summoned by Scootaloo's voice, Fluttershy and Caramel came bolting in through the dining room doors, preceded by Fluttershy's squeal, skidding to a stop near where Dawn was sitting. I'm sorry we're late every pony, she said between pants. Caramel and I overslept. Shade seemed to be mostly forgotten as Rainbow's eyes narrowed and she looked at Fluttershy with a sly smile. However, she kept her mouth shut for the time being. Seeing the look on Applejack and Pinkie's faces, Rainbow got the feeling she wasn't the only one who had an inkling of what Fluttershy and Caramel had been up to last night. However, they would have to wait until a more opportune time to grill Fluttershy about the juicy details. She's so lucky Rarity isn't here right now. Twilight coughed awkwardly. Why don't we go ahead and get breakfast over with? Then we can go and open the presents. Awesome, exclaimed Scootaloo, flying out of her seat, her previous anger clearly forgotten. Realizing that every pony was staring at her, the orange filly grinned sheepishly before sinking back into her seat. Breakfast, while rather simple, was both filling and delicious. Over the course of the meal, Shade managed to find time to apologize to Fluttershy and Caramel as well. She was amazed at the warmth of Fluttershy's acceptance. After they'd finished breakfast, Shade figured that she'd probably intruded enough on the hearts-warming gathering and had gone her own way. Though every pony's feelings about her were still mixed, they quickly managed to overcome their unease as they entered into one of the assembly rooms Celestia had set aside for them. The center of the room was dominated by a large potted pine tree, decorated with ornaments and streamers. Its base was crowded with wrapped packages of various shapes and sizes, some large, some small. They'd been set there by the palace servants when the group had arrived on their first day. The room even had its own guard detail to keep any of the packages from being tampered with. Don blinked as he surveyed the massive pile of presents. Even having been told about this old hearts-warming tradition, it was amazing to see such an array of colorful gifts. Even more mind-boggling was the fact that some of them were for him. The silence that had fallen over the room drew Don out of his reverie as he realized that every pony was looking at him with expectant smiles. Yes. Fluttershy told us that you haven't ever really celebrated hearts-warming before, explained Twilight, so we figured that you should get to be the first one to open a present. Don blinked and looked around, his eyes switching from one pony to another. Really? Yeah, go for it, exclaimed Scootaloo, her wings buzzing excitedly. Don turned to look at his adoptive parents, both of whom were smiling contentedly as they watched him. Fluttershy gave him a slow nod. Go ahead, she whispered. Don nodded and turned back to the pile of presents, his eyes roaming over the tags as he tried to pick out which ones were his. He was surprised when he noticed his name on one of the larger packages. This one had been done up with violet wrapping paper and pink bows. The color scheme seemed familiar to him. He had to hover off the ground to carefully lift the package off the pile. He wasn't sure if the contents inside were fragile, so he worked slowly. As he read the tag, he noted that the package was from Twilight, Arkenstone, and Spike. First Don tugged at the bow, untying the ribbon and pulling it off. After taking a moment to study the wrapping paper, he located the seams where it had been taped down and carefully used his feathers to pull them apart. Yeesh, commented Spike dryly, he unwraps presents like you, Twilight. Hush, admonished Twilight, blushing a little. Don turned to regard them with a confused look. Is it all right to tear it? He wondered. Yeah, shouted Scootaloo, no need to be a neat freak. Go ahead and shred it. Don shrugged. Okay, turning back to the package, he used his hooves to pull at the paper, tearing it open to reveal a wooden box. The box was made from a rich purple-colored wood coated with a finish that made it shine under the light and felt smooth to the touch. It was absolutely beautiful. Look inside, prompted Arkenstone, his tone surprisingly eager. Don slipped his feathers carefully underneath the seam of the lid on the box and pulled it up. His eyes widened at what he found. Carefully packed in the box and segregated, padded compartments were the implements of his own tea-making set. A cast-iron kettle sat in one compartment, while a teapot made from purple clay rested in the other. Between them, in their own compartments, rested 4 small cups, along with all the other paraphernalia needed to brew his own tea. The last compartment carried a metal canister, which Don carefully lifted out and opened. A sniff confirmed to him that it contained the special blend of spiced tea that was his favorite amongst all of Arkenstone's different creations. This is for me, asked Don, stunned as he turned back to Twilight, Spike, and Arkenstone. The three of them nodded back at him, all smiling widely. Keep in mind, that teapot is for that one blend of tea only, said Arkenstone. Don't go trying other teas with it or you'll ruin the flavor. Don nodded and returned to regarding the incredibly lavish gift. Even the wood the box was made of was clearly special. It took him a while to find the words, even though it was obvious what he needed to say. Thank you. He felt arms around him and looked up to see that Fluttershy had wrapped him in a loving hug. Why don't you pick another one, she whispered. Don nodded. Already, the others were picking out their own packages and opening them. Happy exclamations filled the room as ponies uncovered their presents. It was clear that they were all liking what they found. Applejack had given Rainbow Dash a keg of special reserved cider, something that apparently had Rainbow flying in exuberant circles. Don't drink it all in one go, said Applejack with a wink as the cerulean mare finally stopped and descended to hug the keg like it was some kind of stuffed animal. Twilight, of course, received a small library of books for her library, as it had been on her birthdays and previous heartwarmings. The biggest challenge was finding literature that she hadn't already acquired. Pinkie was ecstatic to receive a package from Rarity that contained a variety of exotic treats and confections imported from Equestria's neighbors and beyond, a package that Arkenstone and Twilight had helped to assemble. From Spike, Apple Bloom received her own, specially made drafting set containing everything she needed to start designing her own creations. When she saw what she had received, Bloom tackled Spike with a happy squeal and planted a wet kiss on his lips as the young dragon's tail beat out a happy tempo on the floor. Don found a second, smaller package. Surprisingly, this one was from Caramel and Bon Bon. Don turned to look at his prospective adoptive father in confusion. He knew who Bon Bon was, of course, and had met Caramel's employer, business partner on multiple occasions and had even had pleasant, albeit short conversations with her. However, Don didn't count her as among the ponies who would have given him a present. After all, while he'd found her to be a perfectly pleasant mare, she did run a sweets shop which was a bit outside his usual tastes. Caramel laughed at the look of confusion on Don's face. Well, when Bon Bon found out you don't like sweets all that much, I think she took that as a personal challenge. She was pretty determined to come up with a candy that you would like no matter what. She hooved this box to me before we left for Canterlot. Don frowned, contemplatively rather than frustratedly, as he eyed the box. He'd tried some of Bon Bon's candies before. Some of them had tasted quite good. It certainly wasn't the flavor that made him keep his distance. Rather, the sweetness of the treats always tended to make him woozy afterwards, even if he'd only had a little. It wasn't even the nice kind of wooziness that he'd seen the adults get whenever they'd imbibed enough but not too much liquor. Rather, it was the kind of wooziness that had the colt marking out the fastest routes to all the restrooms and bathrooms in the vicinity in case said wooziness transitioned into outright indigestion. The symptom was a consequence of one of Don's less pleasant experiences after being taken in by Fluttershy. Fresh out of the Everfree forest, Don's constitution had been acclimated towards extremely light fare, grasses, herbs, nuts, and berries. As a consequence, his first experience with one of Pinkie Pie's cupcakes and its collection of flours, sugars, and fats had resulted in him spending a couple hours in the bathroom being violently ill. From there, it had been a long, somewhat tedious road to help Don get accustomed to the more complex foods favored in civilized communities, particularly those that relied heavily upon processed ingredients. According to Twilight and the doctor at the hospital, there was no actual physical reason for Don to have such adverse reactions to candy and sweets anymore, which had led to Twilight suggesting that Don's reactions were more psychosomatic than physical. The initial impression left in his subconscious by that first experience with a cupcake had subsequently soured all future attempts to indulge in anything sweet or overly rich. So it was with no small degree of trepidation that Don opened the rather fancy-looking black box and looked down at the rows of dark brown, some almost black orbs, their shiny coats hidden by light dustings of cocoa powder on some, cinnamon on others. Still, seeing the hopeful look on his father's face made Don cautiously lift out one of the darker ones. Carefully, Don bit into the truffle, not feeling quite brave enough to pop the whole treat in his mouth. His first thought was that the taste was bitter, as the soft chocolate melted over his tongue. However, that bitterness was quickly washed out by a deep, complex flavor complemented by the heat of chili powder that had been mixed in with the cocoa. On his tongue, Don could taste only the slightest hint of sweetness, just enough sugar to curb the bitterness and keep it from being overwhelming. As he savored the taste, Don's memory called to mind something he'd read in one of the books he'd once checked out from Twilight's library, something about chocolate, which had originally come from the lands south of Equestria, once being used primarily in savory and spicy applications before it had been brought to Equestria, where some pony had contrived the idea of adding sugar and other methods of processing in order to create the sweet confections it was known for today. Don imagined that those original chocolate dishes had a flavor probably akin to this. It was deep, complex, and delicious. Don was shocked as he marveled at the ganache of the remainder of the piece, still pinched delicately between his primaries. That flavor's something else, huh, said Caramel with a jubilant smile. Without bothering to respond, Don popped the remainder of the truffle into his mouth and closed his eyes to completely enjoy the flavor as it washed across his tongue. Even the usual richness that such candies possessed had been curbed just enough that it melted smoothly in his mouth but still felt light enough to keep his stomach from churning in protest. Amazing, gasped Don after swallowing, staring in awe at the rest of the treats in the box. Try one of the cinnamon-coated ones, said Caramel, giving Don a sly smile. I think you'll be surprised. Don nodded and lifted one of the lighter brown truffles from the box. Once again, he took a careful first bite and allowed his mouth to explore the flavor. This one was both sweeter and richer than the dark chocolate one he'd tasted earlier. However, that contrasted heavily with the flavor, in which Don tasted mingled spices, like cinnamon, cloves, and cardamom, as well as a few others which mixed with a flavor that he immediately recognized. Tea. In fact, the flavor of the truffle was very close to the favorite masala chai that had just been gifted to him by Arkenstone, Twilight, and Spike, with the flavorings being mildly adjusted to again account for the flavor and body afforded by the chocolate itself. Furthermore, the sweetness was clearly from honey rather than regular sugar. Any uncomfortableness caused by his usual reticence towards sweets was curbed by the familiar spicy flavor of his favorite beverage. Once again, Don quickly shoved the remainder of the truffle into his mouth and hummed in appreciation, savoring the flavors and scents as they spread across his tongue and the aromas of the various spices were carried up into his nasal passages. When he finally swallowed, Don once again felt himself staring down into the small box, looking at the truffles. For the first time, he didn't feel the usual uncomfortable churning of his stomach that usually came with consuming such foods. Instead, he almost felt a craving, something that beckoned him to try more. However, his stomach felt more than full and Don decided to instead close the box and set it aside. Good idea, said Caramel with a chuckle. You don't want to make yourself sick on stuff you actually like what happened with the cider. He winced as Fluttershy elbowed him sharply in the side. Caramel grinned sheepishly as Fluttershy gave him a wan look. Sorry. Don shook off the slight unease that bubbled up in his stomach at the memory. Instead, he set the box aside and went up to wrap his arms around Caramel's neck in a hug. Thanks, Dad, he said softly. Caramel's face sported one of the happiest grins Fluttershy had ever seen as he hugged Don back. Fluttershy tittered happily as she watched them, glad that Don's first real heartwarming was turning into something truly special for him. Author's notes. This chapter is the biggest example of what I was talking about earlier with how Shade Steel's role in the story impacted the plot in ways I wasn't expecting. Her insertion into the story at this point resulted in a rather poignant conversation between Don and Scootaloo that I had not been anticipating when I first dropped Shade into the mix. It's just one of those examples of how characters can get away from you and take on a life of their own beyond what you originally intended for them. In many ways, the biggest slowdown that came from writing this story was this part, where I ended up stalling quite a bit because I just couldn't come up with ideas for presents for every pony. Even amongst gifts given and received by significant characters, I could only come up with a scant handful of ideas and, consequently, have limited myself to describing the ones that are most significant to the story itself, mixed in with a few other incidental ones and the ideas that I managed to come up with that I really liked. Because of that, the gifts described in this and the next chapter feel somewhat lopsided to me, and the next chapter may need some more heavy editing before it goes up. Next chapter, Scootaloo gets a big present.